The concert hall was full due to the arrival of a very popular female group. The journalist was reporting live with a smile. 5 young girls in identical outfits performed on stage. The reporter said that fans often shoot amateur videos at such concerts. There were a lot of young people near her. All of them were filming the concert of their favorite band on their phone cameras. One guy was filming the proceedings with a professional camera. When asked by the reporter, Jinkyong replied that he was filming the youngest Pomlaj participant. The pretty girl with brown hair was only 17 years old. She was the youngest member of the popular group. The journalist asked why this particular girl. The young man nonchalantly replied that he was a rather famous Pomlaji lover. Jinkyong couldn't even imagine that a mispronounced word would play a fatal role. The police came quickly. The witnesses were enough to convince the custodians that the boy was a danger to society. He was taken to the station. After a while, the unfortunate misunderstanding was cleared up, but it was too late. Users posted his photo with a full biography on the website. Jinkyong couldn't believe it. He had just made a reference to a guy who likes noodles at that fateful moment. But because of the combination of words, he was considered a criminal. The young man only now began to realize that because of that unfortunate interview, his whole life would now be completely different. All of his former friends on the forum now openly despised him. No one wanted to even say hello to a younger amateur. Jinkyong bowed his head dejectedly. Just because Pomlaj's name sounds like that, his whole life is now worthless. It's been 3 years. During that time, the passion surrounding his name had subsided. In addition, their family immediately moved to another part of the city. That morning began as usual. The boy's mother prepared breakfast for him and covered the tray with a transparent lid. The woman couldn't get the long-ago events out of her head. She dreamed of the day when their family would no longer be recognized on the streets. The woman sighed heavily. Unfortunately, this was all just in her dreams. It was time to get back to real life. As she approached the closed door to her son's room, she shouted to Jinkyong that she was going to work. He needed to eat. Without waiting for an answer, the mother went outside and closed the door behind her. The lock clicked loudly several times. After waiting for a few minutes and making sure that the female parent had indeed left, Jinkyong carefully peeked out through the gap between the door and the wall. He quickly ran into the large kitchen and immediately grabbed a tray of food. The food looked very appetizing and delicious. The young man placed the tray of food in front of the monitor in his room and proceeded to eat, continuing to stare at the screen. The dark-haired guy hadn't gotten a haircut in a long time, so his hair kept getting in his eyes. But he didn't care now. Jinkyong's only joy in life was his computer. He enjoyed watching the battles of the characters he drew. Unfortunately, the viewing was too often interrupted by ads due to the use of free internet services. The young man knew the ad block would last a long time, so he minimized the viewing window and switched to general chat. Jinkyong couldn't believe it. There were quite a few people here, but most of the users didn't like what was happening on the screen. Suddenly his heart beat harder. There was no doubt that this ad unit was quite interesting. A tiger appeared on the screen, hugging another character. The caption said that everyone liked Tigger. He moved closer to the screen, his heart nearly jumping out of his chest. He wondered what would happen next. Frodo turned to the tiger and blasted it with a tongue of flame, after which Tigger's face immediately turned black. Jinkyong immediately pressed a key, sending a sticker to the general chat room. To his surprise, at the same second dozens of exactly the same stickers with fire-breathing Frodo sprinkled into the chat room. The young man couldn't believe that they all chose the exact same time as he did, as if they were all sitting at the computer all the time. He laughed evilly. All these users are exactly the same and predictable, just waiting to send a sticker. Meanwhile, the presence of a guy was also noticed in the general chat. One of the players asked only 2D if he had a private life. Jinkyong decided not to reply. A second user suggested that the user was just a dumb anime watcher who probably had pimples. The young man moved away from the monitor and muttered through his teeth that these guys spend a lot of time in the real world and are really dumb. He thought he was only watching a little bit of anime. Now he could only be understood by someone who had experienced misunderstandings himself. Jinkyong looked at the statue of a girl on his system unit. She was portraying a character from the game world. The young man told himself that only girls like this could be trusted. 2D action figures had never betrayed him before. The boy leaned back in his chair, admiring the statue from a different angle. The seat creaked resentfully under the weight of its owner. Jinkyong told his favorite statue that he had been diagnosed with signs of panic disorder and dissociative disorder that day. The young man told the figure in confidence that he could easily take over the entire world if he could draw mana flowing through time and space. He sadly added that he was only in this world for the reason that he wanted to live very badly. Suddenly, Jinkyong heard an annoying squeak that pulled him away from his important thoughts. Of course it was a mosquito. He returned to his normal position and turned around quickly. He caught a glimpse of a nasty insect out of the corner of his eye. The guy smiled victoriously and stated to Rhea that the enemy had appeared to them on their own, but there was no need to panic about it. Jinkyong proudly showed the figure the anti-mosquito spray as if he had a firearm in his hands. The young man promised Rhea that he would definitely save her even if he couldn't prevent the entire world from perishing. The guy pathologically called out to the Reaper of Souls and asked him to teach the arrogant fool who tried to attack his Rhea a lesson. He turned to shouting and demanded to be shown immediately who really commands this entire world. Grabbing the spray, Jinkyong ran to attack the malicious insect as if it was a dangerous monster from the game universe. Before the mosquito knew it, the life-threatening cloud paralyzed all his respiratory organs. The young man sprayed it sparingly. The boy thought he was a superhero and almost jumped on the table with joy. He liked to feel like a savior. Suddenly, the boy felt that something strange was happening. A few seconds ago, he had only dreamed of another world. But now everything has changed. Just a moment ago, there was a burst of unknown energy in the city. The wave reached the boy's apartment. Jinkyong was surprised to feel his body rising into the air by itself, as if someone was controlling him. This element threw the stunned young man out of the window of his own apartment. He could not believe that he was levitating in the air. At the same moment, Jinkyong realized with horror that his even flight had stopped. Now, he was rapidly approaching the hard surface with wild cries. After flying through the gray clouds, the young man made a huge hole in them and continued his rapid descent into the mountainous terrain. The ground was getting closer and closer. From this distance, you could already see the bright green grass and admire the scenery. To the guy's surprise, his landing was very smooth, as if he hadn't fallen from the sky, but had taken one step and was uninjured. Before Jinkyong could look around, a little girl with a magic wand came running over to him. She was very happy that she was able to summon someone. Now the young man didn't understand what was going on at all. He was trying to figure out roughly what part of the country he had been thrown into. The stranger knelt before him and thanked the spirit who had answered her call. The girl asked what to call him. The girl's line threw the guy into a stupor. This was all very strange. Common sense told him it was just a dream. From the stranger's appearance, one could assume that she was Streamer. The girl raised her head and declared that even Mr. Streamer's name sounded bossy. Continuing on her knees, the little girl pointed somewhere behind the guy's back and asked him to use his power to deal with the monster. Jinkyong suspected that it would be more than just a monster, and began to slowly turn in the direction the confused stranger was pointing. It was as if he could sense that the monster would be huge, but he had no idea he would have to crane his head so high. A huge monster the size of a giant skyscraper towered above the clouds, piercing them. Man seemed like a grain of sand against its backdrop. The young man immediately realized that the battle with the large monster would be very difficult and turned pale. The girl behind him was almost jumping with happiness. She had found a hero. Jinkyong was still hoping it wasn't what he thought it was behind his back and pointed at the monster. The stranger nodded happily. Only now did the young man realize that he was really in for a tough fight. The girl would hide behind him until he destroyed the huge creature. The guy managed to calm himself down pretty quickly. He recognized that all this was happening beyond reality, so his life was not in danger. Jinkyong laughed. This was an interesting dream. Anyone would have immediately said it was a fictional world. His hysterical laughter surprised the girl a little. As with that mosquito in the room, the young man summoned the Reaper of Slave Souls and demanded to show his power to the stupid creature. Taking a few confident steps, the guy picked up his mosquito spray and rushed forward, attacking the giant. He shouted that he had to reveal the power and authority of the only god to the world. Jinkyong stepped back into his role, feeling like a true hero. The girl who had summoned the powerful spirit with the strange name of Streamer watched with some apprehension as he fearlessly attacked the monster. Running closer to the huge insect, the young man held the spray out in front of him and confidently pressed the button on the lid of the can. At this moment, he envisioned himself as a super soldier, able to handle any monster no matter how strong it was. Unfortunately, the super weapon didn't work. Spirit Streamer turned to the girl and admitted that he couldn't destroy the monster. The stranger blushed in shame. This spirit was so strange that even she was ashamed of his actions. The girl bitterly thought that because of her insufficient skills, she had managed to summon the wrong spirit. Suddenly, a violent explosion resounded in the sky. A blinding white flash appeared on the monster's body. Nothing happened for a while. A huge mosquito continued to hover in the sky, aggravating the situation. At that time, a series of explosions rang out. The horizon lit up with bright flashes. The monster was being torn apart from the inside out. The final explosion was like the appearance of a new star. You could have been blinded looking at the flash. Jinkyong and the girl were in their seats and silently watched as the scraps left by the monster fell around. Even at this distance, the energy released after the explosion was enough to completely illuminate the surprised faces of the guy and the girl. The little girl couldn't believe that Streamer had actually succeeded in destroying that huge creature that had frightened her. The young man stood directly in front of the blaze and watched the monster body elements flying past with triumph. The girl watched her savior carefully. Of course, she was very grateful, but right now he looked very much like an idiot. Jinkyong turned to the stranger. Continuing to hold the canister, he said with a smile as he swatted the monster after all. Looking at his face, the girl was finally convinced that he looked like a psycho. But now he looked like a cool, crazy person. After a while, the dust cloud began to dissipate. The only reminders of the recent monster were its small pieces carried away by the wind. The girl covered her eyes with her hand, protecting them from the bright light source, and took a closer look. It seemed to her that they were uniting into hieroglyphics. The summoner thought respectfully that she had never encountered such powerful magic. Jinkyong was pleased with himself. Only a hero like him could defeat a monster. The girl turned around and thought that she wouldn't be able to handle such a strong servant. She stepped closer and thanked Streamer profusely, admiring his skills. The young man proudly replied that he was delighted himself. The girl looked up at her savior incredulously and said that not only a spirit could be summoned, but also a hero. She suggested that she had summoned a mage. This question stumped the young man. No matter how hard he tried, he could not detect anything supernatural in his actions. But the little girl continued to stare at him questioningly, so Jinkyong frantically thought of what to say to her. The young man hesitantly replied that he might well be called a mage until his right arm got tired. The stranger's mouth dropped open in surprise. Streamer's remark had taken her by surprise. One can only guess at the power of his right hand. Jinkyong thought seriously about the world for the first time. The girl was now looking at him like a deity. She was trying to guess what Streamer was still capable of. The stranger identified herself. Her name is Hayes. Unfortunately, she is only a novice summoner and doesn't know everything. The girl asked the surprised lad to do the honor and reappear at her call, if it would not trouble him too much. The young man tried to understand what was going on. At first he thought that Hayes had fallen in love with him, but then he thought it was a trap. Suddenly, an unpleasant thought came to his mind. Jinkyong gingerly asked the girl to identify herself once more. The pretty girl smiled embarrassedly and said her name was Baby Hayes, but she could be called Baby for short. The young man could not believe it. The wrong pronunciation of the girl's name could play a fatal role again, just as it had 3 years ago. Hayes noticed that the guy was waving her away like a leper, and asked Streamer in surprise what was wrong. Jinkyong angrily shouted that from now on he would only call her Ai-chan and no other name. The girl blushed. She was uncomfortable that Streamer would now call her a child because of her lack of skills. Without turning to his companion, the young man wondered what she meant by the next call, for he could not control his dreams. The boy turned his head faintly and smiled. He promised that he would come to the rescue if he had a dream like that again. Hayes was surprised. In Streamer's mouth, even non-cooperation sounded very gentle, a voice that could be enjoyed for ages. At that moment, the girl herself was ready to believe she was dreaming. She had never been able to summon anyone before. The pretty girl closed her eyes in embarrassment. She was grateful to fate for the splendid dream and offered to cancel the draft. Hayes waved her wand with determination and began demonstrating magical passes in the air to phrases from an unfamiliar language. At the same moment, a strong wind came up, fluttering the young man's long hair. He couldn't understand what the girl was thinking. The summoner shouted louder and louder. The wind, meanwhile, was getting stronger and stronger. The girl spewed out the last phrase very loudly. Jinkyong could barely stand still as he fought the gusts of wind. Suddenly, the young man felt that something was about to happen. Later, the boy could not explain to himself how he knew it. A dazzling white beam passed through the very spot between the black clouds through which Jinkyong had gotten here. The light was so bright that the young man involuntarily closed his eyes. He could have been blinded if he had tried to see what was happening. Feeling something soft beneath him, the boy hesitantly began to open his eyes, getting used to his new surroundings. To Jinkyong's surprise, it turned out to be his own bed. He woke up in his room. He had actually dreamed it. Staring at the ceiling, the young man remembered that he had focused on certain things after he stopped leaving the house. Out of idleness and boredom, he counted the number of letters in books. The last time Jinkyong counted 80,062 letters. When he got bored with this activity, he counted time by seconds. One day he counted the time for 3 hours in a row. Also, very often Jinkyong amused himself by reading English sentences backwards. The young man yawned sweetly and stretched. He'd gotten a good night's sleep. He had a very realistic dream tonight, too. The strangest thing was that tonight in his dream, he could clearly hear one of the phrases read from right to left. The boy realized it only through long practice. Jinkyong knew very well that it was all just a strange dream, but he still felt as if he'd been on his feet all day. After a while, the daylight hours changed to evening twilight. There were fewer and fewer people on the street. The young man pulled his feet down and realized that something was stuck to them. He turned the foot toward him with interest to get a better look. It seemed simply unbelievable. For the first few seconds, Jinkyong couldn't believe his own eyes. There were green leaves stuck to his heel and toe. But the boy knew for sure that he hadn't been out anywhere for the last 3 years. He thoughtfully told himself that he had never been a sleepwalker, a night walk ruled out. The appearance of the leaves was very strange. Jinkyong checked the lock on the door of the room just in case. It was locked and no one could enter. In fact, none of his parents cared about him. The TV was on in the living room. The boy's life was of no interest to his relatives. His father had recently returned from work and was glumly watching the latest city news. He despised his son because of that incident. While my father was watching the news, my mother was busy in the kitchen. 3 stools were placed at the kitchen table. The woman looked at the built-in sink and found all the dishes clean. She was surprised to realize that the young man had not eaten dinner at all. The mother immediately went to the closed door to Jinkyong's room and asked if the boy was hungry. Despite the woman's questioning, the young man did not answer. She assumed that Jinkyong had fallen asleep. The man looked disapprovingly at his wife furtively. He didn't even want to look at his son, so he stood up and defiantly turned off the TV with the remote. The wife sadly noticed that her husband had put on his slippers and walked out the door, remembering to slam it shut well in protest. The woman realized that their marriage was cracking more and more every day, but there was nothing she could do. She was already trying her best to keep the family together. It was clearly visible from the windows that a man had come out of the driveway and sat down to rest on a bench under the awning. After a little thought, he pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and smoked nervously. His son was making him more and more nervous lately. The man took a puff and looked up. Among the many windows of their house, burning in the silence of the night, he was interested in only one. Seeing a man in one of the windows, the smoker frowned even more. He tried his best not to meet him at home. But now the young man himself stepped out onto the balcony, meeting his father's scornful gaze. The man was openly showing his feelings. Back in the room, Jinkyong sat on the bed again and engaged in in-depth introspection, reminiscing about the old days. 3 years ago, he was diagnosed with several antisocial diagnoses, but even after receiving them, he continued to socialize with his family. Not much time had passed. The young man saw his parents' attitude towards him and began to subconsciously avoid them. Hunger had taken its toll. His stomach rumbled like a jackhammer. He told himself he'd have time to eat. His parents still awake. Jinkyong seemed to only now see that the computer monitor was still glowing, and the system unit itself was humming evenly. The young man realized that the computer had been on the whole time and got out of bed to reboot the system. After selecting the reboot mode in the system menu, the guy hesitated a bit and decided to shut down the computer completely. Everything looked as usual. After pressing the button, the blue screen darkened and turned light gray, signaling the end of the work. After a few seconds, the screen went blank. The humming in the system unit stopped, and all fans stopped. The moment the system unit was turned off, another event occurred. Instead of Jinkyong, only bits of energy remained in the room. The young man himself found himself in the evening sky, just as the sun was setting. At this late hour, the sun was already setting over the mountain plain. The boy felt himself flying somewhere again, and he gasped in surprise. He could have sworn it wasn't a dream. It was just like last time. Jinkyong flew downward with increasing speed. He couldn't help himself and screamed in terror. Meanwhile, on the surface itself, no one even suspected the approach of an intruder. It was dusk in this place. A small camp was set up in the forest among the mountains. The only evidence of its existence was a trickle of smoke from the fire. That's where baby Hayes was leisurely heading down the forest path, playing with her wand behind her back. When they saw their friend, the 2 silhouettes immediately stood by the fire and called out to her. The little girl ran toward them excitedly. She shouted happily to Jake that she was finally able to return. The black-clad man admitted that he himself had returned a while ago. He asked the girl how she liked it in their village. Hayes hesitated. She didn't know how to express her feelings more precisely. When she remembered the village that had been burned to the ground, the girl said quietly that everything was burning. The girl said quietly that the place was burning. Jake sadly admitted that everything in the Patrina he'd gone to matched her description. The monsters had destroyed everything. Ilera immediately stood up from her seat and angrily said that their uncle's life might also be in danger if this was true. The man reassured the girl. He told her that the ruler himself had hidden in a safe haven and ordered to bring his relatives there. Jake turned his attention back to Hayes. He was sure the girl would be back later, because there was a giant mosquito in her way. The little girl remembered the psycho who had saved her and stammered. There was no way she could explain killing a monster. Besides, no one would believe in her summoning magic. The girl blurted out that by the time she arrived, the monster had disappeared. Only traces of a large battle. Ilera smiled and said that Hayes was very lucky. She asked if Baby had brought her dress. The girl didn't realize at first which dress she was talking about. She tried to justify herself and reminded herself, stammering, that there were a lot of monsters in that settlement. There was no time for a dress. Ilera pointed her finger at the shivering boy who was doing push-ups by the fire and commanded Hayes to stand beside him. Jake asked Ilera, perplexed, wondering how Baby could ever think of going to a place that was full of monsters. The girl scornfully replied that Hayes was the worst of the summoners. The little girl decided to lighten the mood and exclaimed that Alera was the best. All three of them continued to discuss the monster's latest attack. At that moment, a strange sound was heard in the sky. The two of them all raised their heads at once, looking up with interest. Jake said, interestedly, that he'd heard a sound. Continuing to peer into the space between the tree crowns, Alera calmly replied that it was the sound of the dead men starting their patrol. Jake offered to stay by the fire and listen to a story. The sun had set anyway, and they couldn't continue on their way. The girl sat down comfortably next to him. The man said that this mountain has a master. He always keeps an eye on what happens here. The owner willingly welcomed people and graciously allowed them to hunt, gather fruit, and even do logging. But the demands of the greedy people grew by leaps and bounds. Soon there was no game or trees left in the area. The whole forest was taken to the villages. One quiet night, there were the same strange sounds high in the sky. People were resting in their tents and did not suspect anything. Suddenly, a fire rained down on the village. It was useless to fight it, and people screamed and tried to run away. One of the men screamed the loudest. An energy surge hit him in the forehead. The victim gave a low groan. Jake explained that the master of the mountain sends the dead to place a blue brand on those who have committed a rash act. Many have tried to run away from the dead or fight back, but they will pursue until they achieve their goal. Hayes gingerly suggested that if that was the case, there was a man somewhere in the forest who had angered the master of the mountain. The man nodded in agreement. Alera was angry that she had been led to a dangerous mountain. Jake shouted that it was because of the master that the other monsters were not to be feared. The girl was satisfied with this answer. Little Hayes was delighted that the man had quickly withdrawn from the unpleasant conversation. Unlike Alera, she was getting more nervous by the minute. Jake's grim story made her think. The girl asked what would happen if the summoner upset the balance of the mountain. The man calmly replied that the dead would come after him. Baby girl's pretty face covered in cold sweat at the mere thought of being branded because of Streamer 2. Barely crying, Hayes had to admit that she had dispatched that giant mosquito using the power of summoning. Jake and Alera listened with interest to the story that the girl's servant had been on that mountain and had dealt with the monster. The man looked at his interlocutor with disbelief. Alera couldn't stand it and jumped into her fist. It was too much. The girl couldn't stop herself and continued to laugh. Jake asked her to calm down and told Hayes that now was not the time for jokes. High in the sky, the same strange sound was heard. All three of them looked up, peering anxiously into the dense foliage. The man put his finger to his lips and asked to be as quiet as possible while the dead men passed. The little girl continued to stare into the dark sky. A huge black silhouette was noisily descending toward them, picking branches in its path. It had a bright white symbol at the top of its head. All three of them turned around at the loud sound. Hayes frantically clutched her wand in her hand, though she wasn't sure it would help. The girl was willing to bet that during its descent, this silhouette turned its head slightly and squinted at her. Jake's face instantly turned white with fear. The man whispered, stammering, that the dead men had come for them. The black silhouette descended lower and lower. Jake kept mumbling that their squad didn't deserve such a fate, that they hadn't done anything wrong. The dead man landed smoothly. The man no longer doubted his intentions, and demanded that Alera leave quickly. The girl straightened up and proudly declared that she would deal with all of this. She cast a loud spell, summoning a bodyguard. A circle of fire appeared in front of the dead giant, and a giant genie rose from it. He was a little smaller than his rival. Little Hayes was shocked. It was the first time she had ever seen such power. In a matter of seconds, Alera summoned a huge creature. Jake watched the beginning of the forest fire with bewilderment. The flames moved quickly from tree to tree. The man glumly told Alera that the arrival of the deceased had been incomprehensible up until this point, but after the appearance of the genie, there would be more of them. The girl proudly demanded that her genie destroy the dead man. The summoned creature immediately rushed to the attack. As soon as the rivals' bodies made contact, the enormous dead man began to shrink in size and turned into a black blur. He tried his best to resist the fire monster, but his strength was unequal. The dead man was melting before his eyes, only the upper half of his body remained. Jake saw that there was not much left to the end of the battle. He offered to leave the mountain. Alera replied indignantly that she wasn't going to run around the mountain at night. At that moment, baby Hayes, who had been frightened out of her wits, pointed with a trembling hand to something behind them. Jake and Alera turned around, puzzled. They wondered what could have frightened the young summoner so much. Unfortunately, the man was right. The forest fire had attracted the rest of the dead. At least a dozen monsters were looking at the remains of their fellow man. They simultaneously dealt a crushing blow to the fire genie. The bodyguard started to change his form. He couldn't handle everyone. Alera watched in amazement as all that remained of her faithful Jin was a fiery blur, being consumed more and more quickly by the deceased. She realized now that she had to flee, and she ran as fast as she could. Jake and Hayes could barely keep up with her. The three fugitives managed to get far enough away from the fire, but there were too many dead people. Some continued to chase the men. Not far from the fire was a man who paid no attention to the battle between the genie and the dead men. He kept pushing up from the ground, not daring to disobey Alera's orders. If he disobeyed, he would be severely punished. Little Hayes was running through the forest, trying to catch up with Jake and Alera. It was hard for her to breathe. She wasn't used to such exertion. As luck would have it, while running, Hayes didn't look under her feet and snagged on one of the branches on the ground. The little girl couldn't keep her balance and flew forward screaming, dropping her wand along the way. When she reached the ground, she fell on all fours and cried bitterly. Hayes was very hurt and resentful because she had been left alone. She knelt down and looked around. The glow of the fire was far away, but the sounds of dead men flying were very near. The little girl called out fearfully to her companions. It was still a long time before dawn, so it was very scary to be in the darkness. Hayes realized that Jake and Alera were already too far away, and she roared even more. She knew it would be hard to survive alone. Suddenly, the girl heard a suspicious rustling in the bushes. She hoped that Alera had come back for her and called out to her friend. Unfortunately, it wasn't Alera. One of the huge dead men slowly descended with a distinctive sound toward his victim. Hayes looked up and realized it all at once. A cry of terror froze on her lips. She couldn't say a word out of fear. It was only when the girl straightened up and rushed away that screams came from her throat. She realized she could not escape. The little girl ran away, not knowing where she was going. It was dark in the forest. This caused her to hit her nose on a tree. Hayes stopped and sat down on the ground, groping her bruised area resentfully. She realized there was nowhere to run. There were several huge dead men looming over the forest, and they were all staring at the same point. The girl knew the monsters had come for her. When they had finished their work, the dead men silently walked off into the distance. Far away in the mountains, it was beginning to dawn, but it was still dark in the forest. The little girl began to gradually regain consciousness. She was being dragged somewhere on a rope that was securely tied to her waist and arm. The girl knew very well that there was already a stigma on her forehead. She could feel it. Hayes' eyes were inflamed. Looking up at the glimmering dawn over the tree crowns, Baby thought that Streamer was also to blame for all of this. She stretched her trembling hand upward, begging to come to her aid and save her, at least this time. The girl spoke a weak voice and cast a summoning spell. As the dead men continued to drag the victim behind them, Hayes did not lose hope and continued to call upon the spirit. The energy flows of her body flew higher and higher, summoning the almighty Streamer. The forest was getting brighter and brighter. Unfortunately, Little One's strength was clearly lacking. The energy that had been channeled into the spirit's summoning had scattered and disappeared. The girl roared. Alera was right. She couldn't even manage the simplest spell and summon a powerful spirit. To Hayes' surprise, her efforts were not in vain. A strong burst of energy caused a beam to appear, shooting up into the sky. This attracted the attention of the dead. The girl could not believe her happiness. Heaven had mercy on her and allowed her to call upon the spirit. The huge dead men glanced at each other glumly. Everything looked as it should. The branded victim dragged behind them, lying on his back. It was at this moment that another black silhouette appeared in the sky against the backdrop of dawn, in which Jinkyong was easily recognizable. The excited lad quickly guessed that he had fallen into the same strange place that had seemed like a dream to him at the time. The multitude of the dead silently watched the appearance of the stranger. Since there was no order for him, the young man was of little interest to them. The two monsters looked at each other. For some unknown reason, they both sensed danger to themselves. Jinkyong kept failing to realize where he really was. It felt very much like a real forest. The young man remembered that he was in the room and fell asleep. Suddenly, he saw a computer mouse in his hand. It all came together. He had fallen asleep at the computer. Crying, Baby Hayes screamed at the top of her voice and begged Streamer to come to her rescue. The boy immediately recognized the familiar voice of that summoner. He was surprised to realize that Ai-chan was also here. Jinkyong only now saw the huge black silhouettes with a strange glowing emblem on their foreheads. He became very scared. The young man realized that Hayes now needed to be rescued from these monsters, and if he wasn't dreaming, it was very dangerous to be here. The boy paused, calming himself down. He remembered that that huge mosquito was much bigger and still lost the battle. Jinkyong closed his eyes and thought. Everything pointed to the fact that he had superpowers in this strange world. The young man laughed gloatingly and shouted to his enemies, minting his words that he feared nothing. None of them could harm him. The boy continued to boast that he could easily deal with the monsters. And suddenly he heard a girl's quiet voice. She was calling for his help. Jinkyong ran up to the summoner and asked her to speak louder. He couldn't hear anything. The young man asked what had happened. He hadn't exercised in a long time and was now breathing heavily after running only 50 meters. Hayes apologized for interrupting his workout. The boy said thoughtfully that he hadn't brought any mosquito poison with him. He hesitated and hastily said that he meant magic weapons. In response to the question from his surprised interlocutor, Jinkyong explained that his magic weapon was indispensable in defense if sprayed in the right places. The young man only now noticed the bluish stigma in his interlocutor's face, and exclaimed that something was burning on her forehead. The girl indifferently replied that after receiving such a branding, the victim's mind is clouded. The dead men tie her up and drag her away. After a little thought, the guy came to the conclusion that all he had to do was put out the light, and declared that he would deal with it. Haze's temperature rose. Her face began to burn. The girl said tiredly that magical fire could not be removed so easily. Jinkyong threw a small pebble directly at the stigma. The little girl screamed, her eyes reddened even more. The young man didn't stop and tried to remove the branding by simply patting it. The girl screamed in pain, her eyes watering. Pretty lady had to admit that nothing was helping. Now she can't open her eyes at all. Her forehead hurt even worse. The boy decided he had nothing to lose anyway. He could think of nothing better to do than spit on the stigma. To his surprise, something began to happen to that bluish sign. There was a distinct hissing sound at that spot. A few seconds later, the blue branding disappeared and the rope was gone. Haze sat down on her knees in surprise, still not believing the miraculous rescue. The dead men could not let their victim escape and looked among themselves. No one had ever managed to free himself from the stigma. Without hiding their presence, the giants moved toward the stranger. Jinkyong realized that he would have to pay for saving the girl. Since he had no other weapons with him, he let the first monster get to a safe distance and spat at it. The dead man burst into blue flames. The monster's companions immediately took notice of their kin's death and disapprovingly murmured. The guy was surprised to realize that he had found a simple and effective method of fighting monsters. After killing the dead man, Haze began to idolize and worship him. Having judiciously assessed their options, the huge dead men chose to retreat. Jinkyong said happily as they disappeared. Meanwhile, Jake and Alera were having a hard time. The dead had driven the fugitives to the cliff. Only 2 fire genies held them back. The man drew his sword and shouted that it was time for Alera to run away. She argued angrily that she could handle the monsters herself. Suddenly, all the dead people floated upwards and seemed to disappear into thin air. For some unknown reason, they were left alone. Jake stood there with his sword in his hand. He was ready to fight to the death. Alera was just as surprised, her eyes fluttering open. Common sense told the man that they would not be let go so easily. There was no explanation for what had happened. Meanwhile, the dead men were running faster and faster. They were almost over the horizon before Jake's astonished eyes. Meanwhile, the full moon began to appear from behind the black clouds. The first drops of rain began to fall from the sky. The rain was getting heavier and heavier. The clouds changed each other, continuing to cover the moon. The dead men could no longer be heard. Jinkyong stood on the forest path in the rain with Haze, rejoicing at the dead men's escape. Nothing would threaten them now. Jake and Alera were surprised to see the huge profile of some giant. It was clearly much larger than the previous monsters. The black silhouette grew taller and taller. When it began to straighten up, it covered half the moon with its head. The man started to stammer in fear. He realized perfectly well who the huge silhouette that covered the entire sky belonged to. Jinkyong and little Haze looked fearfully at the approaching giant. The girl exclaimed that it was the master of the mountain. Only the punished boy continued to push himself off the ground. He didn't care about the master or the full moon. The host continued to grow in front of the startled foursome, making unpleasant noises. Everyone realized that its appearance was fraught with great trouble. The giant looked angrily at the forest and roared. Blue bursts of energy ran through his body. The young man suspected it had something to do with the dead. Seeing his enemy, the mountain master quickly swung his hand in his direction without even making an attempt to approach. Jinkyong and the girl stood quite far away from the monster and watched its movements with interest. Seeing that the mountain master waved his hand, the guy laughed. This monster's hand was huge and could reach quite far. Suddenly, both of them were picked up by a strong gust of wind and carried hundreds of meters away from the forest path. The mountain master looked glumly at the result of his labor. His opponent was clearly having a hard time. The giant towered over the cliff and stared at the end of the furrow. Somewhere lurked the stranger. He might still be alive. The guy and girl were just finishing their dizzying flight. Jinkyong landed on all fours. He almost lost his breath. Concerned, Haze began to shake Streamer. She needed the young man to wake up, only he could help. Jinkyong was barely breathing. His body had long ago become weaned from physical exertion, and now he was just lying on the ground. He didn't even have the strength to get up. He remembered that all he had with him was a computer mouse. He clicked its buttons nervously, not realizing how it would help him against the monster. Suddenly it hit the guy. After all, his mouse is wireless and battery-powered. Jinkyong slowly got up from the ground. Little Haze saw the strange change on her companion's face, and looked at him in surprise. The young man stated that he would help her get rid of the monster, but in return, he asks her to fulfill one small request. The girl didn't understand what Streamer could possibly want from her. After a short pause, she agreed. The boy turned the other way and told himself he would have to go back. He shouted cheerfully that Hayes mustn't forget her promise. As with the huge Mosquito, Baby felt terribly ashamed of Streamer. She blushed thickly, thinking that the spirit was being very foolish. Jinkyong snapped off the lid of the lower compartment of the mouse, removing the battery. He stated, moving faster than sound. Hayes blushed even more. She would have preferred to be somewhere else. Ashamed, she covered her ears so she couldn't hear anything. Clutching the battery between his fingers, the young man happily told himself that 10 billion volts would easily wipe the monster into powder. He tossed the emptied mouse aside and gloatingly exclaimed that he would set hellfire here. Little Hayes sat on her knees and watched the strange body movements of the spirit, who was acting very foolishly. The huge size of the mountain master didn't embarrass him in the slightest. The guy stood opposite his opponent and waved his hand for some reason. He was actually figuring out the best way to toss the charged battery. The girl called to him excitedly. On the one hand, she wanted to believe that Streamer would defeat the monster a second time, but common sense told her it was better to run away. Jinkyong laughed as he looked at the battery. He had almost overlooked one very important thing. To succeed, you must observe the polarity and hold the battery correctly. The young man threw his only weapon at the master of the mountain. The blast wave threw him behind Little Hayes' back. He didn't know what the result of his throw would be. The battery that hit the monster's torso caused a small explosion to appear inside the mountain master. Long beams spread out from his body in different directions. Immediately after that, the irreversible process of the giant's disintegration began. For a few seconds, the sky turned bright blue, and many electrical discharges appeared. Alera and Jake kept their eyes on their master. The bright blue and violet flashes of discharge were clearly visible all around them. If the guy doing push-ups in the woods looked up, he would be surprised to see the monster explode into dozens and hundreds of brightly colored balls. Jinkyong was still unconscious. Hayes saw a blinding white sky and a lot of electric shocks in front of her eyes. The mountain master could no longer hold back this force that sought to be released and was literally tearing him apart from the inside. Everyone who was watching the battle was surprised to hear several explosions. After that, the master seemed to melt into thin air. The air absorbed his particles. Over the forest, where Jinkyong had defeated the huge host, the clouds had thickened and the weather had become very overcast. Jinkyong was lying on the ground with no strength, and Little Hazy tried to call out to him to ask if he was okay. The guy jumped up abruptly and turned toward the little girl. He shouted at her that there couldn't be ticks on Leah-chan's body. Little Hayes was initially startled by the guy's behavior, and even covered her face with her hand out of fear. Later, the little girl called Mr. Streamer and added that he was the best. She had an admiring look, and Jinkyong took notice. The girl continued to praise the guy's abilities. With one blow, he had put down such a giant. Hayes had heard that even heroes from legends didn't dare to challenge him. Jinkyong modestly replied that he just let the devil out of the sealed battery, and the girl continued to admire him. Little Hayes crouched down before Jinkyong and thanked the man for answering her call again. The girl also remembered Jinkyong's request and asked what exactly he wanted from her, and the guy apparently forgot about it. The guy looked at the girl with an incomprehensible look. Apparently, he really had forgotten about his request. The girl already wanted to assume what the guy wanted herself, but Jinkyong interrupted her and started laughing loudly, after which he said that you shouldn't act so unapologetically when you owed a request. The guy was pointing his finger directly at the startled little girl, who hadn't expected such a harsh reaction. The little girl continued to stare at the guy, while Jinkyong himself simply took his eyes away to the side. Jinkyong said he would tell his request the next time he was called upon. Little Hazy's eyes lit up in her head at the words of the next time, which meant the guy would still respond to her urges. Jinkyong continued to stand awkwardly scratching the back of his head, and the little girl replied that she would fulfill the request next time. She also asked Jinkyong to take care of her and called him Mr. Streamer. It was dusk and overcast in the forest. The little girl and Jinkyong remained standing awkwardly facing each other. Meanwhile, in the real world, also the weather remained gloomy. The guy's apartment was barely visible. Jinkyong sat on the bed. He was awake after his recent travels. The guy had a small ruby-colored pebble in his hands, which he was examining. He remembered that Little Hazy had given that little pebble to him and said it was an Oedipus. The boy interjected, trying to find out what it was for, and Little Hazy replied that she was still a novice summoner, and not yet experienced in summoning magic. The girl went on to explain that the Ethag had the power to keep the summoner and the summoned connected, and if the guy wore it, they would be able to bond with each other. Jinkyong continued to sit and examine the stone. The realization came to him that it wasn't all a dream. The guy stood up to his full height and started screaming across the room that this was for real. He was really fighting a giant. Jinkyong couldn't be pleased with his exploits, he thought. A black dragon was slumbering inside him and wanted to brag about it to someone. It was already nighttime, but the light in the guy's room didn't go out. He was busy doing something. Jinkyong was chatting with internet users. One of them said he hadn't seen the guy in a long time. Another suggested that the guy had gone to check the temperature at Han River. And Jinkyong himself replied that he and one girl were on their way to save world peace. Users immediately started ridiculing the guy and asked what game he was doing it in, maybe a dating simulator. But Jinkyong stood his ground and said that he was really moving to a fantasy world and fighting a giant. But they started laughing at him even more. Jinkyong grabbed his dechlorophos and called everyone who poked fun at him on the internet idiots. The guy then walked with the aerosol in his hands to the window and said he would show the power of his body. Jinkyong sprayed his mosquito spray directly into the open window of his room. Then the jet went outside, but expectantly nothing happened. The guy compared it to the effect of doing the same thing in a dream and realized it didn't work in the real world. After briefly trying to destroy all living things, he found that the contents had run out, though the vial was almost new. The guy turned toward the computer, then started looking at his computer mouse. He saw the charge indicator blinking and realized that the battery in the mouse was dying too. The guy wondered if this was all because he had used it all in his dream against the monsters. The action shifts to a magical world where little Hazy is staring at something in the forest where Jinkyong killed the master. The little girl stood across from the poor kid who had been left standing in her arms. It turned out to be a boy named Benny. Benny, in sweat and fatigue, told the little girl that Mrs. Alira had not told her to get up. Little Hayes tried to convince the poor girl that Alira was very far gone and she could get up. Already Benny was on her feet beside the little girl, and remembering the terrible dead, she asked Hayes if Mrs. Alira was all right, and the latter replied that of course she was all right, for she had run away faster than the little girl herself. Benny sighed heavily and said that was good, but Hayes replied that the girl's face told a different story. The girl stood in front of the ruins, and Benny asked what had happened here, and added that there must have been a big explosion. Little Hazy explained that the master of the mountain himself had appeared, and with a little luck the girl had managed to fight him off, to which Benny asked if Mrs. Alira could do it, hinting that the little girl would not be able to overcome the huge monster. Little Hayes replied that Alira had nothing to do with it, and she had used magic herself to defeat the monster, but you could see in Benny's eyes that he didn't believe it. Baby Hayes told the girl that she guessed why Alira was tormenting her. The beautiful night sky remained on the battlefield with the forest master, and the action smoothly moved to Jinkyong's apartment. The boy sat tense and thought about how he hadn't realized at first that it might be the crazy influence of the types from the world he'd been summoned to. Jinkyong further looked at the monitor screen and said that there was no such thing. Something interested and angered him. On the guy's screen was the series, and he was thinking about the highly anticipated second season of Idol producer Tilda is on the way to Tilda's dream again. He completely forgot about the subtitles for the first episode. Jinkyong told himself that he could handle the mental attacks. Such was the fate of a legendary acolyte. Here the series started, and the guy noted that this anime has good drawing, and started watching with interest. The reporters chatted with Zhao and gushed that it had been a long time since she had starred in different shows, and the girl agreed, also adding that she was in shock. The girl said her real name was Sorina, and she was bullied as a child, asking, "Are you a lieutenant or a colonel?" The host asked what the girl was saying in response, and the girl said she was just saying that her last name was Seo. But kids kept making jokes about her, asking if she was adopted or native, so she used the name Sao during her debut. The host remarked that it was a big horror and added that the girl had to go through a lot, and Xiao replied that she didn't even think about it. Wouldn't it be better for her to stop doing it until she graduated from high school? The girl also recalled an incident and wanted to tell what the name Soa meant to her after that, but Jinkyong turned off the TV. The guy was shaking and trying to figure out what he had just watched. He was nervously clutching the remote. The guy said he met the girl at fan sites and fan meetings. She shook hands and even talked. She always thanked him for coming. Even though they knew each other a little, but at least he wasn't that kind of person, the girl had to say it was just a bad joke. With time, Jinkyong put his thoughts in order. Of course Xiao wanted the attention, becoming the unfortunate victim. In fact, the girl became even more popular after that incident, and Jinkyong was attacked by the entire internet, and there were angry posts and comments about him everywhere. The kind and friendly image is only for the airwaves. There's no way to know what they're all really like. That's how the guy thought of the idols. The girl in the computer screen told her producer that she wants to give her precious fans more happiness. She seems to be missing a lot. Tears came to Jinkyong's eyes, and he started to shout no. He was addressing Emiri-chan. He was assuring the girl in the screen that she had enough of everything right now. Emiri-chan in the monitor screen started crying and said she was really missing something. Jinkyong thought that this little girl was crying for him and asked her to stop blowing tears. Emiri-chan broke all of the guy's antipathy towards the idols from Season 1. and in Season 2, softened his heart in the very first episode. The boy pounded the table resolutely and assured himself that he couldn't just sit there. Jinkyong took his Lei-chan figurine and asked for her forgiveness. He also added that although her trying cute image of someone who gets unfair treatment in the Crystal Kingdom because of her animal odor is really good. But there is one but. But from now on, his favorite character is Amiri-chan, the guy said, and put the figure in a drawer. The guy shouted sorry once more in frustration and slammed the drawer in his desk with the figurine inside. After his parting with his favorite figurine, the guy thought it was worth ordering one of Amiri-chan after he stared at the monitor screen. Jinkyong also said he had his mom's credit card and started actively clicking on the computer mouse. While searching for an Amiri-chan figurine on the vastness of the internet, a guy had something that caused a huge surprise. The guy was looking through the options on one of the websites and saw a figure of Amiri-chan in a bikini on the beach. Jinkyong was angry. He thought that if users loved the series, of course they should take the original figure. The guy read smutty product reviews online and thought how could anyone pay attention to just a girl's body. Jinkyong was angry. He called the buyers vile perverts and added that Amiri-chan deserved only love. The guy went on to read comments from vile perverts at the same site. His like was falling out of his head. Apparently he found the comment that pissed him off the most. One user wrote his formula for happiness, namely lick once on one day, and he stays satisfied. The guy also ordered an Amiri-chan bikini figure. Payment was completed, and the purchase itself cost 58,800 won. The guy got up from behind his computer desk and started looking out the window, then mouthed that the price was not cheap for happiness. In the store at the cash register, a woman was punching out items and serving another customer. But then the cashier was distracted from her work by a message that arrived on her phone. It was Jinkyong's mom, and she was surprised at someone texting her while she was working. The woman reached for her phone and saw that it was a message from the bank. She realized that her son Jinkyong had bought something new. The visitor did not like the fact that the employee was distracted by the phone and asked the woman to count everything faster. The cashier herself apologized. Later, Jinkyong's mother went back to work, but still wondered what could have happened. Did her son really think of going out? Meanwhile, in Jinkyong's room, everything remained unchanged, the guy staring at the monitor screen. Afterward, he pushed back his chair and moved around a bit to the music from his computer. Next, Jinkyong turned off all the lights in the room and drew the curtains, then fell asleep. Waking up, the guy still continued to stare at his computer screen. Jinkyong yawned and said that the first season has been watched. He also remarked that it remains a masterpiece the second time around. On the guy's desk was the very stone that little Hazy had given him for the connection between worlds. The stone lay there, and it was as if it was looking at the lad himself, asking him to pull himself together. Jinkyong thought about how his summoner was doing. He further assumed that if the guy wasn't being summoned, he must be fine. But Jinkyong dismissed the idea of using the stone and assured himself that he shouldn't worry about it. But the boy's thoughts were distracted by the sound of the doorbell, which made Jinkyong bounce in his chair. The guy went to his intercom and saw the delivery man in the cell. He was a little freaked out. Jinkyong thought to himself, would it be better to ask him to leave the package with the guard and leave? But later the guy gave up on that idea and grabbed the door and told himself that he was brave even in a battle with a huge monster. Jinkyong assured himself that he could do anything, and the courier was already standing at his door introducing himself. The courier didn't hear back from the customer for a long time, and just stood under the door waiting for Jinkyong. Jinkyong asked the courier to leave the package under the door and leave. The guy's voice was a little scared. And then Jinkyong in front of the front door heard the words of the courier, who agreed to leave the package under the door. Jinkyong was proud of himself. He told himself that he had succeeded and was able to talk to a real person. Jinkyong looked at the clock in the living room and said that now we need to schedule the time, so that the courier has time to enter the elevator and come down. The guy thought it was worth waiting 30 seconds. 30 seconds passed, but Jinkyong still didn't dare. He said he would wait another 10 seconds. The guy walked back to the door and said he could now pick up the package in a flash. Jinkyong stood and worked up the courage to leave the threshold of his apartment. He took a deep breath. And on an exhale, the guy told himself it was already time to go and was full of determination. Jinkyong quickly extended his palm to the doorknob. Afterward, the guy pulled the handle down sharply. But then the lock did not open, but only made an unpleasant sound. Jinkyong recoiled back as if from an electric shock that emanated from the castle. The guy didn't give up and headed toward the front door again. He grunted in frustration and stared intently in the direction of the door lock. He realized the door was closed and started looking for ways to solve the problem. Jinkyong kept looking at the door lock and realized that his parents had changed the password. But the guy didn't lose hope and reaching out to the panel said he'd guessed the new password for the door. The guy pressed the button and began another attempt to finally open the front door. He quickly dialed the numbers on the lock's keypad and pressed the confirmation button. Afterward, he swung his hand on the doorknob. The guy realized that he finally had it all worked out and could go out to pick up the package. With a feeling of triumph and shouting that he was finally able to break the lock, the guy walked out the door. But to his great regret and embarrassment, there was a neighbor across from his door who was opening her front door. The neighbors only looked at each other awkwardly, but no words were spoken. Afterward, Jinkyong was scared of the girl and ran back to his house. He quietly carried the box to his doorstep, while the neighbor continued to watch the strange guy. Afterward, the door slammed shut and the girl remained looking towards Jinkyong's door. Jinkyong curled up in a ball in his bed after this incident and covered his head with a pillow. The guy couldn't be happy that he was able to get the package himself. There were tears in Jinkyong's eyes and he began to laugh softly. The guy, in a fit of pride, continued to lie in the same position. The action shifts to a magical world in which little Hayes summoned Jinkyong. Illyra turned around and looked away, wondering if her companions found the girl with Jake okay. Tired little Hazy and Benny said they had been looking for Mrs. Illyra with Jake for 3 whole days. Hayes went on to tell Illyra that they had been delayed because of Benny, and the lady assumed that it was Benny who had brought her here, and asked if it was the little girl's first time at her uncle's country villa. Later, Illyra asked Benny where he had been, for she wanted to give him an errand, but the lad replied that he had stood as he was told. Illyra felt embarrassed and remembered leaving the guy standing there and asked if he had continued to stand. Later, the realization came to the girl that she hadn't ordered her to get to her feet, and Illyra asked who had allowed the guy to get up. Benny obediently put his hands out in front of him and got back into the pose he had been in by the fire. Illyra called Little Eye into the villa and asked the girl to greet her uncle. Little Hayes was confused at such a suggestion and asked how such a commoner could go to a lord. But Illyra calmed the girl down and reminded her that they had studied summoning magic at the same school. Illyra also added that her uncle wanted to see the baby girl, and Hayes immediately agreed. The girl was passed inside. The villa of the gentleman was indeed expensive. Everything there looked luxurious. A man surrounded by a guard and a maid was eating lunch and looking toward his guests. Little Hayes greeted the gentleman from Potrin, bowing to him and introducing herself. The man asked the girl to pass, rather. The man said he heard about how the girl helped Illyra retreat. He asked if it was hard to fight the monsters, but Illyra said she was the one who fought the monsters, and Hayes just ran away with them. The Lord said that there was no life at all now, because of the monsters, and also suggested to the girl that if she had nowhere else to go, she could stay here and do some simple work. Little Hayes bowed once more and expressed her gratitude. The man said that the girl would be given new clothes, and once she had changed, everything would be explained to her. Little Hayes was taking a bath in the gentleman's villa after their brief conversation. She greedily pounced on the mug of treats that stood next to the tub. The girl examined her new clothes and told herself that because of the monster attacks, the Lord was also in a difficult position. The little girl further appreciated being given a hot meal and new clothes and called the gentleman from Potrin a good man. Changing into all new clothes, Hazy began to examine her outfit on herself and asked if she could accept these clothes. Another worker asked Hazy if she was ready for training, and she said she was. The girl waved her hand and indicated for Hazy to follow her around the Lord's villa. It was obvious from the little girl's face that she didn't like her new position much and expected differently. Baby Hazy was scrubbing the floor and realized she got new stuff, so it needs work, and it's obvious. The other female workers were also cleaning, and Hazy thought that this was the only one that looked suspicious. Hayes decided to ask one of the female workers why they were all wearing the same clothes. The girl explained that the gentleman is obsessed with uniforms. He says that general clothing looks neat. The employee also added that maids should have such uniforms. These words shocked the little girl. She remembered her parents telling her to be careful of aristocrats who turned up their noses. The girl's dead mother telling her that she should become a great summoner. The girl remembered her mother's words that she was afraid lest her daughter become a servant, and Hayes fell to her knees and begged her father and mother for forgiveness. Meanwhile, it was daytime in the real world, and Jinkyong's apartment was well lit by the sun. The boy gazed admiringly in front of him. He was mesmerized by something. In front of him stood the figurine he had bought. He thought it was the same Amiri-chan from the Idol producer, the figurine version of the live-action version from the beach one summer night. The guy was proud of his purchase and knelt in front of the toy, repeating to himself that he had done it. The guy said that if he had more money, he'd make Amiri-chan figures all over the room. But he's just a streamer. The guy held on to the unopened package and said he'd already bought everything he needed, but he should only be opened at the most important moment. Meanwhile, Jinkyong's parents were eating dinner in the kitchen. An awkward pause had been very long in their conversation, and the mother decided to diffuse it. The woman said that their son Jinkyong received the package himself today, and the man stiffened. The man didn't respond anything to the boy's mother's words. He just froze with the spoon at his mouth. But the pause was short-lived, and the man resumed his dinner. The lad's father did not share his admiration on this occasion, and said that if he sitting at home alone could not receive the package, he would be no better than a cat or a dog. Jinkyong's mother didn't respond to this in any way, and just continued eating dinner. After dinner, the family members went about their business, with Jinkyong's mother washing the dishes. While the woman was clearing the table and washing dishes, the boy's father was sitting at his computer. A man with a cigarette in his teeth stared intently into his monitor screen. His eyes were very intense, but he continued to stare into the monitor and smoke. Here the man finished his cigarette and put it out against the ashtray, and put the butt itself there as well. Afterward, the boy's father continued working at his computer and actively clicking his mouse. The maids were going through the garden, and one of them told Hayes that since the girl was doing well, the master had given a special commission. The little girl asked, "What kind?" The girl said that many lives had been lost because of the monsters. The Lord was short of maids to work with, but actually even more short of peasants. The Lord thought about it and decided to lend the girl this land, so that she could cultivate it, harvest it with his help, and repay the debt to him. Surprised, Hayes asked about the debt, and the maid replied that it was payment for staying at the Lord's villa, for food, clothing, and water used for washing, for security while working at the villa, and so on. Hayes could not get away from these words, and the maid went on, saying that the rent for this land would be covered by her labor, a special privilege. Also, she wished the little girl a good harvest. Hayes thought that was the end of it, and her life was gone, and the maid was just walking away from her. Little Hayes was left there alone, not knowing what to do with all that land. This was definitely not what the girl had expected from her life, and she realized that she had let her dead parents down. The weather was clear in the sky, and it could have been a great day for the little one. The girl took a long time to come to her senses, but still decided to stretch. Afterward, she grabbed a branch that lay not far from Hayes herself. The little girl moved it farther away so it wouldn't be so messy on the property. Later, she clapped her hands together and looked at her new possessions, and couldn't say anything for a long time. A smile appeared on the little girl's face, and she sighed, saying it was for her hard work. Through the little girl's smile, tears streamed from her eyes. This was clearly not the outcome she was expecting. The girl fell to her knees in despair and cried out in tears that she was trapped and could not get out again. She asked to herself what she should do now, muttering the name Mr. Streamer. Meanwhile, at Jinkyong's house, the intercom rang again, just as it had when the courier arrived. Jinkyong looked at the intercom screen and thought it was a delivery again, since his parents were at work. The guy looked at the delivery guy and thought it was mom or dad ordering something. He also pondered, what should he do? Normally, he would have ignored such a thing. The guy had made a mistake last time, but if he was more careful now, there was a chance of success, he reassured himself. He also remembered that he had received a package from a courier before, which meant it should be less difficult for him. Just like last time, Jinkyong asked the courier to leave the package under the door, and he graciously agreed. Jinkyong was no longer as proud of himself as he was last time, but he still appreciated his success. The guy stood at the door and hesitated a bit, trying to decide how much longer he should wait. And then determination came to him. The guy was full of confidence and headed for the front door where a package lay on the other side. Jinkyong stared through the peephole to make sure no one was in the hallway. He saw that the neighbor's door was closed. The delivery man wasn't around, which meant he wasn't in any danger. Jinkyong said quietly now, assuming that there would be no better time. The guy's fingers began hastily typing the password on the security panel of the front door. But then, the unexpected happened. A noise came from the door across the hall. The door opened and a guy came out of the apartment where the girl had entered last time. After the guy was followed by a neighbor who was putting on her shoes. Jinkyong saw it all through the peephole. The guy took his hand off the defense panel. He decided he had been lucky to peek through the peephole, for it was very close to failure. The guy was about to go out and assured himself that everything would be fine. He was very nervous. The guy in the hallway looked toward the box and asked the girl what it was. She replied that it was a parcel to the apartment across the street, and she remembered yesterday sharply. The guy asked about it in detail. The girl replied that she was speechless. There was such a mess outside the door. She added that the boyfriend before leaving the apartment said the door was locked. The girl also said how Jinkyong was excited to pick up the package and added that he had long black hair, black clothes, and huge circles under his eyes. The girl thought it was a ghost, and the guy asked, "Is their neighbor Hikomori by any chance?" The girl replied that she didn't know, but she definitely didn't want to meet him again in her life. The laughing couple's words seemed to hurt Jinkyong, who was barely hanging onto the door. The guy's eyes narrowed, and he began to shake and fidget. He remembered all the angry comments from all the groups on the internet that he had read about himself. The guy felt even worse, but the bad memories wouldn't let him go. He also recalled two men discussing him, suspecting he was an internet guy. Jinkyong continued to stand over the door while the voices in his head recalled all the bullying he had done to him. The hurtful words and threats only grew louder in the guy's head. All the memories that had happened to him in 3 years had hit Jinkyong very hard mentally. It was as if Jinkyong had all the strength sucked out of his body. He just fell down with a clatter right in front of the door. Father Jinkyong entered the apartment and began loosening the knot of the tie on his collar. The man's gaze drifted to the side where he saw something that interested him greatly. It was a package brought by a courier in the afternoon, and Jinkyong asked him to leave the delivery by the door. The man continued to look at the package without meeting anyone in the living room. Just then, the boyfriend's mother came out of the kitchen and asked her husband if he had come and received an affirmative answer. The man was about to undress, but then his wife started to tell the news about their son Jinkyong. The woman narrated to her spouse that she found Jinkyong lying unconscious at the front door. The boy's mother wanted to call an ambulance, but Jinkyong won't leave his room. The man hearing this immediately turned away from his wife and headed in the other direction. Jinkyong's father turned toward the front door and was closing it. Jinkyong's mom asked her spouse not to be so pushy and do things slowly. The man was already on his way to his room and was holding onto the doorknob but stopped to answer his wife. My dad said he just needed something so he ordered delivery, or can he get a courier to his house? The door to the room slammed shut, and the woman was left alone in the living room. The boy's mother turned toward the window, pondering her husband's words and actions. Meanwhile, Jinkyong's own room was closed, and he didn't want to come out of it. The computer from the guy's desk moved to his chair, which was right in front of his bed. An insect spiral was burning next to him, and a monitor stood upright on the chair. Jinkyong lay wrapped up in a blanket, the guy's condition leaving much to be desired. Apparently, Jinkyong himself was very much hurt by his neighbor's words about himself and the memories of 3 years ago. Meanwhile, the weather in the magical world was perfect, and the sun was starting to come out from behind the horizon. There was some small gathering of people in the courtyard of the gentleman's beautiful villa. There stood all the maids who worked in the villa and listened to the instruction. The gentleman himself remarked that his thoughts about little Hayes were correct. The head maid was handing something into the hands of a small and frightened girl. The man watched little Hayes with morbid interest and said she was perfect. The black dress and white apron fit her perfectly. All the maids continued to listen to the instruction while the master peered out at little Hayes from the villa window. The main one of the maids said that she had finished handing out the master's instructions and asked her to try her best during the robot today as well. Then ended the instructions. The little girl walked quietly down the path and thought she was a maid, a cleaner, and a peasant, plowing in the fields from lunchtime, cleaning at night or doing nobody's business. The guys were working in the field and the girl noticed them. They are guards and peasants, working in the fields adjacent to the villa, and with the monsters approaching, fighting them. The maid and the cook, the hunter and the doctor all survive burdened with the right things to do, Hayes continued. This is the price they all pay to the Lord, but the girl was tormented by the question why. Little Hayes is very hurt by this, but if she is alone she won't be able to survive. But with such a life, the girl would definitely become a slave, and she was very much frightened by this thought. The girl remembered the note that had been handed to her. It was the Lord's instructions, and she decided to read them. There are people working in places where monsters still roam. Take care of safety. Prepare well and fight. Let not a single person get hurt. The girl tried to think over what was written in the note, for he had not expected such an instruction. Baby Hayes was all pissed off by this, and all her stuff fell from her hands to the ground. But she had no choice. She only grudgingly asked what this gentleman was carrying and went on her way. The girl was finally able to reach her field and saw some critter tooling around in it. An indignant little Hayes looked toward her field and tried to make sense of it. They were small birds that resembled crows or chickens. They were just pecking at the grass in the field. The birds were making holes in the ground with their beaks, which annoyed Hayes. The girl ran toward them in desperation and shouted that it was her precious field. After that, Hayes stopped and thought that if she called the field precious, she was already becoming a slave. But also the girl's head was visited by thoughts that the debt is growing day by day and she can't miss the chance to earn extra money. The girl decided for herself that she would not rely on Mr. Streamer this time and would try to summon Jin like Mrs. Alera. Little Hayes began waving her hand and reciting her summoning spell. A small ring of fire appeared beneath the sorceress's feet. The ring was filled with a beam that aimed for the sky. But Hayes was not yet celebrating her victory. The fire spirit that Jake and Alera had summoned before jumped out of the ring. The little girl's eyes filled with hope, and she watched the Jin come in. But in the end, instead of a huge genie, a small light appeared at the little girl's feet. The girl crouched down and moved her hair out of her eyes to get a better look at what she had gotten. The realization came to little Hayes that she hadn't been able to summon Jin. She felt a little resentful. Here Hayes couldn't stand it and didn't call out to anyone else. He took the hoe and ran toward the birds. With a mighty swing, the little girl struck close to the birds to drive them away. The birds were of course frightened of the girl with the hoe and ran somewhere far away from here. The girl shouted about the anger of the peasant woman, but afterward threw down the hoe, saying that it was not so. The little girl sat on her lap and said that even a hoe was stronger than her magic. Could she really become an agriculturist? Meanwhile, the story moves back to the Lord's villa. Jake came to Alera and her uncle, the host greeting the guest, though not particularly enthusiastically. A frightened Alera asked Jake what was wrong with her father. The man replied that all was well. The Lord and King were taking countermeasures against the monsters. The master asked Jake if he had been able to find out the reason for the monsters, and he said he had, which was why he had come here. A while later, the action continues in the same villa. The Lord and Alera sit at the same table with the hooded guy, the maid serving them meanwhile. The Lord said that if the lad was sent by the king, it was very good, and asked him to speak faster. The guy said he obeyed the Lord and introduced himself. He's a mage from the northern part of Calithian Ronian. Alera was surprised and asked the guy they still existed, and the mage replied that they did. There were many in the past, but now they were almost extinct and were studying summoning magic. The Lord also remarked that he hadn't seen a mage in years. Afterwards he asked the lad if he came from the north of Calaton. The lad again replied that that was where he came from, and added that it was the place where there was a passage to the sky for the monsters. As the Lord knows, humanity has sealed the passage to stop the monsters. On the continent of Kailiot, for the sake of healing this seal, mages and soldiers have been called in to help, and they were able to hold back the flow of those monsters, which many years later, after making a hole in the passage, still broke out. However, at one point they could no longer hold them back and the monsters broke out. And eventually Kailiota was reduced to ruins, and the monsters that had escaped began to slowly move south. Everyone at the table was horrified by this news. They asked what had become of the Arrayas closest to Kailioti. If they can't make it to southern Arrayas, they won't make it to Korra. But while the guy was on his way to relay the news from the north, something happened. The lad had seen with his own eyes how the country of Arrayas had already become a battlefield for monsters. The Lord continued to listen attentively. The king has sent soldiers to Arias to help, and he himself is about to embark on an expedition to discover the cause and find a solution to the catastrophe that has occurred in the north. Alera asked again about the expedition, and the lad replied that he had been told of a qualified man whom the Lord might recommend to them for a team. He was told that the best summoner was here, and the lad asked the Lord if it was true. An awkward pause hovered over the conversation, Alera trying to find something to answer the guest mage. Benny called the question rude and added that everyone knows Alera is the best draft pick. After his words, Benny moved back to his pose, from which he had not yet been ordered to get up. Alera got up from the table and said that she had gone to a school that trained the best summoners, but she needed to think about it. The mage replied that he understood the girl. Meanwhile, the sun was already fading into the sunset and the day was slowly coming to an end in the magical world. Baby Hayes sat scared in the field and hysterically repeated that it was too wide, so she just planned to try it out. The girl looked at the small sprout and thought about why it had sprouted. It should take 5 days. The little girl roared over the sprout and complained about her innate talent for farming. The birds that had annoyed her in the morning returned to the girl and began to caw loudly. Hayes heard this and called the birds creepers. She realized this was another problem. She grabbed a hoe and complained about them coming again, even though she was sick of it. The girl held her hoe threateningly in her hands and told the birds that they had come to her field again, and threatened them not to come here again. But then apparently she saw something behind the birds that attracted her interest much more. A huge crow, the size of a small mountain, that looked right at the little girl. The girl got a little nervous and told the birds that this time they decided to bring their mom. The city could barely see the sun in the overcast sky. The weather was depressing indeed. Jinkin's mood matched the weather outside the window. But then the guy abruptly opened his eyes and woke up. Jinkin saw the stone Heisey had given him start to glow and jumped up abruptly from the bed. The guy wouldn't throw off his blanket, thinking it was dangerous outside. He continued to have a panic attack. The stone kept glowing, moving, and making strange noises as if it were a telephone. And Jinkin himself continued to stand still and think about the fact that outside of the blanket, one could die. But the lad was seized with a fit of courage and he slipped his body from the shackles of the blanket. Jinkin smiled, and there was even a smile visible on his pale face. Perhaps he was glad to be called upon by little Hayes. The shield from the outside world that the blanket served as finally fell off the guy. The pale Jinkin said that if he was going to die, it definitely wouldn't be today, and took the stone in his hands. Already a familiar and customary procedure for the guy as his room is flooded with blue light. Jinkin is transported to a magical world. In the sky stands a beam of the same color as his room. The boy kept straight for the field where little Hayes met the huge crow. Crow looked up to see what could accompany such a sound in bright light. Little Hazy immediately realized it was Jinkin flying and started greeting him, calling the guy Mr. Streamer. But later apparently something embarrassed her and she got a little shy. The little girl with the hoe in her hands was something displeased at the appearance of the fellow she had summoned. This time, unlike the others, Jinkin had already descended in a flashy and beautiful manner, and his appearance was accompanied by music. The guy himself with the bag on his shoulders adopted his new pose, which he had invented especially for such an occasion. The music continued to play and Jinkin landed without looking around. The guy was sure he looked cool. Baby Hayes was shy of Jinkin and called his movements embarrassing. Jinkin had already landed right in front of the huge crow, but he didn't stop humming his music, and Hayes covered her ears so she wouldn't hear it. The little girl turned away and tried to hide. She herself had never been so embarrassed in front of monsters before. Jinkin's foot finally came down and was able to feel the ground, and the guy took the first step. Immediately after landing, the guy didn't say anything. He waited out the pause for everyone to see him. He twitched a little, standing on one leg and lifting his head up a little, said adventuring. Experiencing Spanish shame, little Hayes was afraid to show her face to the monsters. Next, Jinkin still stood in his usual pose and told the monsters that their lonely souls would fall before his great power. Jinkin turned around and turned to Hayes, whom he called Aichan, and asked her to wait a bit. Turning around, Jinkin saw the girl hiding and covering her ears. He asked what was wrong with her. Little Hayes couldn't hear the guy or see, and Jinkyong himself threatened the monsters that they would answer for what they had done to the girl. The guy pulled out a lighter and started showing the huge bird, who had never seen it before. The boy explained that it was a flame, the embodiment of destructive power, the darkness taking root here. But he was not allowed to finish his sentence. A huge crow interrupted the guy's words with its loud carcane and strong wind. Jinkyong almost flew away from such force, but still stayed on his feet and told the monster that it was wrong to interrupt him when he was voicing the text of the sentence. The guy started lighting a lighter and saying it was a wild flame and a scary weapon, but the crow wasn't much interested in his words and continued to caw loudly. Jinkyong was already very angry and said he liked the chicken better roasted. A huge jet of flames came out of Jinkyong's lighter, burning everything in its path. Jinkyong struck the neck of the crow to cut off its head and kill it. Everything around it was burning. The crow's head flew off in the other direction from the guy who was pathetically humming some song. After Jinkyong decapitated the crow, he directed the powerful flame from his lighter upwards. He called his implement his father's #1 best lighter and swung it toward the crow. Jinkyong shouted a shattering shout and then cut the huge crow's torso into 2 halves. The body of the decapitated bird had been cut clearly down the center as if by a very sharp knife. Afterward, the place where the huge crow's head was glowed with a bright red light. The crow's body exploded and left behind a huge flame around it that took up half the field. Burnt feathers were flying around the field, and the guy stood as if he had a flaming sword in his hands. Jinkyong watched everything he had done and said that the bird was now roasted properly. Somehow this place felt calmer to the boy's soul, even though it was much more dangerous here than in his world. Baby Hazy decided to peek out after hiding in shame and covering her ears. The girl looked at all the destruction the battle had left behind, and couldn't believe that Jinkyong was able to do it all in one blow. The girl cried out frustratedly that her entire field had been destroyed in one blow, and Jinkyong stood there not understanding the little girl's words. Little Hayes could barely hold back tears, but thanked Mr. Streamer anyway, and Jinkyong asked if that field was hers. The girl replied that it was hers, but also clarified that it was more of a lord, and Jinkyong asked if she was a cultivator or a summoner. But then some realization came to Jinkyong. He decided to look at the girl and think for a while. The girl brought him back to life, and she was wearing a maid's uniform. That was saying a lot. From the front, this suit definitely doesn't look like a knockoff. The guy went lower and lower in the image of the girl and paid attention to the fabric. It was solid. Every seam was carefully stitched. He also decided that this fantasy world really was perfect. A beautiful maid's dress. A view that really gives a feel for the hard work. Further, the guy decided to appreciate the smell from the girl and started sniffing her. From the outside, it looked like Jinkyong was like a pervert looking under her skirt and sniffing, so Hayes asked him what he was doing. Jinkyong was not confused and stood up and replied that he was examining the girl for injuries, and the little girl herself replied that she was fine. Just then, the couple heard the little crows carping again. The girl called the parasites creepers because they were interfering with her field. The guy said he tasted his mother's little chicks and now he might as well go for them. Hayes replied that Jinkyong looks like a rascal now. The chicks started screaming even louder, and huge paws appeared behind their backs. Jinkyong and little Hayes immediately stopped laughing from their chicks and had stony expressions on their faces. In the distance of the field was another huge crow, just like the one Jinkyong had killed. The couple was standing right in front of a huge raven, and Jinkyong assumed it was the father of the family. The cocky guy yelled at the huge monster for frying his wife, and Hayes pointed out that the guy was like a demon. The huge raven most likely didn't like the sharp comments toward his wife and started loudly carping and growling. The guy said that was great, and he could easily kill another monster, and little Hayes asked him to be careful with the field. The raven continued to scream unbearably at the entire field. The sight of him was much more terrifying than before. It turns out the big bird didn't come alone. A huge flock of birds appeared behind the raven freak's back. Thousands of little crows were running toward little Hazy and Jinkyong, who were more than a little frightened. The birds cried out loudly and moved quickly towards their mother's abusers. They were eager for revenge. Jinkyong looked at little Hayes and asked if it was worth leaving the field, and she said it looked like she'd have to give it up. The guy turned towards the monster and said that he would once again show how tough he was. Jinkyong took out a lighter and held it in his hands, then tried to light the fire. The guy saw that there was no gas left inside the lighter itself at all. It was completely empty. Later, the guy remembered something else, namely his mouse and mosquito spray. They too had come up empty after he killed the monster. This whole situation alerted Jinkyong. After all, he had no real superpowers. He only killed monsters at the expense of earthly things. The guy looked awkwardly at the little girl and asked if he could go home, for he had forgotten something. Hayes herself interjected. What had the guy forgotten? The guy replied that it was nothing anymore, and the girl thought they were already over, while Jinkyong himself realized that he hadn't looked at the dress enough yet. The guy thought about what he should do now. He remembered the stone. He had little time to prepare because the communication device lit up abruptly. The guy opened his bag and started to look around. What he took with him besides his father's lighter he also took the very thing he ordered delivered. And also, besides the figurine and the lighter, he only had a mosquito-repellent spiral burning in his room. Jinkyong looked at this set of tools and couldn't figure out what to think of. Time was not playing into the guy's hands, and little Hazy was already in full cry that they were getting closer and almost here. The boy took one of the spirals in the palm of his hand, and little Haze quietly warned him of the danger. The guy stared at the empty lighter and tried to force himself to think. Right now, he needed to find something. Magic, abilities that Jinkyong could only imagine in this place all came true. The guy was looking at the spiral and thought that if you looked at it from that angle, it looked like something. The guy lit the spiral and tried to think of exactly what it looked like, and little Hazy kept calling out to him. Jinkyong's face changed in an instant. He abruptly opened his eyes and remembered something. Guy pointed the mosquito spiral toward the birds and shouted to the little girl that he would protect her field. Thousands of crows stumbled to the ground from the smell of the burning spiral that Jinkyong held in his hands. There was also a lot of spiraling smoke around Jinkyong himself, as if it was coming from the guy's hands. Baby Hazy was worried about the guy and kept screaming, calling him Mr. Streamer. The smoke reached the beak of the largest raven as well, and it stared its head at the ground as if concussed. The beak of the unconscious bird suddenly caught fire and began to glow a bright lava color. Jinkyong stood in the center of the smoke and fire. It was as if the end of the world was happening on the field. The guy also quietly said he had forgotten about his baby girl, hinting at a new weapon. Jinkyong shouted in front of the burning crows that this was his anti-mosquito field. Afterward, he ordered his field to turn around and began spiraling with the spiral. The huge raven was already swinging its beak toward the guy, trying to eat him or bite him. But he failed. The beak of the huge beast bird burned away before it could even touch Jinkyong's body. All the crows around them began to explode and burn. The field was enveloped in huge flames. Another section of crows where the guy turned the direction of the smoke was burned alive. The last remnants of the nasty mutant birds were finishing up and exploding. The field was more like a military training ground. A huge explosion and a jet of flame could be seen coming from the sky. In front of Jinkyong and little Hazy was a trail of huge flames resembling a nuclear mushroom. Jinkyong stood calmly and watched the remains of the crows he had managed to defeat finish. Little Hazy herself didn't expect such power from Mr. Streamer, and just watched everything scared and confused. On the guy's hands remained the same spiral with which he had killed an army of birds. The spiral was already levitating in the air on its own, without the help of Jinkyong's hands. Baby Haze ran to the guy and asked him if he was okay. Jinkyong replied that he was fine. The little girl looked at the spiral and asked what it was, and Jinkyong replied that he didn't know how to explain. It was a system that protected the walls of each person's soul. Little Haze didn't understand a word, so she asked again, and the boy replied that mere mortals couldn't understand it. The girl also turned to the walls that appeared around her field and asked if this was the guy's work, and Jinkyong said yes. The guy hesitated with the answer, but said that until that smell was gone, the walls would be a defense, I guess. But then Jinkyong himself came with uncomfortable questions. He asked the girl why she was farming. He was a summoner. The girl wasn't verbose. She just said that's what happened, and the guy remarked that it looked more like a wasteland than a field. Little Haze explained that she cleans the mansion and also cultivates this fertile land. Jinkyong asked how she does it in such a wilderness alone. The boy scratched his chin and said it looked dangerous, and the little girl confirmed his words, adding that monsters had attacked before, but not in such large numbers as they did today. The girl said that even in a place like this, so many monsters appeared. If it is not safe here too, it is a big trouble. Jinkyong said that the little girl is in a difficult position. Jinkyong was in a great mood and asked the girl to guide him. They haven't seen each other for a long time and he wants to guide her. The girl was confused by this offer. Little Haze and Jinkyong were walking along the fields on a huge path. The sun was already going into the sunset. The girl looked at the sunset and told Jinkyong that it was amazing, and the guy interrupted her. The girl explained that usually minions can't stay that long in the world they were summoned to. The guy was interested in this, and the little girl continued by saying that minions draw on the energy of the summoner, so they can't stay in that world for long. The little girl doesn't think she has that much energy, and she doesn't have that kind of incredible power. But Jinkyong doesn't care. Jinkyong didn't miss the opportunity to flatter himself, and said that the girl couldn't imagine how gorgeous his body was. Apparently the little girl didn't mean that and just left her confused look on the guy. The girl averted her gaze from Jinkyong and thought about something while the guy continued to flatter himself. The little girl continued walking with her eyes closed, and this was noticed by Jinkyong, who was concerned. The concerned guy asked the little girl if she might be worried about something. The little girl was trying to find the words to address Jinkyong. She was a little embarrassed. The girl asked if it was useless to pursue a business for which there was no talent at all. Jinkyong pondered. The little girl started to get a little shy and added that she didn't know how great people like Mr. Streamer had it. But regular people like little Hazy herself usually worry about a lot of things. The girl added. Jinkyong replied that even a business that you have talent for is very hard to do, and if you don't have any talent at all, you'll be more like a stubborn fool. The surprised girl expected to hear words of encouragement, but kept hearing Jinkyong say that there were some people who talked about their talent while thinking they were the protagonists of a novel. Oh, they talk about how hard it is for them. They ask for attention, they just lack attention, they should just not respond. Little Hayes asked how it was not to answer, and Jinkyong replied that it was like that, just not to answer. Jinkyong went on to say that the lives of such people just don't have an answer and started laughing. The girl thought about it and repeated the words about there being no answer in the lives of such people, and laughed too. Little Hayes laughed through her pain and decided to think after Jinkyong's words. The girl's decision to become a summoner and her reluctance to become a servant. It's all just her wishes and there's no answer to it, just like Jinkyong said. Suddenly Jinkyong remembered something. He talked about the girl promising him a request. The guy held out some sort of sack into the girl's hands and pointed to it. Jinkyong walked behind the stone and closed his eyes as if embarrassed by his gift. The little girl asked what it was, and Jinkyong replied that it was bought for the girl's safety. She should wear it and let her look at herself once. The girl's eyes began to roll. She clearly didn't like the outfit the guy was proposing to wear. The girl was holding a bikini in her hands, very revealing, and Jinkyong through the stone asked, "This isn't a difficult request, is it?" Jinkyong said that even though this outfit looks simple, it's the same kind of outfit the idol producer wore. It's Amiri-chan's outfit from the Summer Beach release, after all. The guy covered his eyes with his hands and told the girl to let him know when he put it on. The girl was indignant as she held it all in her hands. On the one hand, she felt strange, but she had promised. Nakedness is proportional to defense, she thought. Isn't it more dangerous than doing a summoning of something unknown? But is it really safe to wear this thing? Well, the girl thought that there is no other meaning here. The guy is just afraid lest she get hurt. Jinkyong had already moved to his room but continued to address Hayes, saying that of course a maid's uniform was fine too, but the girl could treat it like a battle costume. Jinkyong asked if the girl had changed clothes and could open her eyes already, but he was already far away from Hayes. The guy in his room started to address the girl, calling her Ai-chan, but got no response. Little Hayes apologized to her minion and sent him back to her world. It was all happening in the same place, the guy's apartment that Little Hazy had moved him to. The guy sat in his chair in front of his computer and thought about the wave function being broken. The guy said it was 50-50 that the cat was in the box, dead or alive. He said we need to set up a close surveillance of the facility. We need to find out the physical condition of the facility. The boy looked at the rock he had been called upon and repeated the observation. He would just have to check. Next, Jinkyong snapped and started yelling that he wanted to see. He wanted to see a bikini. The guy got up out of his chair and started screaming hysterically that Ai-chan was left there in a bikini or a maid's uniform. He couldn't even dream of such a thing. The boy's mother, who was sitting in the kitchen, heard her son screaming and called attention to it. The girl thought that her son had been very gloomy the last few days. Had he really gotten better? She turned toward his room and thought that something seemed different about Jinkyong. The guy sat back in his chair and speculated whether his request was so impossible. According to his theory, it was shameful to shine underwear, and a swimsuit should be fine. Apparently, he was asking too much after all. Jinkyong kept looking at the stone and thinking that he had hardly ever interacted with girls, and couldn't understand them because of that. Jinkyong stared at his monitor screen and thought to himself, who would he ask something about girls? He turned his attention to the chat room where he was chatting with other users. The guy's fingers started typing rapidly on the keyboard. He clearly wanted to ask the guys on the internet for advice. He wrote a message asking if it was okay to give a girl a bikini. The guy's face was a little surprised at the responses he'd read in the chat room from other people. Someone wrote that it's okay. Why not? Someone said there's nothing wrong with it unless you ask to try it on. Someone made a joke about the guy not wearing it himself, and one guy asked Jinkyong, does he really have a girlfriend? Jinkyong didn't listen to the users from the chat room and called them idiots and said they were deeply wrong. The guy said he still has a chance. He'll change his approach. He has another way. He needs to think about magic to create a pool. Jinkyong took one look at the other side of his computer desk. On the edge of the table lay the very stone that hadn't glowed or summoned Jinkyong in 3 whole days. The guy thought, it's been about 3 days. Ai-chan must be busy in her field. Is she all right? Little Hayes herself was walking from her field at sunset with hoe in hand. The girl looked around her field and said she planted a lot of seeds today. Maybe tomorrow she should expand her field some more. The girl looked up at the sky and said it seemed time to water her field. She also hoped it would rain. Fortunately, thanks to Mr. Streamer, the girl is safe to work. Tomorrow should be another effort. Just then, the little girl heard someone calling her with a shout, calling her Mistress Ai. It was Benny, standing in the field and waving toward the little girl to get her attention. Benny headed towards the little girl. The sun was already setting over the horizon, and dusk was soon to come. Baby Hayes asked what was wrong and remarked that she hadn't seen the guy upright in a long time. Benny said he'd been walking normally for like 3 days now. Little Hayes appreciated such happiness in the lad, and asked where he came from. Benny, however, replied that Mrs. Alera had sent him to get a dress. Baby Hayes noted that it took Benny so long to walk to her field. He confirmed this and added that it was 3 whole days. The pair started walking together, and Benny ventured to ask little Hayes how she was doing in the field. The girl replied that she didn't know, just doing the best she could. She further added that when she lived alone and went to school for summoning magic, she only thought about what she could live on. Now the little girl thinks only about work. Completely different experiences appeared. Benny was interested in the girl's story. The girl said that this was how she lived, and afterward the little girl said uncertainly that she felt sort of lighter in her heart. Benny said there is such a thing as locking a wild animal in a cage and making it a pet. The girl looked at the guy and didn't understand what he was saying, and the guy continued his thought, saying that an animal that lives with peasants doesn't have to worry about predators or food. There are also people who, like such animals, want to gain someone's favor. Guy went on, saying that thinking is difficult and tedious for such people, and being responsible for something is burdensome. They think they can withstand a little exploitation, but they are wrong. The problem is the toll it all takes on freedom. If Benny could ever be free, it seems he could do anything. Such words made little Hayes sad and hurt. She realized that she had paid her freedom for a piece of bread. Benny said that the little girl is one of the commoners, but trained in summoning magic. Such always have a chance for something better. Benny also said that the summoner could even become an aristocrat, but little Hayes denied it. The little girl felt depressed. She said she had no ability and the girl wouldn't succeed. Benny laughed a little and said that last time Hayes was able to fight back, though. Isn't it cool to have powers like that? The girl replied that all her ability was to summon someone. She was just lucky enough to be able to summon a powerful person. Benny asked if that wasn't great, since one strong servant was so much better than several weak ones. But the little girl denied it and said it wasn't like that at all. A servant who has been summoned will fight until he is mortally wounded, then return to his world. And after a mortal wound, the acolyte may never answer the call at all. Inferior spirits are numerous, so you can always replace them with similar ones. But strong ancient heroes or similar spirits are only one. You can't replace them. Benny was a little confused and told the girl that it was all kind of complicated, and little Hayes decided to tell a simpler story. If the girl summons a peasant, she can summon many such people because there are so many peasants. Hayes asked if she would summon an elf. Benny replied that they were few. There was only one of them in the area. The girl said that if she couldn't summon a person one day, she was finished. She couldn't summon anyone but Mr. Streamer after all. Benny was confused by the servant's name. Baby Hayes said there just aren't answers in her life, and a confused Benny agreed, reiterating that the truth is there are no answers. Baby Hayes told Benny that at times like this you have to say something to comfort. Further, she wanted to say something about Alera, but the boy interrupted her and assured her that he knew himself. The action shifts to the Lord's villa, where it was now also evening. The mage approached Alera and asked if the lady understood about the summoner. The king was waiting. The girl said yes. The mage said that if no one else was available, they could take Alera on the team. The girl herself was shocked that her abilities weren't being taken seriously. The girl said it was such an important case, and she just wouldn't be a good fit for their team, then asked her to wait a little longer. The mage bowed and said he understood. Then he apologized, and Alera chased him away, calling the guy annoying in her head. The girl walked around and thought about who might be suitable for the role of summoner among her acquaintances. Alera thought it was worth calling someone from the summoner school, even though their strength wasn't enough. Just then the door to the room creaked and opened. Apparently someone had come to see Alera. It was little Hayes and Benny who had come in with the field, the lad carrying a bag on his shoulder with a dress for his mistress. Benny bowed and said he was back, and Alera asked him to leave his things and take a lying down stance. Little Hayes escorted a glance at poor Benny, whom the mistress was naturally mocking. The little girl saw Alera's temper and thought it best not to make her angry, so she quietly asked to leave, but her mistress detained her. The frightened and confused little girl asked what Mrs. Alera wanted from her. Mrs. Alera began to scrutinize the little girl who stood across the room. Hayes herself looked very tense. She had a hoe in her hands and was afraid she was about to be asked for something. Alera moved closer and began to examine the baby girl even better, while twisting her head around and looking from different angles. Alera pushed her thoughts aside and asked herself what she was just thinking, then let the little girl go. Little Hayes stayed in the villa and thought about what it was. She was afraid something terrible was going to happen. Alera stayed in the same spot and thought about if only there was someone near her who knew how to summon. The story moves from the magical world straight to Jinkyong's apartment. The guy hovered a little in his chair, looking at his monitor screen, his gaze seemingly glued there. The guy kept watching his TV series with beautiful actresses in the lead roles. Then his gaze wandered away from the show and he looked to the other side of his computer desk again. There still lay, given by Little Eye, the stone by which the lad had been summoned. Jinkyong decided to himself that he needed to think about it. If he didn't prepare and transferred, there would be the same difficulties. The guy said that Ai apparently relies on him a lot. Meanwhile, in the chat room, one user wrote that Nuna came. Everyone started sending stickers of greeting. Jinkyong took notice of this and noticed that they were greeting so cheerfully. On the screen, a girl was asking Amiri-chan what she was doing here, and Jinkyong remembered that they were Senpai Amiri-chan and Caprin-chan. The guy called the girl a troublemaker, but a good one, and the guys in the chat room complete fools. Jinkyong said he had so many thoughts and couldn't focus. He repeated it and asked why Amiri-chan had such a serious face. Caprin-chan asks Amiri-chan if she wants to leave the idols. Amiri said they're friends, she can't sing as well as the others and she dances so-so. That's why Amiri-chan is thinking of ending it all. She shared her thoughts with her friend. Jinkyong was surprised at this denouement of events in the plot of his favorite show. Caprin-chan asked Amiri to look into her eyes and answer. The girl agreed. A friend asked Amiri-chan if she was happy on stage, and if her fans were happy. Amiri found it difficult to answer. She just stared into her friend's face. The girl thought long over the answer, but still hesitated a little and said yes. Caprin said that was enough. That was Adel's goal, so the girl could take it easy, and if she was worried about something, she could tell her friend right away. No need to tell others. It was as if some sort of realization came to Jinkyong after Caprin's words that she was trying to support her friend with. Caprin also told Amiri that she would always support her friend and take her side. The guy's enthusiasm woke up even more and his eyes opened very wide. He remembered Little Hayes asking him if it was worth pursuing an endeavor for which he had no talent. The guy finally realized that he'd been very blunt in his interactions with Ai-chan and hadn't been paying attention to what she'd said before. When Jinkyong first met Hayes, the girl clarified that this was the first time she had been able to summon someone. The guy was only chatting with streamers all the time, so he couldn't understand other people's feelings. The guy put his hand next to the summoning stone and said he was a fool. He was too stupid, and that's why Little Hayes refused to put on a swimsuit. A strong vibration went through Little Hayes' body. It was as if something was trying to wake her up. The little girl got out of bed and asked herself what that had just been. She suddenly had goosebumps running up her spine. Waking up, Little Hayes stared angrily at the table that stood across from her bed. There was a bikini that Jinkyong handed over. The girl marveled at the fact that even such a small garment existed. The girl decided to try on a bra, and was wondering how to properly fit it on her body. Realizing that it was too revealing clothing, Little Hayes blushed very hard at this. The girl took the candle in her hands, put the beach underwear in her pocket, and said she would burn it outside and come back. It was now deep night in the magical world. The Lord's villa was barely visible. The girl walked leisurely out into the yard and apologized to Mr. Streamer, but she wouldn't wear it. Here the girl's attention was distracted by a strong light in the distance, a fiery beam that came from one spot. The rings of fire flew higher and higher into the sky, lighting up everything around them. The little girl became curious. It was a mage who was practicing his skills. He was lighting flames from his hands. The little girl stepped closer and marveled at the skills of the mage who had come to them for help. The guy's hands naturally held a flame. His palm, like a lighter, held a fire on it. From admiration, the little girl exclaimed, "Wow!" And the mage, noticing this, asked the girl who she was. The girl bowed before the mage, said hello, and introduced herself, her name I. Hayes. Next, Little Hayes said sadly that she was a farmer. The guy bowed as well and said that he was a Ranian mage. He had business to attend to the Lord, and that's why he was here. The girl was surprised and asked the guy, "Is he really a mage and everything that just happened was magic?" The guy laughed a little and confirmed it was magic. The girl said it was the first time she had seen a mage. She also added that she went to a summoner school, but magic wasn't taught there. Mage Ronian replied that it couldn't be otherwise. The summoner school can't teach magic. The guy went on to ask what his magic was like. Little Hayes replied that there was a beautiful fire coming out of his hands, a light that illuminated everything around him. That's exactly what it looked like. The guy said he did and started spinning his finger around, offering to show me something else. Mage Ronian began to recite a spell and spread his hands in different directions. A circle appeared around the girl and the guy, which was glowing with a bright green light. Little Hayes gazed admiringly at the beauty that was going on around them. It was as if there were thousands of stars around the couple, and the delighted little girl lifted her head up. The girl watched the beautiful sight and enthusiastically praised the guy's magic. The girl said it was as if 1,000,000 shooting stars were circling in a dance. "The magic is so beautiful," the little girl swept up and asked, "What kind of magic is this?" The mage said it was the magic of an extensive meteorite fall. Also, the guy added that it was forbidden unless to demonstrate high-level destructive magic. The girl said she was a novice summoner herself, but if the spell was successfully cast, but she was interrupted by the mage Ronian and told that several mountains in the area had disappeared. Little Hayes told the mage that he was so calm, and the mage replied that he was, after all, the best mage in the royal court. Little Hayes was confused by such loud words, and she nervously asked the guy again. The guy started telling me what magic is now. It has 3 main processes. The first is spells. The second is the imagination and focus of the magician needed to realize the spell. No matter how much people try, Their abilities are limited. The last process is translating magic into reality. Without mana, the magician's own abilities are useless. The guy lit the light on his palm again and said, what he was showing the first time was powerful destructive fire magic. The girl asked if that meant mana could run out, to which she received an affirmative answer, which also explained why everyone was learning summoning magic. The minions bring mana from their world and use it, while the monsters use mana from the underworld. The guy said it was like this and added that he had loaded the girl up with such annoying talk the first time they met. But Baby Hayes replied that she was interested and laughed. The girl assumed that when Mr. Streamer uses his power, he represents something. Turns out he's using mana from his world, Little Hayes kept thinking as she looked up at the full moon. The girl asked the mage to look up and asked, what was that up there near the moon? Next, Little Hayes assumed it was a bird because the silhouette of the object was similar to the body of a bird. There was a loud whistle in the sky and the bird flew straight towards the Lord's villa. The unseen bird did not stop in its tracks and continued to fly towards the villa. Suddenly, a powerful beam swept around the Lord's villa in the midst of the full night. Then this beam hit the villa itself, as if starting an explosion there. It was as if the house had been cut in two with a knife, and that strange beam had set everything in its path on fire. Little Hayes and Mage Ronian were distracted from their conversations and immediately looked in the direction of the villa. The villa burst into flames. A massive fire engulfed it, the people inside begging for rescue and screaming about the fire. The gentleman and his niece managed to run out of the burning house and were screaming, not realizing what was happening. On his way away from the center of the fire, the Lord turned around to see what had happened to his domain. What was it? The whole house was quickly filled with fire, and the gentleman was suggesting we run for our lives. Alera said there was no one else here. No one was able to get out of the burning house. The workers, on the other hand, ran out the other side and shouted praise for the behemoths. They were finally free. The master asked if they all burned down. Who was going to work now? And Alera said that Benny is standing somewhere in this house in a laying down position. Benny stood behind Alera in a laying down position and said he was here. And the master asked Jake what caused the explosion. Jake said it was all the monsters. Jake spotted something else dangerous in the sky and warned the Lord about it. It was as if a star was falling from the sky, very fast, beautiful, and the object itself was bright. The star turned around and flew toward Jake, Dominus, and Alera, who were standing. The unidentified object began to pick up more and more speed on its way toward the boys. Star began to descend down towards the company, as if she was being controlled by someone. The gentleman yelled loudly as he looked at the stars flying in his direction. He asked what they were. Maybe monsters. Jake ordered the Lord and Alera to leave while he pulled out his gun and prepared for battle. The man drew his sword from behind his back and prepared to repel the monster's attack. Jake managed to fend off one blow, cutting the unidentified light in two. But there was a much more powerful attack here, an unidentified blue light flying straight towards the guys. Sprocket was not even going to stop, but only on the contrary picked up speed. Jake was scared out of his wits that his techniques weren't working against something like this. The blue light flew next to the three residents of the villa, who flew away from it in the other direction and fell on their backs. Alera tried to ask Jake what it was, but the man said he'd tell her later, but now she should leave. Alera wasn't going to run anywhere. She got to her feet and said that if this kept going on, she would handle it herself. Jake asked the mistress to be careful. After all, it wasn't just a monster. The girl began reciting her spell and waving her arms in different directions. Mrs. Alera's spell was almost finished, and she was finishing the last lines. The girl was able to summon a huge circle of fire where the acolyte should appear. A gray-colored woman descended into the circle from the sky and leisurely entered the magical world. Alera called the acolyte the Lord of Typhoon Calaton Aquaria. Alera asked to be empowered to resist the behemoth. The acolyte looked up with a shriek at the threat to her summoner. The Typhoon Lord swung toward the star, which flew straight into the people who had escaped from the villa. After a short swing, she hit the blue object directly, and it flew off in the other direction. The unidentified object that glowed with a blue light was indeed repelled. Jake praised Alera and said it was just great, and Benny thought the girl was only using that kind of power for her own sake. Alera exhaled a sigh of relief and thought that this was the end, for she would not be able to hold such an imposing acolyte for long. A blue light fell in the forest and abruptly extinguished after the servant girl's strike. But a couple seconds later, the unidentified object seemed to resurrect and glowed blue again. Alera looked at this with great regret. She would still have to hold the powerful acolyte. The girl saw the movement slow down, enough to eliminate the monster. The girl got to her feet again and said she needed to hit the blue ball one more time. Here, out of nowhere, came Little Hayes along with Mage Ronian. They were asking if the lady and master were all right. Alera turned in their direction and realized she had displayed her strongest summoning abilities. Mage Ronian and Little Hayes stood looking at the strong servant with a little surprise. Abruptly, the acolyte disappeared from the sight of everyone around him. Alera called him back. Little Hayes pointed to the place where the Typhoon Lord was and asked if it was Lady Alira's servant, but the girl herself denied it and said there was no servant. Little Hayes was sure she'd seen a powerful acolyte, and Benny hoped the little girl wouldn't be dumb and call on Mr. Streamer. Jake pointed his finger at the rebellious monster and told his mistress that the monster was still here, and Alira suggested that they not kill it, but just leave it alone. Mage Ronian apparently recognized the rogue, and the Lord asked what he knew about him. The boy replied in a trembling voice that it was Kriya's guidebook. Everyone interjected the name of the monster, and in due time the monster stood in place right in the middle of the sky. After a quick stop, Kriya's guide just exploded. Alira started laughing. She asked it was all just a blast and added that no one even cared. The mage began to tell that when the North was attacked by monsters, there were some aristocrats and soldiers who intentionally sold their souls and became monsters. They come to storm important places, traitors who have become huge monsters, the mage continued. The company didn't believe the mage. Alira said they weren't that huge. The master called his bluff, and Jake said they were too small. But Magician Ronian said that it was only a guide, and over there, the real one, a streak of fire appeared in the sky. Everyone standing nearby froze in anticipation of the terrifying beast that would appear in their world. The huge hand was like opening a portal to this world through the heavens, a lost Kriya cameo. A huge creature resembling a pterodactyl burst into their magical world through a fire portal. Clouds began to hide the land from the moonlight, and the fire portal was gone from the sky. A huge bird with tentacles instead of paws was already in this world and was flying directly in the sky, above the heads of the inhabitants. The huge Kriya monster had already spotted its targets and began to descend lower and lower. The monster's body was engulfed in flames. Apparently, it was storing up all its energy to strike. A powerful, bright yellow beam shot out from the huge beast's head and went straight to the ground. A violent bang and explosion followed immediately after the monster shot at the ground where the boys were. Everyone standing nearby flew far behind their backs from the blast wave. The shot was very powerful. Flames engulfed everything around and began to ignite the already powerful fire in the Lord's villa. Near the Lord's villa, it was as if there was no place left at all where the violent flames had not yet visited. The powerful explosion was followed by another one, which was just as devastating as the previous one. All the residents of the villa who managed to escape jumped back from another explosion, and a worried Jake asked Mrs. Alira and the master if they were all right. The master raised his head toward the behemoth and said that if he fired a shot in that direction, there would be great misfortune. Jake pointed to the old man's estate and said it was destroyed, and everyone began to regret their own little haze about the field. Alira about the dresses, and the gentleman about the maids in uniform. The gentleman was sobbing and didn't want to believe it. He yelled that he should have run away when he was still talking. Jake began pulling the saddened gentleman away, and Benny asked Mistress for permission to get up and run. The mistress showed no kindness and told poor Benny to run in that pose. Benny was a little upset but realized that he had no other choice, for he could not cross Alira's words. It was like Benny was ready for this and had practiced his doggy running in a long time because the guy managed to outrun Hayes and Alira who were in front of him. Meanwhile, the monster continued to follow the company, not letting them out of its sight for more than a second. The eye of the terrifying monster was preparing to fire a powerful shot towards the humans again. Little Hayes was a little behind and couldn't keep up with the others on her short legs. The monster's eye was already beginning to hiss. Apparently, it had its sights set on Little Hayes. The girl saw a red dot in the eyeball of the huge monster and became a little wary. It came to Little Hayes that she and the monster had just met gazes. A shot of flame came out of the terrifying beast's eye again, which destroyed the entire manor. The beam from the monster's eye only intensified as it reached its target and grew larger and larger. The shot was very clearly visible in the full night that was now in the magical world. Little Hayes didn't have time to run to her friends, and the beam fell right next to her, who met it with a glare. Alira turned around on the run and asked what was going on, and the mage Ronian was calling the girl to them to be saved. A huge explosion enveloped the spot where the shot had hit the ground. It seemed that nothing could save Little Hayes anymore. The girl screamed with despair and prepared to accept her death, for there was no longer any possibility of escape. Little Hayes's body was enveloped in a huge explosion, and from the outside it was no longer possible to distinguish her from the shadows because of the intense light. The beam from the monster's eyes continued to fill the destruction in that place, and made the explosion more powerful and more powerful. From the outside, the venue looked like a huge dome that was expanding from the beam above. Little Hayes had already accepted the fact that she could now die and burn from the massive explosion. But something kept the girl from dying, as if some force was holding back the strong pressure of the fire dome. The girl's nightgown had already disintegrated and she was wearing only her underwear. But there was no way the flames could catch up with Little Hayes herself. This restraining force was the set of beach lingerie that Jinkyong had given the girl during their last encounter. The girl stood in utter shock. She realized that the guy hadn't lied to her, and those open clothes really did have defensive powers. The girl was left standing in front of the bikini set that had absorbed the entire blast and asking it to burn already, while Jake and Alera asked the babe to move away from there and asked what she was doing. Alera saw that the explosion had been absorbed and asked where the little girl had gotten such an amazing thing, and Hayes herself replied that it was a gift from her servant. Alera was surprised that little Hayes had ever been able to summon someone and questioned if it was definitely from her acolyte. Meanwhile, the weather remained gloomy in Jinkin's apartment, but it was still daytime. The guy was holding a bottle of Bacchus D energy drink. Jinkin himself was sitting in a chair with his eyes closed, holding a bottle of drink in his hand and shaking slightly. Next, Jinkin's mood changed abruptly, and the guy started banging his head against his computer desk in hysterics. The guy wondered to himself what was going on right now. He couldn't even sleep because of this. Dale Jinkin collapsed on the bed with the bottle in his hands and said that he didn't understand anything. He had experienced both happiness and unhappiness. Let Aichan call on him somehow. The guy finally laid his head down on the bed and thought about how he could get the girl to wear a swimsuit, that way failing. Next, tired of his constant thoughts, Jinkin simply fell asleep. He fell asleep very quickly, as if at the snap of his fingers. The moment Jinkin fell asleep in his room, a blue ray appeared in the magical world, signaling the appearance of a servant. Alera was surprised that little Hayes, whom she had always thought hopeless, had succeeded in summoning anyone. The body of the sleeping Jinkin appeared in front of the girls and descended from the heavens at Hayes' call. Alera asked if this guy wasn't a regular person. Benny confirmed that this guy wasn't exactly regular, and Hayes herself felt a little embarrassed. Jake told Alera that they had to decide if they were going to fight or run before the monster saw them. Jake continued, saying that if this monster continued to attack everything indiscriminately, they wouldn't survive. Alera asked the mage Ronin why this beast had come here in the first place, and he replied that Kriya often leaves the north. He has the gift of foresight. If there is a place where there is a real threat to the monsters, he suddenly appears with an assault. Alera repeated her words to the boys about threatening the monsters, hinting that they couldn't be here. Everyone immediately looked at Mrs. Alera herself, hinting that she was the only one who could pose a real threat to them. The guys continued to look at Alera, who had stopped talking already, but interested everyone. The girl further asked why they were spinning, and those back stared in the direction of the huge monster. Alera thought to herself, if she was the real threat, there was no point in running. She would be caught up anyway. Jinkin, meanwhile, just lay there and continued to snooze, and Alera asked Ai to do something with her acolyte. Baby Hayes walked up to Jinkin and quietly woke him up, calling him Mr. Streamer. The guy heard it. The guy stood up and asked what he was doing here and when did Aichan have time to summon him. The guy turned his attention to everyone around him and said they were people he had never seen before. Jinkin asked Ai if these might be her friends, leisurely looking around at each one. Next, the guy's gaze fell on something he was really interested in. His eyes narrowed. In front of Jinkin stood the beautiful Alera, who was lightly dressed and looked straight down on the guy. It was as if the boy was frozen in time. He couldn't take his gaze away from Mrs. Alera. But apparently he was not interested in the mistress herself, but in the huge silhouette that stood at her back. Through the girl's blue hair, you could see the fat gentleman wearing the bikini the guy had given for Hayes. The man was standing directly behind the beautiful Alera, and it was hard to miss him. Jinkin fell out in shock. He was frightened by what he saw and wished he could erase his memory and never come here again. The young man covered his eyes with his hand and turned away just in case. He was yelling that it was a bathing suit, and who was that old man wearing it? The Lord laughed with the reaction of the guy who was yelling about the damage what he had seen had done to his eyes. Hayes turned to a frustrated Jinkin and asked him to protect the Lord, but the guy said it was only for girls and useless on men. The tears of laughter on the gentleman's face disappeared and he became wary. The old man asked to get this monster out of his sight. Alera ordered Jake to grab her uncle and get out of here right away. The man confirmed that he understood. Jake covered the Lord's body and the two ran away from the monster that had destroyed their estate. Little Hayes cried and thought about how her life was over because of her acolyte Mr. Streamer. However, if he can get rid of the monster, the girl immediately turned to Jinkin and told the guy that the gentleman in the swimsuit had already left, and also had a request. Jinkin lay there crying from what he had seen. He would not soon be able to move away, and Hayes continued to call out to him. Little Hayes saw that her acolyte was not responding in any way to the words, and realized that no one was going to help her. Little Hayes fell to her knees in front of Alera and begged forgiveness for her abilities not being enough to kill or contain the monster. Later, Hayes called Miss Alera the best summoner and the mage Ronian took notice. The mage questioned Hayes if Alera was really the best summoner, for that was not what she had told him. Mrs. Alera herself began to twitch and called Ai by name, and the little girl thought she had made another mistake. The mage approached Alera and asked why she did this to him, since hundreds of people were dying because of the monsters at this time. The mage spoke louder and louder, now reminded that he was asking for someone strong to go north and save the world. Alera covered her eyes to avoid looking at the mage, and the mage asked why she pretended like she didn't care. Alera got sick of hearing all this and said that she was indeed the best summoner here. She further asked, "So what?" The surprised mage didn't understand what exactly the girl wanted to say, so he himself interrogated what she meant. Alera replied that if she went north, there would be no one to rule these lands. She would have to live together under the aristocrats and take orders. Then the girl began to humiliate the guy. She said that for such cases, they send people like him. If he was a good mage and more reliably protected the north, then nothing would have happened. People like the guy are talentless and worthless. They can't do anything themselves. But they demand something from her, the girl continued. Next she went after Hayes. Alera reminded her that she had gone to summoner school, and if it wasn't time to return the favor, and if she didn't have the ability, she could at least try. Alera asked why there wasn't at least one savvy person out of everyone here. They're the reason Alera has to drive from something to a dangerous place. Aren't they the ones who have to put their bodies down in the name of it? There were tears on little Hayes' face from all of Alera's words in her direction. She realized there was nothing she could do to help right now. Little Hayes ducked her face into the ground and apologized even louder this time. I continued to hysterically say that she had no talent and lacked ability, and had inconvenienced Mistress. I was sure she spoke carelessly and made a mess, which made her uncomfortable. She apologizes for that. Alera was not moved by the girl's tears and words, and asked her to do something if she was truly sorry. Alera also asked the girl, could she only be capable of repenting in words? Tears were streaming in rivers down little Hayes' face, as she asked for instructions on what exactly to do. Mage Ronian looked with regret at the girl's humiliation in front of Mistress Alera. Even poor Benny, who has been in the recumbent position for a long time, felt sorry for little Hayes. Little Hayes said she was willing to do anything. Anything Mistress Alera ordered her to do. But then a man's voice was heard asking the lying and apologizing little girl what she was doing. In front of the girl was Jinkyong, who was looking down at her, and she interjected what the guy said. Jinkyong said he asked what Aichan was doing right now, hinting that he shouldn't humiliate himself in front of Madam. A crying little Hayes found the strength to look Jinkyong in the eye. She called the guy Mr. Streamer. Jinkyong, immediately after seeing the crying face of his summoner, opened the bottle of energy drink and started drinking it. The guy drank the bottle completely and tossed it away from him, to the stares of the surprised onlookers. Jinkyong asked Mrs. Alera if she was talking about I having no powers. The guy rightly asked if his appeal was the girl's lack of effort. Jinkyong expectedly sided with Hayes and said there's nothing to apologize for. It's just the usual morass. Jinkyong further asked the little girl why she kneels before such a selfish woman who doesn't care about anyone but herself. The guy also chimed in that if he were a summoner like I, he would definitely be proud of his abilities. Jinkyong also condemned Hayes for bowing so rashly to empty-headed people like Alera. The guy looked up into the sky after his little monologue and started shouting as if some kind of power was awakening in him. Jinkyong remained in the same pose, but nothing happened to him. His body was ordinary and no abilities could be seen. Alera and little Hayes began to look questioningly at the distraught guy, but abruptly a blue beam started coming out of the guy and flung his body sideways with the recoil. The guy was running from one side to the other, wondering what was happening to him. He was even scared. It was scary for everyone around him too, who didn't fully understand the full extent of Mr. Streamer's power. The guy summoned a huge tornado with his belch, which grew bigger and bigger. A blue light was visible in the sky, like the guide the boys had seen earlier. Alera and Hayes watched Jinkyong surge upwards and glow with a blue light, not understanding where such power came from. There was also a behemoth in anticipation of a worthy opponent, which was already flying very close. The behemoth disengaged from the humans, and a guy who was flying with a blue light got his attention. The monster shot a huge ball in front of him that almost killed little Hayes and prepared for battle. Opponents rushed towards each other to choose the winner and decide the fate of this world. Finally, the forces clashed. From the outside, it was hard to make out where the monster was and where Jinkyong was because it was a confrontation of blue and yellow light. The point of contact was getting bigger and bigger, like they were going to fight to the death. The huge flying beast was putting more and more effort into defeating the guy, but it was failing. The behemoth seemed to finish preparing its death ray and flew off to the side. The huge beast flew away from Mr. Streamer's strength, not expecting to see such resistance. Mage Ronian stood there and couldn't believe what he was seeing now. He said there was no such thing. A surprised Alera asked in a trembling voice that this was happening right in front of their eyes. The girl asked, could there be such a powerful minion? Meanwhile, Jinkyong was settling into his new role and trying to cope with his new abilities. The guy's face changed drastically. His eyes turned snow-white, and his scream changed to a more intimidating one. The guy was screaming and trying with great effort to get his shot right into the wing of the behemoth. The huge beast was dodging the guy's attacks with all its might and doing so successfully. The huge bird decided to change its direction and flew high up. The huge behemoth had already flown through the clouds to hide from the blows of the strong opponent, but one of Jinkyong's beams still managed to reach the target and hit the bird's stomach. The monster's eye flared with powerful flames, as if she had been preparing this attack for a very long time. The entire force was directed at Jinkyong, who was nearby and unable to dodge the attack. The bird continued to spew powerful flames, hoping to burn Jinkyong, but the monster was having no luck, though he had not given up trying to kill his opponent. Suddenly, it was as if the huge monster had run out of energy to fight, and its attacks were no longer so powerful. The behemoth made the only true decision of fleeing and tried to escape from the spot. The bird's eye lit up again with yellow bright flames, signaling another attack. To great surprise, the bird stopped in place, and its wings were covered with yellow spots. Powerful beams of flame came out of the yellow spots on the monster's body, just like her eye. Counterbalancing the power of the bird were the blue discharges of Jinkyong, who was somewhere close by. The bird saw the blue light getting closer and closer to her. Jinkyong was already near the eye of the bird itself and swung his fist at it. The guy slammed his fist right into the huge monster's pupil, but it didn't have a strong result. The guy threw another powerful punch that made the behemoth get very agitated. The only thing the huge monster's eye could see was the blue color that beat its pupil. The huge monster tried to remove the guy from its eyes with its supportive arms, but the monster didn't have time to do anything, and its main weapon curled back into its body. The huge monster was defeated and flew down, folding its wings. As it flew, the bird's body erupted in the very center where its fiery eye was. The fiery body of the huge monster fell not far from the guys who were watching the fight. The explosion in the mountains was powerful. It could be seen from every point and field in the kingdom. The crushing explosion scattered everything around him, burning trees and fields, all the debris flying around. All the pebbles, dust, and branches were flying around like after a massive earthquake. The trace of the explosion was like a nuclear bomb attack. Apparently, the monster really had a lot of strength and energy. But then, amidst all this chaos, a blue ray appeared in the clouds of the night sky. At the center of this beam was the immobilized body of Jinkyong, who was still able to defeat the terrifying monster. Little Hayes and her friends immediately spotted Mr. Streamer and ran to him. The guy slammed his body into the ground, his body showing no signs of life. Baby Hayes ran up to her rescuer's body in terror and asked him if he was okay. The girl tearfully bent over Jinkyong's body and tried to wake him up. The guy's face gave no sign of life, not a single nerve moved on it. But later the guy's mouth did open and he sighed heavily. Jinkyong yawned and asked Amiri-chan not to cry. He must have forgotten what just happened. The boy continued to sleep, and Little Hayes delightedly called him Mr. Streamer, realizing that he had managed to survive. Someone was heading towards the recumbent Jinkyong and shouted that it was him. It was Hayes' friends, led by the mage who said this guy was the one. Mage Ronian explained in more detail who exactly Jinkyong was. This was the man who had saved their world. Alera didn't really trust the mage's words and said the guy looked too pathetic. Little Hayes kept blowing tears over Jinkyong's body and thought it was him. Mr. Streamer is a little different, a little awkward to show him to others, but he's definitely special, Little Hayes thought. Here the mage Ronian had already fallen to his knees. He was asking Little Hayes for something. The mage begged the girl to go north with them. They needed her incredible strength and abilities. Little Hayes was surprised at such a suggestion, especially since the mage called her Mistress Ai. The girl thought about the suggestion and turned toward the bowing mage. Ai Hayes said it wasn't her at all. She has no talent as a summoner. Mr. Streamer was only summoned by luck. Alera watched in surprise as Little Hayes belittled her abilities and said she couldn't do anything to help. Man Ronian explained that the one who summoned the best acolyte is the best summoner. The mage also added that it would be better to talk when Jinkyong woke up so as not to inconvenience him. Little Hayes looked at Jinkyong's body and realized that he had given her hope. The girl thought long over her answer. She hadn't expected Mr. Streamer to come to her so many times. The girl clenched her hands tighter and with a trembling voice tried to say something. The girl explained to the surprised mage that she was unsure of herself and her powers. Benny was upset. He thought his friend would jump at the chance to get out of slavery. Mage Ronian was also frustrated at not being able to get such a weapon on his team. But then the magician's attention was once again captured by Little Hayes, who decided to add something. But despite all that, Little Hayes is ready to go. Even if she can only help a little, she's still going, the girl said. Alera stood amazed at the fact that Loser Hayes was being called to the mage team so much. Benny exhaled in relief, realizing that Little Hazy wasn't going back to the field again. And the girl herself thanked Mr. Streamer for it all, who had helped her to overcome the obstacle and gain courage. The surprisingly overcast weather outside Jinkyong's house changed to sunny, and the guy thought it was a mere trifle. If Jinkyong was able to fight back the huge monsters, it would be easy to open this door. Jinkyong grabbed the handle and said that he could definitely go outside now. The open door was flooded with strong sunlight that Jinkyong hadn't seen in a long time. The young guy was already standing outside his driveway and couldn't figure out if he liked the feeling or not. The boy's lungs finally felt the fresh air he'd been missing in the room for a long time. Jinkyong saw a janitor cleaning the parking lot and rustling his broom. The guy raised his hand and wondered if he should talk to the janitor, or if this was going to end badly. Jinkyong had very strong doubts about whether to do this. He dismissed the idea. Still, The guy's boldness said that now was the time, and he shouldn't be afraid of anything. Jinkyong said hello to the employee, his voice no longer trembling, and he himself stood confidently. The man turned around and examined the pale boy with a stern look. Jinkyong was startled by the janitor's gaze. For a few seconds he even thought he was recognized. But when the man turned around, instead of his body and face, there was a gentleman in a swimsuit that the guy was giving to Ai. The guy screamed at the top of his throat at what he saw. He didn't even want to imagine another time in his life. Jinkyong woke up on the bed and screamed. After a couple of seconds he realized it was just a dream. It was like the guy was trying to grab onto the ceiling and talk about how it was just a dream, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Here, the startled Jinkyong was approached by Little Hayes, who remarked that the boy had finally come to his senses. Mr. Streamer himself, asking if he had been here the whole time. The girl replied that he was here all the time, didn't he remember? And Jinkyong replied that he didn't seem to remember. The only thing the guy remembered was that he drank an energy drink to stay awake, and after he drank it, he had a burp like a dragon, and he can't remember anything further. Little Hayes started to tell what had happened to him. The guy suddenly glowed with a blue light and got rid of that huge monster in the blink of an eye, and then slept for 2 days in that bed, and indignant Jinkyong asked, how could he sleep for 2 days? Jinkyong concluded that this drink gave strength at the expense of tomorrow. Since that was the case, it would be a bit difficult to use it again. Baby Hayes said it was finally okay and offered to move the guy back to her world. The guy looked out the window that was next to his bed and thought for a bit. The girl interrogated the guy about whether he should be recalled to his world, and Jinkyong asked her to wait. The guy asked if he could go outside, noticing the beautiful weather outside. The door opened, and the sunlight blinded the eyes of Jinkyong, who still dared to go outside at least in this world. The guy was quite surprised by the scenery here. There were no skyscrapers, apartments, or cars. Instead, there were mountains, trees, animals, and pure nature outside that wasn't in his world. A few moments later, the boy was already standing on the edge of the mountain, where he had a great view of all the mountains. Jinkyong looked around and wondered how did he end up here. The beautiful view of the valleys and mountains mesmerized Jinkyong, and he said it was very cool. The local animals that walked in the wild also liked the guy. Jinkyong continued to gaze admiringly at the beautiful view of the local nature. A huge bird flew through the sky that couldn't be compared to those on Earth. The boy turned around at the flight of the bird and told Hayes that it was very large. The girl herself replied that she lived in the village, and it was also the first time she had seen something like this. The guy noticed they were standing on the ship and asked why it was flying through the air in the first place. Here, Jinkyong and Hayes' conversation was interrupted by a guy who explained that this ship was sent by the king, and it was traveling on the power of mana. The mage bowed before Jinkyong and said he was honored to meet him. He also introduced himself as Sorcerer Ronian. Jinkyong said, the guy can't even imagine how happy he is to see the sorcerer. Little Hayes asked Ronian, if this ship is moving on mana power, it won't run out? The guy replied that it was possible, but it wouldn't disappear completely. Mana is like air, it's produced all the time. The guy reminded the girl of the magic he had shown her the first time. There was only a trickle of mana there. The girl assumed that this ship required a lot more mana. The sorcerer confirmed her guess, and added that the ship had a special device. A creation of the alchemists, this device absorbs the mana produced. And while storing it, when the mana runs out, the ship can move on what was collected. Jinkyong said it's a mix of magic and science, and noted that it's very cool. Little Hayes saw something on the ship that managed to interest her very much. There sat modestly a kid who paid no attention to the guy's conversation. This guy was Benny, who for some reason ended up here and was traveling north. Memories begin, as the ruins that remained of the estate resented Benny, who didn't want to go north. Miss Alira said the guy was called. She was asked to give the summoner and the helper. Alira called the guy useless, and he begged not to be sent along with Hayes. The lad claimed he didn't want to go to such a dangerous north for fear of being quickly killed there. Alira told Benny that he was an ordinary commoner, and he had an opportunity to fulfill the request of the king of the country. Alira asked the boy if he would continue as I did to disobey her orders. The boy looked with a surprised look in Alira's direction, wondering what he should do. Benny lifted his foot off the floor. The guy finally got out of the layup in a long time. Benny flips his legs over and says he's had enough. The girl looked indignantly in Benny's direction. The guy went back into the laying down stance, and Alira said she'd send another one then, but Benny said he'd be the one to go. The guy's just sick of it. He can't let go of his freedom that easily. Benny was screaming with fear. He said that would a hopeless caller like I be able to do anything, and the girl herself stood behind his back and said she could hear everything. The guy fell to his knees and said that if his life depended on Little Hayes, he was finished. The clouds began to thicken, and the ship began its journey higher and higher. A shadow hovered over the entire ship, which frightened the guests who were expecting a scary monster. Jinkyong asked in a trembling voice what was that huge thing in the sky. The sorcerer explained that they had arrived. It was the palace of His Majesty the King. The palace was on an island in the sky. Its size was simply enormous compared to the ship. The ship with the new crew members was already parked near King's Island. At the bottom of the island was the same mana recycling and accumulation device as on the ship, only much larger. A huge palace levitated just above an equally large city. The boys left the ship and watched everything admiringly. Jinkyong said it was amazing that there was an entire island in the sky, then looked at the gate and asked what else it was. The sorcerer walked over and began to press a spell next to the gate. The guy saw that it was a local elevator, which was a huge rock. The most amazing thing for the guests was that it all happens right in the air at a great height. The elevator with his friends went up without any help, as if someone was steering it from inside. Benny fell to his knees and said he had lived on the ground all his life and had never seen anything but the ground, and Jinkyong asked him if he was afraid of heights. Baby Hayes looked out at everything around her from the elevator. The view was just beautiful. The little girl decided to ask Ronian why the king was in the sky, and he replied that it was a place to hide from monsters, but there was a war going on. The little girl also said that because the island is in the sky, it takes a lot of mana. Hayes further suggested that it could end at some point. The sorcerer asked Ai to listen carefully to his words he was about to say. No matter how logical and rational the girl's thoughts are, she should not give them free rein, because it may not please people whose position is much higher. Such people don't worry about anyone but themselves, and absolutely don't want to know or think, even if they are to be cautioned, so sometimes the best dialogue is silence, the girl reluctantly agreed. Meanwhile, the team was getting closer and closer to the king's palace. A couple minutes later, the boys were already walking through the king's posh palace. Jinkyong and Hayes looked around and cocked their heads at the ceiling. Everything looked very luxurious. Everyone bowed before the king, and Ronian said he was glad to see him. Jinkyong was the only one who didn't bow his head to the king, but began to consider him. The king replied with a calm aha, and held the drinking glass in his hands. The king turned out to be a dark-skinned guy surrounded by girls. He asked the sorcerer, was he even going anywhere? Jinkyong was struck by this whole situation and the king's appearance. The king looked at the only guy who didn't bow down to him and asked, who is this? Ronian replied that it was not a man but a servant. Illyra's father explained that the man was a servant of the summoner his daughter had sent. Illyra's father thanked the servant for appearing. Benny explained to Hayes that it was Lady Illyra's father, Prince Kalunik. Jinkyong looked around the entire palace and couldn't find words for himself. On one side were the princes who were discussing something among themselves. On the other side is the king with the girls. The guy sighed a little and decided to say something. Jinkyong did not kneel down and called the dark-skinned ruler the king of men. The ruler looked with disbelief in the servant's direction. Prince Kalunicus also had his doubts about the servant Hayes. Jinkyong suddenly started clapping his hands so that it could be heard throughout the entire hall. The guy added to his phrase that the king is an important person, and continued clapping his hands. Jinkyong just stood there and clapped his hands ironically. The lords picked up on the guy's actions and started clapping their hands as well. They thought that Jinkyong had shown respect. One of the girls also started clapping, and the king asked the other what the guy said. The girl said she didn't know, but it seems clapping is a tradition, and he honors the king that way. The king liked the idea and even laughed. Later he reminded them that the boys were going north and said the lords would take care of them. The lords told Prince Kalunicus that his daughter had done a good job. One of the lords said it was the first time he had seen a servant who could talk to people and had a serene appearance. Prince Kalunik said his daughter gave him advance warning to observe the king's savvy. The lords asked if such a ruffian could have one, and added that it would now be even easier to enthrone a new king. The prince said they would. Also, he added that if they raised a new king, he would not forget their endeavors. The protagonist, accompanied by his friends, was leaving the city. The palace was left far behind. Jinkyong told Ai's girlfriend that he felt like something was going wrong. The Benny boy was very agitated and displeased. He did not like that they were not given money or guards at the palace. The boy told his friends that they would not get to the place that way. He suggested buying a tent in the village. Ai said with a smile that she had no money. Benny replied to his girlfriend that he was just a servant. The boy said fearfully that they would be finished off before they reached the north. The girl said that something strange was going on. Benny replied fearfully that there were plots going on behind the king's back, and he suspected nothing. Ai told her friend that he would be executed for such a thing. The girl asked with interest to the streamer, what on earth could he say to that? The protagonist thought about it, and said that he has watched a lot of anime and sees through everything. He said with a smart look to his friends that everything happens like in a hidden camera show. His companions were surprised. Jinkyong told his friends that it's like a show. When the battle for the throne is decided, the nobles conspire, and the king plays dumb so they don't suspect anything. The protagonist noticed an unfamiliar girl in a black cloak approaching them from the side. The stranger approached the people and asked the girl if her name was Ai. Ai excitedly replied to the interlocutor that it was her. The boyfriend of the beanie was very frightened. The protagonist looked closely at the stranger and turned to her. The acolyte sternly asked her interlocutor, has she decided to spend it? The stranger, after a long pause, asked the protagonist, what is he talking about? The protagonist angrily shouted to the stranger that he has seen thousands of idols and waifu. The acolyte angrily explained to the girl that she would not hide under the hood from his gaze. The protagonist shouted to the interlocutor that she was the woman who had been by the king's side. The stranger was surprised. She lifted her hood and looked at the guy in surprise. The girl was frightened and fell to her knees. She decided to introduce herself to the people. The red-headed interlocutor apologized and addressed the acolyte directly. The girl explained that she was only following orders. She asked that people not be angry. The stranger placed a sealed letter and a bag of coins on the ground. The girl explained to the people that these things had been given to them by the king. She prepared to leave. The stranger turned around and disappeared into the distance. The protagonist and I watched the girl. Benny grabbed the pouch and shouted happily to his friends that there was money inside. The girl became excited and interested. She took the letter from her friend's hands. They and their friends began to read the message with great attention. The king wrote to his interlocutors not to agree to cooperate with the aristocrats and other factions. Benny got worried. He asked his friends with interest, what should they do then? The interlocutors looked at the protagonist with great attention. They were waiting for his advice. Jinkyong said with a smile to his friends that the king is that type. He added that he would not tell his interlocutors any spoilers. The king in the palace was very surprised. The guest told him that the protagonist had figured her out right away. The girl kneeling told the king that the boy understood everything. The ruler was surprised. A subordinate overheard Jinkyong's words. She revealed that the protagonist knows about the plot against the king. The ruler was surprised. He said thoughtfully, which the protagonist is not as simple as he looks. The Ronian sorcerer appeared. He told the king that he was still surprised. The wizard told the ruler that the acolyte had been in their world for several days. Ronian informed the surprised king that no one could stand against the acolyte. The guy was able to defeat the path-lost Kriya with his power. The king hesitated, and with surprise told the girl that he had had enough of this. The ruler angrily shouted to some greedy old men that they'd have another bite. The protagonist and his friends were riding in a wagon. Jinkyong told his interlocutors that the total was somehow too small for the main quest. Ie looked at her friend and could not understand him in any way. Benny suggested that the friends just watch and gather rumors. The guy smiled and said they could save money, time, and lives. The main character liked such an offer. Benny told his friends that they had better look around. He suggested that they move secretly. Benny asked with interest to her girlfriend if she had noticed the Ronian wizard's bandages. The boy said excitedly that in the north the body can catch a disease. Jinkyong at this time talked to Ai-chan's girlfriend. The wagoner brought his friends to the town and said they were there. The people thanked him. The protagonist, along with his companions, arrived at a small tavern for a bite to eat. The protagonist, sitting at a table, looked around the tavern with interest. He said that he had always dreamed of hanging out in such a village. At that time, the waitress brought food. The acolyte was surprised to notice that Benny's boyfriend was sitting on the floor. He motioned for him to sit on a chair. The main character asked his friend, "Does he always sit on the floor by the table?" Benny was eating his food very quickly. He said that he usually stood on all fours on the floor. Jinkyong said with surprise that in this world, lower-class people are like animals. I replied that this situation is only with Benny. The girl took out a map and laid it on the table. She decided to show the route the Ronian had spoken of. I showed on the map that a village that was neighboring the Araisu had been burned. She added that nearby northern villages had also been attacked. The girl pointed to the map and said that it was unknown what state the port city to the northwest was in. I told the interlocutor that all land routes to the north are blocked. They need to take a ship to get there. The protagonist asked her where they were now. AI showed their location. She added that it would take them a couple of days to get there by wagon. Benny asked fearfully, "Will there be any sailor who will agree to take them north?" The girl reminded him that by the king's orders they would not cooperate with anyone. Jinkyong asked his friends if the road to the port would be very dangerous. He added that he would like to stay with his girlfriend and boyfriend until the end. The protagonist said he had some business at home and needed to prepare something. AI thanked her friend and asked, "Do we need to move him?" Jinkyong took the packet of food in his hands and told the girl to call out to him in case of danger. The AI girl activated the teleportation mechanism. The protagonist was sent to his world. I sat at the table with Benny. They watched in surprise as their friend disappeared in a bluish glow. The people in the tavern were surprised. Someone asked the girl if she was a summoner. The waitress asked the travelers if they were summoners. Benny replied to the interlocutor that they had an important mission in the north. The guy asked the woman if there was a store nearby where he could buy things for traveling. The waitress advised the guests to walk further down the street. The people in the tavern were surprised. They looked at the travelers warily and talked among themselves. The guy was walking down the street with his girlfriend. Benny said relieved that the monsters were staying away. I replied to her friend that their army was stuck on the border. The guy told his girlfriend that they have a well-trained army with good weapons. I told her interlocutor that she would buy food at the commissary. She added that Benny should go and buy at the haberdashery everything she needed for a rest stop. The girl headed towards the food store, which had a big line outside. I approached the counter where the seller was sitting. There were many people crowded around. The girl was trying to make her way through the crowd. She was apologizing to the people around her. I was trying to squeeze through the people standing around her. She had a little more to go. The girl reached the counter and asked the clerk to give her a little of everything. The customer asked the salesperson how much she had to pay. She started looking for her money bag. The girl looked around excitedly and realized she didn't have a bag of money. I got worried. She realized that she had approached the counter for nothing. She had nothing to pay with. The girl angrily and excitedly shouted to the people to wait. I wanted to justify herself and say that she had just forgotten the money. The people around her didn't pay attention to her. It began to get even darker over the city. Blue clouds covered the sky. It was late evening over the city. The girl decided to go back to her friend Benny. Benny was sitting in the late afternoon with his girlfriend by the river by the fire. A guy was sitting on Earth. He told his sad girlfriend that people are really overreacting. Benny told the girl that people like her are sent on important missions. I was surprised at such a word. A guy told his girlfriend it would be her fault if their country went bankrupt, at which time the protagonist teleported back to his home. Jinkyong flew straight to his desk after his long journey. The protagonist shouted to himself joyfully that he was home. The journey was like a VR game for him. Suddenly, there was a very heavy knock on the door. Someone demanded that the guy open the door. The knock on the door grew more insistent. Someone's voice demanded that the boy open the door. The hero fearfully walked to the door and clicked the latch to open it. Suddenly, the door opened abruptly and knocked the guy off his feet. He fell to the floor. From a violent blow from the door, the guy flew aside and knocked a chair over. The main character was very frightened. He turned his head and looked to see who had broken in. The kid's father came into the room. He looked at his son with hatred. The man angrily asked the frightened servant what the man was doing. The father once again asked his son very angrily, what was he doing? He looked at him with hatred. Jinkyong was lying on the floor. His irritated father stood in the doorway. Night has fallen over the city. The protagonist finds himself alone in a room with his father. A little coming to his senses, the protagonist asked his father, what does he want? The man calmed down a bit. He told the guy he'd been sitting in his bedroom all day with the door closed. The mother came in the back. The father told his son that he should go out and have a proper meal. The man shouted to the boy that his mother often came by, calling for him and banging on the door. The wife restrained her husband. The father angrily asked his son what he was doing. The woman told the frightened father of the family that she would talk to her son herself. The man turned around and angrily walked out of his son's room. The mother remained there. The father decided not to stay in the house. He went out the front door into the street. A man was sitting alone in the street. He was smoking on a bench and thinking about his son. The father was angry. He couldn't understand why they had such a stupid son. The mother decided to talk to her son herself. She called him by the name of Jinkyong. The woman told the guy that she was very worried, she added, that he hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. The mother told her son that she and his father couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. A woman told a guy she didn't know what to do. Suddenly she noticed something. A mother saw her son's groceries on the table. There was a loaf of bread. The woman was amazed. She couldn't understand where such food had come from in the room. The mother was thinking and remembered that she hadn't bought bread for her son. After a long pause, the protagonist told his mother that he was worried too. Jinkyong told the woman sadly that he too had very important things to do. The protagonist told his astonished mother not to worry about him. The woman looked at her son with surprise and excitement. She studied him carefully. After a long pause, the mother replied to her son that she agreed with him. She decided to leave the room. The protagonist's father was sitting outside at the time. He kept smoking to calm himself down. The man sat by himself. He wanted to be alone. He was worried about his son. The kid's mom was sitting alone in the audience. She was worried sick about him. The woman leaned over and cried quietly to herself. She didn't understand what was going on with the guy. The protagonist was alone with himself in a room. He was remembering his adventures in the game world. Jinkyong looked closely and noticed his leg. There was a small cut. The guy thought to himself that he had survived the battle with the monsters, but was now hurt from his door. Later that evening, the protagonist decided to himself that he would definitely return to the game world. The Benny guy looked up into the blue sky and shouted that they were in a hopeless situation. Benny told his girlfriend sadly that they had been on the road for 3 days. He added that he was so hungry that he was ready for the earth to eat. The guy was sitting on the bank of the river and said he liked the scenery. He reminded his girlfriend that they had to get to the village in a couple days. I tearfully replied to her friend that they could get there if they were on a wagon. Benny jumped up and shouted cheerfully to the girl that they had to run like horses. The guy cheerfully told the girl that he didn't run like a horse. That's why they're not in the village yet. The girlfriend angrily told the guy that he couldn't catch a single fish. Benny said with a smile to her interlocutor that there were no fish. AI grabbed the fishing rod and threw it. She asked angrily to the guy, who told him there were no fish. The girl started casting her fishing rod to catch food for herself and her friend. I got lucky very quickly. With the help of a fishing rod, she was able to master the huge fish in the river. Benny grabbed the fish. He happily told his girlfriend that she had a great talent as a fisherman, and not as a summoner. Ai shouted grudgingly that she could only grow greens and fish. The girl cut up the fish and put it on a stick to cook over the fire. Benny told his girlfriend to catch more fish. The girl replied that she was a summoning mage, not a fish mage. The guy asked his girlfriend, "When will the fish be ready?" The girl told her friend to wait. The girlfriend explained to the hungry guy that they had just caught a fish. Suddenly, there was a very loud noise. I asked, "What's going on?" The guy said fearfully, "The earth is shaking." The boy and the girl were alert. They heard a huge noise that grew louder and louder. People were getting more and more scared. They saw someone running towards them from far away. Benny and her friend decided to run away. They saw a huge mutant rhinoceros rushing towards them. The people ran away frightened. A huge animal was rushing past them. The rhinoceros galloped past. The surprised girl asked, "What just happened?" I looked after the huge beast that ran by and said it was a monster. Benny came to his senses from fright and decided to look at the fire where their food was cooking. Benny saw that after the monster ran, the bonfire place was completely destroyed. The boy ran with all his might towards the place where the fire had just been. The girl called out to him fearfully. Benny lay on the earth looking for signs of the fish they had just cooked. The lad looked over and saw a nearly cooked fish lying on the ground very close by. Benny was very happy. He thought he could eat fish after all. Suddenly, someone came up and stepped a foot on the almost cooked fish. The guy got really scared and worried. He realized he was without food. A woman dressed in red approached. She was surrounded by armed warriors. The stranger turned around and looked away. She was surprised by strangers in a place like this. The woman told the guy and girl that it was dangerous to develop a camp in such a place. Ai smiled and decided to justify herself. She told her interlocutor that they were just having a halt here. A huge man asked the people if they were going to the port city. He added that it would take all day to go there. The woman added that the travelers had just camped here. After that, the stranger told the girl that they had to get out of here. At night, monsters come to this place to drink water. I wanted to say something to her interlocutor. At this time, a warrior called out to the Aiku woman and said that monster had been ambushed. The warrior shouted they were almost in position. Aika told her subordinate to all wait for the command. The woman shouted cheerfully to the warriors that they needed to deal with their problem. The girl watched in great surprise as the warriors gathered and stepped aside. Ai said with a smile to her friend that they could go and watch too. The guy at this time, kneeling, holding the remains of his fish in his hands. Benny held the rest of the fish in his hands and didn't notice what was going on around him. The guy told the fish that he met her by fate. Ai told his friend that they would catch fish later. There was a huge mutant rhinoceros running around. A group of people were chasing it. The monster was running at a tremendous speed. The ground shook and there was a great noise from its running. The warrior asked the Aiki woman who stood on the hill, "Is she ready?" The woman took out her bow and laid an arrow in it. She said cheerfully that she was ready. Aika took aim with her bow and prepared to shoot. She said she could do it herself. The huntress sent an arrow from her bow in the direction of the running monster with an apt shot. After a very accurate shot, the arrow flew straight at the beast. The woman didn't miss. The arrow went straight into the eye of a huge beast. The animal's vision was severely impaired. The huge monster stumbled at high speed and he could no longer see well in front of him. The mutant rhino was running towards the slide. He didn't see it in time. The huge monster stumbled and flew somersaulting over the mountain where the huntress was already standing. The woman prepared to kill the dangerous animal. She drew her dagger. A yellow laser beam emerged from the woman's dagger. She used it to kill the animal. After a laser sword attack, the monster was chopped in two. The guy and the girl sat back and watched in amazement at what was going on. The body parts of the already shredded huge monster were rolling on the ground by inertia. The boy was very much surprised. He asked excitedly to his girlfriend Ai what had just happened. Benny asked the girlfriend if it was just magic. I replied to the interlocutor that she didn't know. At this time, the huntress struggled to get up from the ground. She was still holding her weapon. Aika was a little hurt after the hunt. She stood with her hand on her head. Benny and his girlfriend walked to the hunter's camp for dinner in the evening. The girl thanked her new friends for inviting her to their camp. Benny was munching away at the food near the fire with great appetite. Aika told her interlocutor that they should stay as close to each other as possible for protection. The boy asked with interest to the woman, "Shouldn't the army protect the people in their country?" The man said with a smile that the boy knew nothing about this world. He added that Beanie was talking about the north. The warrior pointed to the strolling musicians near the fire. He added that they had been here since yesterday. The man also said that there were traders nearby. They were busy fixing their cart. The warrior told his friends that people often pass through this place, and it is impossible for everyone to attach a soldier for protection. For this reason, the hunters are here. The hunter looked questioningly at the Aiku and asked if he had said everything. The woman angrily tapped her coworker and told him to cut the bullshit. Benny excitedly told his girlfriend that the hunters looked very strong. The boy suggested that the girl take some volunteers with her from their new acquaintances. I reminded the woman that she had used magic when she fought the monster. Ika pulled out Clinic and said that she used this sword. AI asked her interlocutor if this sword absorbs Manu into itself. The woman was very surprised that the girl knew so much about grappling magic. I replied calmly that such things work on Manu. Ikara told that she holds a magic sword that uses Manu from her sheath. The huntress said that mana was in short supply right now, and many mages were left idle. The hunter said judiciously, the Ika using the old sword to capture monsters. I turned to her friend and they looked at each other. They didn't know which one of them would talk to their new friends. Benny showed his girlfriend to start a conversation with the hunters. AI stood up and asked the hunters if they could accompany them on their expedition. The warrior and the woman were silent. They were thinking in detail about the suggestions they had heard from the girl. After a long pause, the man told his companions that they could only help them for a day. I tells them they have orders from an important man to go north. They will need the help of a strong fighter. The man told the guy and the girl to run their own errands. Benny laughed when he heard that the girl was denied help. I got really angry. The girl reached into her inside pocket to pull out a letter to show the hunters. The man and woman sat and watched the girl's actions intently. I showed the letter and told the hunters to help them in the name of the king of Korea. The musicians nearby were very much taken aback when they heard the girl's words. Traders standing near heard the AI telling the hunters to report northward. The girl held the document in her hands and told her interlocutors that everything is stated in it. The woman was very surprised. She even moved from her seat and looked at the letter intently. Ika stared intently and couldn't believe she was seeing the king's decree in front of her. The woman thought and decided that she and the hunter would have to help the guy and the girl. The protagonist was at home at the time. It was dark outside and he was in his room. Jinkyong told himself judiciously that a person is like a room. The whole of human life is spent in proximity to other rooms. The door should open even if there's an accident. The room has nothing to do with what happens inside. The main character told himself that his whole world was contained in a room. He lived under a small piece of blanket. The acolyte looked at his door. He considered his room to be his oasis. The guy thought to himself that he had started the revolution from his bed and got up from it. Then suddenly the protagonist heard some noise from the side and noticed a bright glow. Jinkyong looked away and looked sideways at his table with great attention. The boy saw his red talisman lying on the surface of the table. The protagonist thought to himself that the talisman was activated because of his mood. It was a dark night over the country. The moon was huge. The girl I, along with Benny, went into the forest with the hunters. The girl was suddenly connected to her new acquaintances. They wanted information from her. Aye was tied to a pole. She was sobbing pitifully and staring at herself. The girl asked the hunters in a resentful voice why they had done this to her. Ika walked over to her captive and yanked her hair to the side with all her might. Ika looked at the girl carefully. Beside her, Benny's boyfriend was tied to a pole. The woman asked the captive sternly, "What is the reason she and her boyfriend are going north together?" The guy was really scared. He was shaking and looking at his girlfriend with great excitement. The girl replied in a tearful voice to the woman that they were going for a very urgent reason. Ika was very angry. She hit the girl on the head with her hand. Girl's blood splattered on the ground from the hard blow to her face. Ika told the warrior that the boys were proving to be tough nuts. The man suggested asking the beanie. The boy told the warrior fearfully that he didn't know anything at all. He added that he had been walking on all fours all his life and couldn't know anything. The warrior walked over and looked very carefully at the guy's hands tied behind him. The man said thoughtfully to the guy that he had very large calluses on his hands. Benny was very frightened. He was trembling with fear and could hardly contain his screams. Ika said menacingly to her captives that if the king had given them orders, they were not simpletons at all. Woman said judiciously, "Every dog knows what a scoundrel the king of this country is." Ika said thoughtfully that the king had no business being in the north at all. The girl thought about it and decided to answer something, but she couldn't find the words. AI was very frightened. She did not know what to do or what to say in response to the woman. The girl thought back to her ruler and couldn't quite figure out exactly what kind of person their king was. She remembered the letter and the money she had received from the king. The girl pondered and couldn't figure out who but the king could truly care about this country. I was frightened. She didn't understand why the king had sent her alone on such an important matter. The girl thought sorrowfully to herself that she had no confidence in anything now. The woman drew her blade. She told her captives that she knew her kind well, for she herself had returned from the north. Woman put a knife to the girl's throat and shouted that she needed to deliver important documents from the north to the king. Ika showed her interlocutor the document. She told her that the king's army had come to kill them. When the huntress woke up, all her co-workers were dead. There were bodies all around. After a brutal massacre, a woman lost her left eye. She was barely saved afterward. Aika sat exhausted in the hut and listened to the singing of strolling musicians as the darkness thickened. A woman listened to the songs and they made an impression on her. She decided to make an important decision. Aika decided to burn the letter from the king at the stake and start a new life for herself. For the huntress, her lost left eye showed her things she hadn't seen before. Aika activated the fire in her hand. She yelled to her captive that she would hurt her more today. The girl was very frightened. She couldn't get away. At that time, a noise was suddenly heard from behind. Small wisps of fire began to fall from the sky. Aika and the warrior were still standing in front of the prisoners. More and more fireballs fell from the night sky. The woman was distracted. One of them came running up to Aika, frightened, and said that there was trouble. A fighter shouted fearfully to the woman that some monster was coming toward their camp. Aika calmly commanded her subordinate to waste no time and ready his weapon. The terrified hunter shouted to the woman that they were being attacked by a completely different monster. Aika was startled and amazed. She heard a very loud noise coming closer. The bound girl was also very much frightened. She heard someone very huge approaching them. The outline of an enormous, gigantic monster appeared. It blocked out even the light of the moon. The monster stood and slowly looked down at the people. Its size reached all the way to the sky. The huge giant was scrutinizing the surroundings from below with a burning gaze. Dark swirls appeared around the huge beast. The people below were very frightened. The frightened warrior asked the woman what it was in front of them. The man asked apprehensively to his companion, had she ever seen such a huge beast before? Aika calmed down. She replied to her colleague that she had seen a similar beast in the north before. The woman looked closely at the giant and said that it could cleave the sky with a blow. The Aika told the hunter that they could see the king of obstacles in front of them now. I heard the woman say that the monster in front of them was the owner of the entangled Kriya. The woman trembled. She asked with interest, "Why is this huge monster here now?" At which time the AI girl screamed and demanded that the kidnappers let her go. Aika looked at her captive with great surprise and displeasure. Coming to her senses, the woman asked the girl grudgingly, "What does she want?" I angrily demanded of the hunters that they untie her as soon as possible. She explained that her companions would not be able to stand up to the beast on their own. The girl shouted confidently that she was able to get rid of the Kriya and therefore could handle this monster. The woman hesitated and had absolutely no intention of letting her captive go. The main character was sitting in his house at the time, looking intently at the anime figure. Jinkyong looked at the figure and told her excitedly that he could do 5 licks at once. The protagonist opened his mouth and shouted loudly, "He starts!" He looked at the figure carefully. The guy noticed that his miniature anime girl was looking at him intently as well. Jinkyong looked at the anime girl and noticed something start to glow on his desk. The magical red amulet glowed with a bright light that spread around. Then the protagonist teleported to his friends in the game world. Aika angrily and incredulously asked the girl, was she really able to get rid of the errant Kriya? The bound girl answered the woman with consternation that her words were entirely true. Bainey intervened in the conversation. He wanted to add something else for the huntress, whereupon the woman angrily seized her terrified captive with her hand over her face. Aika slammed the girl's head against the pole with all her might. I nearly lost consciousness. I screamed loudly from the powerful blow. The woman looked at her very angrily. Aika asked angrily to the captive, how could a great person like her stand tied up? The guy was scared. He decided he'd rather keep quiet and not incur his wrath. The woman looked angrily at her captive and asked, is the woman mocking her? Aika held the girl's hand over her face and said she wouldn't let her go. Aika said that the girl saw the monster and decided for herself to think of a chance to escape. I told the woman in a crying voice that she didn't mean it at all. A warrior came up. He told the woman that there were people in the village next to them. The man explained that their families and friends mostly lived nearby. The warrior told the captives that they knew nothing about them. The hunters around them stood and listened intently. The man told the AI girl that this was very important to them. The warrior looked at the captive and said he didn't think there was any use in telling them that. The girl was very frightened. She couldn't say anything back to the man. The warrior told Ike that they had no time to waste. He added that they needed to catch the monster now sooner rather than later. The tethered boy rejoiced. He realized that their kidnappers were busy and could let them go. The warrior told the woman to cut the captives' throats as soon as possible and they would go. Aika shouted to the man to wait. She grabbed the girl's face with her hand. The kidnapper took a close look at the victim and said she might give her a chance. The woman said that if she came back alive after the battle with the monster, the girl would die. Aika explained that if the monster was victorious, I would move on. The woman looked at the bound prisoner and asked, does she agree with her proposal? Aika said she couldn't just leave. She added that she would leave a gift for the girl. The huntress said angrily to her interlocutor that she would not be able to see her gift. The woman pulled out her blade and said she would stab the girl in her eye. Benny's boyfriend got really freaked out after he saw his girlfriend's eye taken out. The guy was scared. He realized that the kidnappers could also take out his healthy eye. The woman angrily told her captive that she was taking away her sighted eye. I screamed very loudly. Her scream went far around the neighborhood. The girl's cry was especially audible because the valley was completely silent. Benny called out to his girlfriend apprehensively. He couldn't take his eyes off her. From the violent shock, the girl's body was cowardly, though she was tied to a pole. The badly wounded girl continued to scream hysterically and loudly. Blood was running down her face. On the ground near the girl was a huge pool of blood from her head wound. Aika left with the hunters. She said the girl was a pretender who thought she had gotten rid of the Kriya. The hunters left. Benny and his girlfriend were left alone in the valley tied to poles. The guy looked fearfully and pitifully at his very injured girlfriend. She was still screaming. Benny looked at his girlfriend fearfully with excitement. He realized that he needed to help her. The guy decided to try to free himself. Still tied up, he managed to get his shoes off his feet. Benny was able to take off his shoes. Now barefoot, he decided to try to climb the pole. The guy started to climb up the pole, kicking away at it with his bare feet. Benny felt that it was very hard for him. He did not give up and continued to climb up the pole with the help of his legs. The guy was straining as hard as he could. He realized he could completely free himself. Benny was able to successfully climb up the pole and free himself completely. He removed the rope from his hands. The guy helped free his girlfriend. He told her fearfully that she was very hurt. The girl had a lot of blood on her face. Benny asked fearfully to her girlfriend if she could move. The guy looked at his girlfriend with tears. He was very sorry that AI had lost an eye. Benny sat beside the girl under the night sky. He suggested that she end it all soon. I was still sobbing fearfully. Guy said sadly it was clear from the beginning that they wouldn't make it. Benny said sadly, they can't even stand up to ordinary people. If they met brigands, those would have killed them long ago. The guy said they couldn't complete the mission. He offered the companion to cross over and secretly live in another country. Benny said cheerfully that he and the girl could tell everyone that they had lost their memories because of the monsters. People will think they died in the north. After a long pause, the girl decided to turn to her friend. Benny looked at her anxiously. I turned to her friend in a trembling voice and wanted to remind him of something. The girl told her friend that she had told him before that the wild beast was intended to be raised as livestock. I told a very surprised friend that the wild beast dreamed of freedom. I said in a crying voice that there was a price to pay for freedom. She clutched her face with her hand. The girl told her interlocutor that she must be prepared to repay the price of her freedom. Benny told her scared girlfriend that she wasn't ready, and that's why they had to drop everything. The girl told her friend in a crying voice that she wasn't ready yet. The guy looked at his girlfriend with great pity and sadness. AI sadly said that her friend Mr. Streamer should have been called to Earth by a good summoner. The girl tearfully said that she was a powerless summoner and could do nothing. The guy looked at his girlfriend with worry and pity. He didn't know how to comfort her. Benny got up and told his girlfriend that she needed to treat her wound. He added that he would try to do something himself. I explained to her friend that the monster was here because she had gotten rid of the Kriya. I said fearfully to her friend that dear people could die because of her actions. The girl started to activate her magic skill. She said that if she didn't know what she was doing, she couldn't do anything in the north. I decided to call on the protagonist for help. Benny was standing next to her. The girl decided to summon Mr. Streamer from the mortal world. A bright glow appeared in the sky. A bright light came out of the sky. The whole place was covered with huge clouds. The girl and her friend took cover so the bright light wouldn't blind them. Benny looked in front of him and saw the silhouette of the main character begin to appear in front of him. The guy noticed Jinkyong standing next to his toy girl and wanted to lick her. The protagonist didn't notice his girl had become human. He was still licking her. Benny looked at the streamer with great surprise and didn't understand what he was doing. The protagonist at this point still thought he was licking a toy figurine. Benny stood and looked at the streamer in surprise. He didn't understand why on earth the main character licked the girl. Jinkyong pulled away and looked carefully in front of him. He was very much surprised. After which the girl in the red swimsuit threw the streamer far away from her. The protagonist flew aside and the animated figure of the girl remained standing still. The girl loudly and angrily yelled at the guy that he was a pervert and told him not to lick her anymore. Jinkyong realized with surprise that he was seeing his revived figure named Amiri-chan in front of him. The guy shouted scared at the girl that she had misunderstood him. The girlfriend was very angry. Amiri shouted angrily to her interlocutor that she reeked of his saliva. Benny looked on in amazement at everything that was happening. The girl turned around and prepared to leave. Jinkyong yelled for Amiri to stay with him. The protagonist reached out a hand to try and stop his animated figure. A surprised and chagrined streamer watched his girlfriend run away and hide in the distance. The guy on his knees called out loudly to his fleeing girlfriend, Amiri-chan. Jinkyong felt very broken. He kneeled down and thought about his girlfriend. The protagonist said to himself sad that he had a chance and didn't have time to feel. The lad thought he would be very imprudent. He told his friends that he was finished and to go on without him. Benny ran up to the protagonist. He greeted him and introduced himself. Jinkyong asked excitedly to Benny, what happened to the girl A-chan? The main character asked his girlfriend what happened to her. Benny sadly said that I had a bad wound and gouged out her eye with a knife. The girl sadly told the streamer she was fine. She added that there was a monster nearby. Jinkyong frightenedly grabbed his girlfriend. He yelled that he should have called out to him in times of danger. AI apologized to the streamer. She said she was only bringing inconvenience. The girl said sadly to her interlocutor that he had an important job to do. Streamer told her girlfriend excitedly that there was nothing more important than the fact that she was hurt. AI was surprised. The main character told her she'd never bothered him yet. The protagonist sat on his lap and looked at his crying girlfriend. I felt very guilty. She sat there and kept crying. The girl apologized to the streamer in a crying voice. The main character and Benny were surprised. Jinkyong remembered fearfully that the girl had completely lost an eye. The main character decided to help his girlfriend. He ripped off a band-aid he had on his leg. Streamer told his girlfriend that his band-aid might help her. The girl and the Benny looked at their friend in surprise. The protagonist commanded his companion to sit still. He held out his hand with a band-aid. The girl was really scared. She didn't know what Streamer wanted to do for her. Jinkyong continued to bring her hand with the band-aid to the girl's face. A blue glow appeared around her. I looked on fearfully and saw the streamer's hand with the band-aid gradually coming closer to her face. The girl was very frightened. She even wanted to break free and run away. The main character yelled to the guy to hold his girlfriend. Benny grabbed the girl's hands. Jinkyong put a band-aid on the girl's face and she began to heal. A blue glow appeared around the girl. The band-aid began to heal her wound. Benny leaned over to his girlfriend and said with surprise that the wound was beginning to heal. Streamer said in an important voice that the chaos of healing and destruction is what destiny is all about. AI was surprised to realize that she was completely cured. She had a whole new feeling. The girl sat next to her friends and felt overwhelmed with hatred. A huge monster marched around destroying everything in its path. All that was left behind was a burnt earth. The beast wreaked great destruction. Nothing was left whole when it came. The huge monster was walking on the ground and no one could stop him. After the monster passed through, it left behind a destroyed and mangled earth. A group of hunters decided to try to hit the monster. They gathered on a hill in a group. The people looked at the beast with excitement and fear. They did not know what to do. A huge monster was walking on the ground. A village of people appeared in his path. The warrior asked apprehensively, where could such a monster go? He decided to attack it with his spear. The soldier shouted to his colleague not to think about anything, but just attacked. The hunter launched a spear. It did not harm the monster and fell into the ground. The warriors were running around looking for a fallen spear in the grass. At this time, Aika and her companion approached them. The man asked the woman what they should do now. He invited the Aika to come closer. The huntress said their fighters have useless weapons. They can't do anything to the monster with their blades. The woman turned around and angrily commanded her subordinates to shut up. Aika told 2 warriors to report everything that had happened to the nearest village. She ordered the others to take the people out of the village to a safe place. The woman told the warrior that he would be in command here. She added that the crowd could not be trusted. The warrior was surprised. He questioned the woman. Was she really going up against the monster alone? Aika told her companion slyly that she was able to return alive even from the north. The woman resolutely threw aside her red cloak and walked forward. She shouted to the warriors to worry about their lives. The man looked worriedly at his coworker's face. He called out to Aika by name. In farewell, the huntress shouted to her subordinates to hurry up. The warrior stood looking after the departed woman with a very long and anxious gaze. The man looked at the huntress and didn't understand why she always acted like that. The warrior looked at the knife in Aiki's hand and realized that she always carried the most difficult burden. The man grudgingly thought to himself that he wouldn't leave his girlfriend the way her co-workers did. The warrior thought to himself that he would live, and the huntress would stay alive as well. Aika walked alone under a bright, starry sky. She held a blade in her hand. The woman told herself that if she had known this would happen, she wouldn't have used the sword during the day. The huntress swung her blade. She didn't know how much mana had time to regenerate in it. The woman looked at her knife. She needed quite a bit of mana. Aika raised her weapon up and launched a fire beam far into the sky. The huntress shouted very loudly and menacingly. She decided to try to attack the beast. Aika swung around and launched her fire beam in the direction of the striding monster. A wave of fire went in the direction from the huntress to the monster. He was heading towards her. The fire spell launched didn't damage the monster in any way. It just grazed its leg. The fire vortex launched by the huntress flew past the monster and dissolved into the distance. The woman was very much frightened and annoyed. She realized that her spell was useless. The huntress looked at the monster and became very worried. She saw that the monster had stopped. The giant stopped and began to look around carefully for people. The monster wrapped its huge head around and looked at the woman intently. Aika looked up and shouted to the king of barriers to look at her. The huntress shouted to the monster that there were many who had challenged him once. The monster always prevailed. The woman stood and prepared herself to fight against the huge giant. Aika shouted with confidence in her voice that things were about to absolutely change. The woman accelerated with her burning blade and prepared to attack the monster. The huntress swung wide and launched the fire stream upwards. The woman activated mana from her magical weapon against the monster. The huntress looked at the standing giant and realized she needed more time. Aika thought and realized fearfully that there was nothing more she could do. The monster swung his huge sword to strike the woman on earth. The protagonist suddenly came running up from behind. He asked the surprised huntress if the beast was here. Aika stared in surprise at the streamer who had come to her aid. The protagonist was surprised to see the huntress beside him. He was attracted to her appearance. The lad looked at the stranger and marveled at her belligerence and appearance. The woman also looked at the young man, who was incomprehensible to her with astonishment. Jinkyong looked at the woman and realized he liked this game character. The overjoyed protagonist told the woman that she looked awesome to him. Streamer stood and looked happily at the girl. In front of him at this time a huge monster kept approaching them. A bright red explosion sounded in the distance behind the mountain. The monster prepared to attack the humans. The monster swung his sword and sent a huge blue lightning bolt over the ground. A bright blue lightning bolt traveled across the ground, demolishing and destroying everything in its path. The huntress was recovering from a strong attack from the giant. There was a lot of dust and smoke around. The woman came to her senses. She began to look around to see where the main character had gone. The huntress looked around carefully and realized that the streamer was gone. The woman grudgingly thought to herself that the protagonist was a fool. She looked up. The huntress saw the guy high in the sky. He was thrown there by the impact. The protagonist was soaring high in the sky. He looked around in wonder. The streamer reached its maximum altitude and began to slowly descend. The protagonist began to fall from a great height, leaving a trail of smoke behind him. Jinkyong fell from a great height to the ground with a deafening sound. The woman was very amazed. Aika was very amazed. She didn't understand what the main character was doing. The huntress looked at the guy's body lying on the earth. She realized that he had decided to protect everyone. Jinkyong was lying on the ground. The woman figured streamer had taken the hit. At that time, Benny and his girlfriend appeared in the distance. They ran towards the protagonist. The AI girl ran to help the streamer. She didn't notice the huntress standing nearby. The woman was very much amazed when she saw the girl free and fully healthy with an eye. The huntress asked the girl in surprise, "What on earth is she doing here?" I was also surprised to see Aika in front of her. The girl angrily shouted to the huntress that there was no time to explain everything to her yet. The huntress was surprised to ask her interlocutor what had happened to her eye. Benny looked at the guy's body and shouted fearfully that streamer had departed for a better world. Benny sadly said the main character was a good acolyte. The girlfriend yelled at the guy for being a fool. I excitedly said that the servant would not die but would only return to his world. She added that the streamer should be fine. At this time, the main character woke up abruptly. He shouted to his frightened friends that he wasn't okay at all. Jinkyong shouted, which was more painful to him now than even being beaten by his elders as a child. The huntress was very amazed. She couldn't believe that nothing had happened to the guy after the hard blow. I explained to the woman that the protagonist was able to destroy the Kriya. The acolyte shouted angrily in pain. The huntress asked in surprise, was the guy really able to hit a Kriya? The girl smiled happily at the woman and said that streamer could save the world. The protagonist took his girlfriend's cheeks with his hands and stretched them in a smile. Streamer angrily yelled to his girlfriend that he was in pain. He kept telling her so. Benny fearfully called out to the protagonist and said that something was wrong with the monster. The huge monster swung his giant sword against the humans. The protagonist bravely ran out against the beast. He shouted to his girlfriend AI to move away quickly. Jinkyong cheered himself up by saying that he was tougher than he himself had thought. The guy said to himself that he didn't even die from such a strong attack from the monster. He pulled out a ballpoint pen from his pocket. The monster did not react in any way to the threats from the protagonist. He swung his sword. Streamer found himself all alone. He stood holding his pen. The guy got excited and scared. He realized it wouldn't be easy for him to hit the monster. The giant swung his weapon to finish off the guy standing on earth. The protagonist could barely contain the monster's onslaught. He prepared to attack back. The monster swung around to strike the man with its blue lightning. A huge shockwave was launched by the monster and began to demolish everything in its path. Jinkyong was hit by the shockwave and was blown sideways. The protagonist began to drift sideways. He couldn't keep still. The guy still had his pen in his hand. He told himself that he had time to prepare. The protagonist told himself that this was super stuff to him. He activated the long-range illumination in the pen. The guy turned on the laser pointer and pointed its beam in the monster's direction. A bright red beam struck the monster from afar. The monster began to pitch to the ground. The bright beam from the laser pointer was very powerful. It flew across the entire Earth. The laser beam traveled past Earth space and far into the sky. A laser pointer could penetrate far through the Earth's atmosphere and travel far into space. The laser beam reached the far reaches of space, and there was a starburst. Benny stood on the ground and watched in amazement as a star exploded far up in the sky. The guy was surprised. He realized that Streamer was able to use very powerful magic. The protagonist was flying away at the time. He couldn't deal with the monster right away. Jinkyong looked at his hand. He realized that the monster had scratched him. The guy looked angrily at the huge giant. He was still on his feet. Jinkyong angrily thought that the huge monster was able to dodge his attack. The guy stood his ground and looked at the monster. He realized that he had missed a little this time. Jinkyong fumbled in his pockets and found a small lighter. He thought he should have brought a couple of batteries with him. The guy held the lighter in his hand and tried to light it. He realized he didn't have anything better to do. The protagonist became agitated and frightened. He realized that the monster had begun to attack. The protagonist saw a huge monster flying at him from a height and swung his sword. Jinkyong swung around with a lit lighter and decided to try and use it against the monster. The guy pointed the fire from his lighter straight toward the monster. The protagonist decided to use a huge firestorm to knock out Ispolin. From the guy's hand, a huge pillar of fire headed towards the monster. The pillar of fire was very powerful and bright. The main character screamed loudly. The pillar of fire passed the standing monster and flew to the side. It didn't hit it in any way. The giant swung his sword to strike the protagonist as soon as possible. Jinkyong looked at the monster in front of him with fright. He decided to try attacking it again. The guy lit a lighter and decided to use the fire to knock the monster off its feet. The protagonist shouted to the thundering giant that he wasn't going to get away this time. Jinkyong launched a huge and wide column of fire from his lighter against the monster. A bright fire beam rose to the heavens. It illuminated the entire neighborhood. At this time, the monster kicked off the ground to try and knock the protagonist down. The monster met an unexpectedly huge and dangerous huge ring in its path. The monster shattered the flying pillar of fire with a strike of its huge sword. The protagonist looked closely at the huge monster and realized it was on its feet. The monster swung his huge sword to finish the guy off very quickly. Jinkyong decided to try using fire against the monster again. He tried lighting a lighter. The monster jumped forward sharply to strike the man on Earth as soon as possible. The main character got scared and worried. He realized he couldn't use the lighter anymore. Jinkyong continued to flick his lighter, but it couldn't get it to full flame. The boy looked in front of him and was startled. He noticed that the monster had launched another shockwave. The protagonist saw the shockwave coming towards him. He didn't have time to defend himself. A strong magical blow took the guy off his feet and knocked him far to the side. A powerful shockwave traveling through the neighborhood and destroying everything in its path. Jinkyong couldn't hurt the monster in any way. The monster swung his sword. The girl stood and looked fearfully at the monster. She couldn't understand where Streamer had disappeared to. The monster swung his sword to strike at the spot where the boy stood before. The monster struck the ground with a huge, very hard blow. The whole place shook. People crumpled to the ground from the violent rumble and began covering their heads to protect themselves. The giant pounded the ground again with all his might. There was a very violent rumble. The monster raised its huge sword to finish off the remaining humans. The monster swung around to deliver another very hard blow to the ground. The monster slammed its sword into the ground with all its might, and a huge shockwave erupted. A strong shockwave traveled across the ground and began to tear and crush everything in its path. After the shockwave passed through, destruction appeared and the earth began to fly apart. The people on Earth were very frightened and worried. Benny shouted to his friends that they had to run away. The huntress shouted fearfully to her companions that if they stayed here, they would die here. The woman saw the girl standing near and paid no attention to anything. She called out to her excitedly. Aika shouted to her companion that they needed to leave quickly. I looked to the side to see the surviving streamer. The girl realized something was wrong with her friend. She ran to help the protagonist. Another blow from the huge monster brought more destruction to the land. The voice of a man suddenly sounded. The protagonist coughed and came to his senses. The streamer's body emerged from a huge pile of dust and ash. He lay immovable on Earth for some time. After that, the protagonist found his strength and climbed out of the dust completely. He was lying on his back. Jinkyong was surprised and annoyed. He didn't understand what had happened to him. The protagonist said to himself that even if he were immortal, he could die from such pain. The guy was thinking and could not understand why he was here. Life seemed helpless and dog-like to him. At that time, someone called the streamer from outside. A girl was descending a dangerous mountain slope to help her boyfriend. Aika shouted that it was very dangerous from below. I ran up to her friend and asked fearfully if he was okay. The protagonist replied that he was fine. The protagonist knelt down. He told his girlfriend that he had been using magical things from his world all this time, but he had already tried everything. The guy told his surprised girlfriend that after the monster attacked, he felt some kind of power inside him with his whole body. Jinkyong said brokenly to his girlfriend that he didn't know what to do or how to do it. The guy told the A-chan girl that this time things will be harder for them than they were before. The girl excitedly called out to her friend. She was amazed at his words. A bright glow appeared high in the sky. The monster prepared to attack again. The monster swung around and raised his hand up to activate another magic. A bright blue light appeared above the monster's hand. A very loud cracking sound was heard. The woman shouted fearfully that the giant wanted to activate the Kaltabaya's spear. Benny asked with interest to the woman, "What was it?" The huntress explained that if the monster swung such a spear, it would engulf the entire area in flames. Aika explained that many warriors had died because of the spear of Kaltobia. The woman said judiciously that she didn't know what kind of power the servant had. She added that in such a situation, the best solution would be escape. Jinkyong thought that he wasn't as great a warrior as his girlfriend thought. Every time he moved to this world, he had an exorbitant amount of power. The protagonist decided to himself that he didn't have that kind of power now. The monster at this time activated magic. The guy explained to the girl that he was only winning in this world because in real life he was a total failure. Jinkyong has decided that he must succeed in this life. He can't fail now. The main character realized that no matter how many times he was born again, he would not see a successful life. At that time, his girlfriend called him loudly. The protagonist pulled back from his thoughts and looked fearfully at Ai. The girl cheerfully told her friend that he was a magnificent man and she would prove it to him. After that, the girl turned around and ran at full speed towards her friends. Ai asked excitedly as the Ike huntress handed over her battle sword to her sooner rather than later. The woman angrily shouted to the girl that if the monster swung its spear now, everything here would be engulfed in flames. Aika told the girl that she still didn't trust her, and couldn't trust her. Ai stood near the foot of the mountain. She calmly called out to the huntress who stood at the top. The woman calmed down. She looked up in surprise at the girl below. Ai excitedly asked the woman if she fought monsters to protect the common people. The girl told the huntress very frankly that she too was now protecting someone. The huntress became agitated. The frank words of her interlocutor made an impression on her. The woman realized she couldn't refuse her acquaintance with that begging look. The huntress took her blade and dropped it down from above to help the girl. Ai bowed with gratitude. The woman realized that the girl might not thank her anymore given the current events. Ai ran at full speed to help the protagonist. Aika looked at the girl after her. She couldn't believe that she was the king's assistant. The girlfriend ran up to the surprised streamer. She stuck the blade in front of him into the ground. The interlocutor very importantly told the guy that he was not only using mana, which was encased in things from his world. Ai explained to her surprised friend that he had originally used pure mana. He had brought it with him from his world. The huntress angrily asked from the top of the mountain, "What is the girl explaining to the protagonist?" The woman warned that the monster was already preparing to use its spear. Ai shouted that she was teaching the streamer magic. Ai told the guy that the main thing in magic is the spell. It takes imagination and concentration to realize it. After that, the girl explained excitedly to the protagonist that mana was also important. The girl explained that in front of the protagonist is a sword that absorbs mana. If the guy thinks of mana from his world, the blade can absorb it. Ai told her friend excitedly that they could use magic from his world. At this time, the monster activated magic and a huge burning spear appeared in his hands. The monster accelerated to launch its flaming spear against the protagonist. And then a huge spear flew toward the streamer. He had to defend himself. Jinkyong told his interlocutor in a calm voice that he wanted it. The girl was very surprised. She sat staring at her acolyte in amazement. Jinkyong took the blade in his hands. He said he wanted it. The guy added that it was not a model of reality. The protagonist jumped to his feet. He shouted loudly that this was real to him. The boy swung his blade to try and strike the monster. Jinkyong shouted that he was in the reality of the fantasy world. The guy activated his spell. At this time, a huge and dangerous blue lightning bolt from the monster flew at the guy. Jinkyong stood with his blade. He prepared to defend himself against the monster's attack. A huge monster stood surrounded by fiery explosions. It attacked the protagonist. The protagonist pointed his sword to defend himself against the monster's fiery attack on him. Streamer held the weapon in front of him and shouted as he activated the magic sword. Jinkyong pointed his blade forward to stop the fiery attack against him. With the help of magic and special weapons, the protagonist was able to shatter the shaft of fire that was flying at him. The monster stood holding a magic spear. Everything around it was covered in flames. Gradually, the power of the magic spear began to wane. It began to fade and deteriorate. Cracks appeared all over the spear. It began to crumble and crack with a blue color. After that, there was a very strong explosion near the monster, which caught the monster. Blue lightning began to run through the monster's body. It weakened and stopped. The huge monster's body began to crack and completely collapse. There was a very strong explosion and the body of the huge monster began to fly apart. Huge blue lightning flashed in the air after destroying the huge monster's body. A bright blue explosion illuminated the surrounding area. The remains of the monster were scattered in the neighborhood as well. Gradually, the darkness left and everything around it brightened up. Only a huge sword remained on the ground, which fell out of the monster's hands. The protagonist stood with the blade in his hand and looked in front of him. He said to himself that he had lived in vain before. The streamer looked at the Benny guy and the huntress who were lying on the earth. The protagonist looked at his girlfriend and decided he wanted to check it out. Jinkyong decided proudly to himself that he would be the one who could do anything normally, even if it was in another world. Morning came and nature began to come alive. The sun shone, birds flew across the sky. The protagonist spent the night in an abandoned and ruined building. Everything around him was destroyed. Jinkyong stood up on his bed. He looked out the window at the street with great attention. The protagonist grudgingly told himself that the bed was very uncomfortable. He didn't understand how people from the fantasy world could live here. The guy decided to go outside and see if Ai-chan slept well. The main character walked to the door and looked outside. The sun was shining brightly there. The lad stepped out into the courtyard and surveyed the ruined surroundings with amazement. Jinkyong was silent and looked carefully in front of him and saw the survivors. People were picking up the dead and helping the wounded. There were signs of immense destruction all around. Villagers were collecting the bodies of dead people and preparing to bury them. Grieving residents stood in the cemetery. There were plenty of new crosses all around. Jinkyong felt an oppressive atmosphere. He remembered that the fantasy worlds he had seen were fun and mysterious. Streamer realized that in reality, it didn't turn out that way. People in the fantasy world give their lives for nothing. Jinkyong looked at the ruins in front of him and decided that there was no such world on the internet. Aika, standing outside the house, apologized to Girl A for yesterday. The woman told her young interlocutor that she could be trusted. Aika informed the girl that they still don't know what the king is up to, or how he's using AI. The main character overhears a woman tell a girl that she knows what she's worried about. AI said thoughtfully. She had realized a lot of things yesterday. She decided to check something out. The girl reported that she wanted to check out what was going on here and up north. AI said thoughtfully that after she checked everything, then she would make the right decision. The huntress thought. She was deeply affected by her companion's words. Aika decided that there was nothing more dangerous for a girl to think about making the right decision. The Aika woman and her companions went out into nature. She wanted to say goodbye to them. The huntress handed her familiars a pouch of artifacts and told them to use them for protection. The warrior told the young friends that their belongings were burned in the monster's attack. Aika apologized because she burned the order. AI told her interlocutors with a smile that they would use wisely all the things they received. The woman turned to the side and reminded her interlocutors that there was something else she wanted to tell them. The huntress told her interlocutors that they had heard about the king from traveling musicians. The warrior said that musicians can go to different places and hear a lot of things. Aika explained that stray musicians can talk in their songs about what's going on in the world and what the issues are right now. The woman told the interlocutors that they would be arriving in Chiriea. Musicians were gathering there, and they would be able to find out something. The huntress called out to the protagonist. She was unbuckling her battle belt. Jinkyong was surprised. The woman took off her battle belt and threw it in the direction of the protagonist. Jinkyong held the belt in his hands and looked at it with great surprise. The huntress looked at the boy and told him to protect his small friends well. Jinkyong put on his battle belt. Benny told his friend that the new ammunition didn't suit him. The protagonist and his young companions went their separate ways. The sky was clear and blue, and clouds floated across the sky. I was telling the streamer about her adventures. The protagonist was very angry when he heard from his girlfriend that Aika had taken away her eye. I replied to the guy that he had misunderstood everything. The girl explained that they had a misunderstanding with the huntress. Jinkyong couldn't understand how a woman could knock out AI's eye because of a misunderstanding. I explained to her friend that Aiki has a lot of people to protect, so she always has to be on guard. The girl said she had a lot to think about thanks to Ike. A huntress needs to stand up for what she thinks. The protagonist listened with great skill and interest to the story of his interlocutor. AI said thoughtfully. Becoming an adult becomes very unclear. The girl told her friends that people often start everything, and don't start with an eye on what's going on around them. Streamer looked at his companion with great attention. He listened to her intently. The guy saw a huge valley in front of him. He thought he had to look at what was around him. There was a meeting at the castle. The ruler was hosting a girl. A man was sitting at the table. A guest with blue hair was standing next to him and explaining something to him. The girl stood and explained something very emphatically to her interlocutor. The ruler was agitated and angry. He didn't like the girl's words. A little later, the ruler in his own palace decided to receive an important guest. The guest asked the man, "What happened and why did he want to meet?" The man said that these were difficult times for Korea. The guest clarified to the palace master, what did he need the meeting with him for? The man explained that this morning he met up with his daughter after a long time. The governor said that his daughter told him a very interesting thing. The man told his interlocutor that the summoner had traveled north with his men. They were able to destroy the Kriya there. The guest was very surprised at such news. He even put his cup on the table out of surprise. The man grudgingly shouted to his interlocutor that there was no such thing. The guest told the surprised man that he had learned some rumors today. The ruler asked excitedly to his guest what rumors had reached him. The interlocutor said that the strolling musicians saw something strange with their own eyes. A huge Keltabia monster appeared in the neighborhood, and someone was able to successfully destroy it. The two men sat silently at the table. They pondered the rumors and news together. The ruler set the cup on the table and said it would be foolish to ignore such news. The man sipped his tea and said that he was very worried about the fact that a wielder of great power could turn his gaze to anyone. The guest reported that people are going north through the Chiria. This place has been completely abandoned by the people because of the monsters. The man told the ruler that they needed to send someone there. The guest reported thoughtfully that no one knew exactly when an accident might occur in the ruins of the village. A group of men were sitting in a hut in the late afternoon. One of them said that they would have to come forward on the orders of the lords. The musicians were sitting around discussing the performance among themselves. One guy told their leader Hen that they would not be at the beck and call of the gentleman. Hen shouted to the angry friends not to live counting every penny. He added that they could sing and get rich people's money. After that, Hen turned to his singing friend Kano and said that he had a good tone. The guy reported that their friend Eric plays his stringed instrument well too. Hen pointed to a beautiful red-haired girl named Rua who was sitting next to him. The musicians looked at their girlfriend in surprise. She was silent in response. The guy said with a smile that the girl next to him is a beautiful person. Hen told his girlfriend to calm down. He showed his companions a picture. The picture showed the main character and the AI girl. Hen said that those scary people would be here soon. He told his friends that they were the best musicians here. The guy replied that they were fine in Chiria. Then the leader took out a small pouch. He decided to say something to his friends. Hen said they should get rid of people who go to them for their homeland. The musicians were very surprised. One of them said that a friend was suggesting that they commit murder. Hen threw the bag of gold coins on the table. His friends were surprised. Musicians looked with great excitement at the pile of gold coins before them. Some of the people said there's a lot of money in front of them right now. Hen told his friends judiciously that they would not be committing murder, but doing duty to their country. The leader asked his friends, do they really want to spend their lives as wanderers and musicians? He bid them spread out for the sake of the country. The girl listened attentively to her friend. Hen said that the king's disgusting image was created by their songs. After that, the guy turned to his friends and asked which one of them would do the killing. The girl Rua went outside. She scrutinized the bag of money in her hand for a long time. The musician hesitated. She was walking and thinking about how she could make a quick buck. The girl walked to the door of her house. She thought she was tired of singing and living in poverty. Rua opened the front door. She decided that she too wanted to perform in fancy halls. Suddenly someone hit the girl on the legs with a stick. She was surprised and frightened. Mother, with broom in hand, sternly told her daughter that she had previously forbidden her from loitering and performing. The daughter got very angry. The woman told her she was ashamed in front of the neighbors. The younger Rua siblings were sitting on the floor. The mother told her daughter that she should be ashamed in front of the younger ones. The woman told Strictly's daughter to study with the Hansa and work in the blacksmith shop. Rua decided to leave. She slammed the door behind her. Her mother shouted at the girl that she didn't understand her. The woman angrily shouted at her daughter to hate her and not to come back. Rua ran with all her might. She reassured herself with the words that she could succeed. The girl ran and told herself that she would later return in triumph, at which time the protagonist was with his friends in the dark forest. Jinkyong looked at his companions. I told her friend that it was hard for her to go through this forest. The girlfriend reminded the protagonist that he was very tired last time. Streamer replied to the girlfriend that he was fine. He added that his body was healed thanks to mana. Benny asked the unexpected protagonist if he had ever seen the sea. Jinkyong asked a friend and an I-chan girl if they had ever seen the sea. The main character told his friends that the sea looks like a large amount of water near the horizon. It's like it connects to the sky. The streamer remembered to himself that he had seen the sea on TV and on the internet. The protagonist and his friends climbed to the top of a high hill. The people marveled. The girls shouted admiringly that they could now see the sea in front of them. The protagonist gazed admiringly and silently at the sea in front of him. He had never seen anything like it before. The vast sea stretched far beyond the horizon. The water level reached all the way to the sky. Jinkyong and his friends saw the mountains before them turn into water. Ai told her friend joyfully that the water had joined the sky. The protagonist was surprised. The boy, along with his friends, looked in front of him and saw birds soaring over the mountains. Jinkyong, along with his companions, approached a huge stone ruin. Suddenly people heard a loud and very threatening noise from outside. Jinkyong asked, frightened, to his friends, what did they just hear? Ai told his friend that they heard the roar of a monster. People didn't know what to do. AA offered to check what had just happened. Benny shouted to his companions that it was better to run away. The protagonist, along with his companions, stood for a long time wondering what they should do now. Jinkyong ran with all his might in the direction of Monster's scream. His friends were forced to follow him. A huge monster stood on the sand, and with him on the ground lay a defenseless girl. Rua was lying on the ground, screaming in fright. The monster was preparing to attack her. The victim lay there, unable to realize what kind of monster was now standing in front of her. Rua didn't understand how she could have gotten herself into this situation and why it had all happened to her. The girl thought to herself why things weren't working out so well for her. Rua decided to stand up and try to escape. She was very scared. At that time, the protagonist appeared. He addressed the monster in a menacing manner. Jinkyong shouted to the monster that it was very low to choose a beautiful girl as an opponent. He continued to fight one-on-one. He shouted to the monster to choose an opponent of equal strength. The protagonist swung around and prepared to strike the monster. The monster turned his attention to him. Jinkyong landed and stood across between the monster and the defenseless girl. The monster stared intently and angrily at the man who had suddenly appeared in front of him. Rua looked with great surprise and excitement at the savior who had suddenly appeared to her. The main character's friends looked at him warily. They didn't know how he would fight. Jinkyong wanted to reach for the battle belt that hung on his back, but he couldn't. The girl yelled very angrily to the streamer that it wasn't appropriate for him. The protagonist got scared. He started gesturing for the monster to stop. The monster didn't react to the words of the man in front of him. The protagonist, after a tremendous blow from the monster, crashed headlong into a large mountain. Rua, along with his friends, looked excitedly at the streamer, who flew off into the mountain. The girl was surprised. She didn't understand why the protagonist acted like a fool. The monster screamed loudly. It prepared to attack the girl. I shouted for Rua to run away quickly. The girl was running towards the protagonist and wanted to warn him about the monster. Rua was startled to hear the main character refer to himself as the messenger of death. Jinkyong shouted to the monster that he was even scarier than death itself. Benny and his girlfriend got very excited and surprised at such a word. Streamer shouted menacingly to his opponent that he was about to smite him with his sharp blade. The protagonist menacingly shouted to the monster to say goodbye to his life now. The protagonist, standing near the mountain, attacked the monster with a bright flame. The monster stood and glared viciously at the people below in front of him on the ground. Rua, along with the main character's friends, were frightened. They thought the monster was about to kill the streamer. The monster stood at full height and glared predatorily at its would-be victims. At this time, the protagonist was able to hit a huge monster with a small fire beam. The monster's body was cut by the fire stream and began to disintegrate. The monster couldn't withstand the magical attack from the protagonist and began to fall apart. People on Earth were surprised to see that the behemoth had its top part completely blown off. Rua girl was very much taken aback. She decided to pay attention to her new acquaintances. Rua turned around and realized with surprise that her new friends were supposed to be her victims. The girl scrutinized the protagonist. He approached her with his dagger. Rua looked at the people in surprise and realized they were drawn on the flyer her musician friend had shown her. Rua remembered the painted appearance of the main character and his girlfriend Ai. Jinkyong is very excited. Asked the interviewer if she had any wounds. Rua answered the guy with a smile that she wasn't hurt thanks to him. She thought to herself that she didn't know what to do. The protagonist stood long and silently across from his new acquaintance. All the friends were looking at the streamer in a very excited and confused way. Jinkyong watched and studied the girl in front of him with very great attention. Rua didn't understand what was going on. The guy was studying her very testily. Jinkyong said with surprise to the interlocutor that she had a very rough voice. Rua smiled at his new friends and said he was a guy, but his voice wasn't as gruff anymore. There was a long pause. The protagonist, still with the knife in his hand, looked at Rua with great attention. The protagonist, along with his companions, set out on their journey. He said that Rua is a wandering musician. The musician asked in amazement to his friends, "Is this really the first time they have come to Chira?" After which the musician offered his new acquaintances a place to stay. Rua told his friends that he would like to repay them for saving him. Ai was pleased at this offer from her new friend. The girl shouted happily to the streamer that they had found a new place to sleep. The main character was very upset and displeased. He looked angrily at his friends. Jinkyong turned his head to the side frustratedly and exhaled sadly. The main character asked his new friend, why did he grow his hair? Rua replied shyly that he was told he needed the hair for performing. The main character looked long and unhappily at the musician. He didn't know what to say. Streamer said in a Rua important voice that there was a good phrase in his world. Jinkyong said that in his world they say that a person must be good taste, and it doesn't matter if they are male or female. The main character's companions were very surprised and amazed at his words. They didn't know what to say back. Jinkyong turned around and told his friends to follow him. The musician stood alone. He was worried and felt threatened. Rua thought to himself excitedly that his new friends were cruel and dangerous. The protagonist and his friends approached a castle that stood in the highlands. The castle was dilapidated. It looked especially marvelously fairy tale-like against the setting sun. Jinkyong asked with surprise at the musician, Do they really live here? Rua told friends that the place is very good and is in the open air. The musician told his friends that everything here was destroyed because of the attack of the monsters. Beanie told his friends with admiration that this place is cool to sleep outside. Rua told his friends cheerfully that they had a basement that could be used as a dining room. Only it would need cleaning. Ai said cheerfully that they would help the musician with the cleaning. Rua replied to his girlfriend that it was their place, and the musicians would keep an eye on it. Benny said excitedly to his girlfriend that they needed to find out about the ship's arrival. He added that there were most likely no people in the village. The guy told his girlfriend they'd probably have to go overland. Jinkyong told his friends judiciously that according to the map, it would take longer to get there by land than by sea. The musician happily wished his friends to come back soon. Rua watched long and intently as the protagonist and his companions walked away from him. The musician relaxed and exhaled. He watched his new acquaintances depart in the distance. He took the hidden thing out of his pocket and held it clutched in his hand. The musician opened his palm. He looked closely at the small metal cylinder. Rua remembered his friends telling him that they wouldn't kill their victims personally. Hanny handed his friend a metal cylinder and said it would help in the murder. The leader told the musician that he could earn money and pointed to a sack. He added that after a successful assignment, Rua would receive 2 similar sacks. Hen asked with interest to his interlocutor, "What could such a local guy be afraid of?" Rua answered his friend that he was not of Sharia. After that, the leader pointed at the portrait of the main character and said that he was a servant. Hen looked at his friend very sternly and with great attention. Rua looked at the portrait of the protagonist with very great interest and excitement, at which time Streamer and his friends approached a town near the mountains. Benny looked at the settlement next to him and said that some of the houses there had lights. The main character and his friends saw some people making something out of wood. Benny said they could try to swim across the sea. I said judiciously that there are no longer monsters that attack from the sea. She added that the goddess Ii may be in the water. She patronizes those who live off the seas. The main character laughed out loud after the story he heard from his girlfriend. Jinkyong told his friends that they believed in silly fantasies. He added that he would tell them the bitter truth. The main character asked acquaintances if they had ever seen God. I replied that they hadn't. The streamer asked his friends if their prayers had ever come true. The girl replied that prayers have not come true. Jinkyong asked with interest to his friends, "Why pay money in a place run by God?" The protagonist said to his friends, "Why would the great God think about money?" He added that it was all invented by men to swindle money from others. Jinkyong told his astonished friends unequivocally that there is no God. Streamer, accompanied by his friends, were walking through a mountain gorge. Everything around them was destroyed. People were walking along and saw before them the vast remains of wrecked ships. The AI girl asked excitedly to the protagonist, "What should they do now?" Benny turned to the side. He noticed something interesting and decided to tell his friends about it. The guy pointed his finger at a light in the distance and shouted it to his girlfriend. People looked closer and noticed that very close by in the pitch darkness, a yellow light was flickering. The protagonist and his friends gradually approached the source of the fire. A man was near the side of a large ship and was fixing something on it. The guests were very excited when they saw the ship. They approached the stranger. The man turned around. He looked at the arriving guests with a displeased look. AI asked with great excitement to the man, "Can this ship sail?" The girl looked at the stranger with a very sad and pleading look. The man was silent. He took a long and probing look at the girl and went back to his business. Jinkyong pointed his hand at the stranger and said that he didn't speak at all. At that time, a guy came out of the house nearby. He told the guests that the old man near the ship could not speak. Benny asked the guy with interest, "Can this ship sail?" The man replied that the ship needed to be repaired. He added that there were more problems. Benny asked his interlocutor with great excitement, "What other problems could there be?" The guy reasoned that the tide was coming in. If they sent the ship out now, it would run aground or sink. After that, the guy sadly told the guests that the goddess of EA was mad at them. The interlocutor went to an old man who was working and asked, "How can you go on swimming if you sink anyway?" The old man didn't answer anything. He was very concentrated on something on the side of the ship. The guy looked meaningfully at Benny and told him that this was the situation, after which the protagonist and his friends retreated to a hut where a musician was waiting for them. Streamer and his companions entered the hut. It was lit by a fire from within. The musician told his friends that there was a fire and lodging inside. There were different kinds of food on the table. Rua shouted happily and with a smile to his friends that he had prepared some goodies for them. The protagonist looked at the musician unhappily. He didn't like his outfit. The main character saw that the musician was dressed in black lightweight tight clothes. He shouted for Rua to put on his outer clothes. The musician replied modestly that it was his stage costume. Ai told her friend that everything was very good for her. She thanked the musician. Rua said he would go and get a drink now. The girl watched with excitement and attention as the musician approached the barrel. Benny told the girl excitedly that they were in trouble. He added that they would have to get overland. The guy pointed his girlfriend to the map and said they'd be walking longer. The musician was pouring drinks into cups at the time. I said that all the monsters in Korkia had been killed by Streamer. The musician very carefully and furtively began to pour the poison from the iron barrel into the glasses. Rua carried the glasses on a tray. He wanted to tell his friends with a smile that he had brought them a delicious drink. The musician stood very agitated. He looked at his friends apprehensively. Rua offered his acquaintances at the table a taste of the delicious tea. The musician was frightened but didn't show it. He thought his guests suspected something. The main character and his friends started to thank the musician and said that the tea had a good smell. The AI girl asked with interest to Rua if he knew anything about tides. The musician with a smile interrogated her interlocutor. What tides is she talking about? I said sad that for them the goddess Ea does not give a road by sea. The girl said they needed to get by sea, but they couldn't do that if the water continued to behave like this. Rua told his friends that he remembered the legend of Ea and the wandering musician. Rua explained that legend explains the reason why musicians stay in this place. From the beginning, the goddess Ea was on the side of the monsters. She sang beautiful songs to bewitch people. People learned that the goddess Ea liked music. Then the wandering musicians were gathered to create the best song in the world. The musicians sang the best song for AA. After that, she stood up for the people. Rua told his friends that at night, the seawater swallows up the monsters. In the daytime, the EA uses the tides to open the way for fishermen. The main character told his girlfriend that the musician was talking crap for them. Rua told his friends with excitement that suddenly the tides stopped appearing. Ea chose always the musician who would play the most beautiful song. Rua explained to his interlocutors that the musician had sung badly and caused the wrath of the sea goddess. Streamer asked the guy sternly if he was that musician by any chance. The musician stopped his story. He realized that the protagonist had found out all about him. Rua, very offended with tears in his eyes, told his friends that he was the one bad musician. The musician thought to himself that he was trying to lighten the atmosphere with his story. Rua stood there unable to understand why his guests still hadn't touched their drinks. The musician wanted his friends to drink the poison and go to sleep as soon as possible. Jinkyong suddenly tapped his hand on the table. The protagonist sternly told his interlocutor that he doesn't drink that stuff. Streamer put his hand on top of the glass. He told the musician that there was something curious for him. Jinkyong asked the agitated interlocutor, what is he hiding in front of him? The protagonist looked angrily at the musician and demanded that he tell him everything. The protagonist's parents were sitting in their apartment late at night. The wife and her husband were sitting alone in a room. The man was watching TV. After a long pause, the man decided to address the woman with a question. The husband asked sternly to his wife, how is it going with Jinkyong? The woman got worried. Without taking his eyes off the TV, the man asked his wife if their son was even eating. The woman was silent. She thought about it and didn't know what to say to her husband. The mother said that she went into her son's bedroom and saw bread on the table. Wife told her husband that no one bought bread for her son and she doesn't know how he got there. The woman said that maybe her son ordered his food by delivery. The man looked at his wife. The interlocutor said that she had not been away at all. A husband told his wife that she must have bought her son bread herself and then forgotten about it. The man took the remote control in his hands and told the woman to pay no more attention to Jinkyong from now on. Mother cautiously told her husband that their son might starve to death. The man said judiciously that the son would not have much courage. He had never been brave. He had never been brave, the woman thought. She sat by the table and didn't know what to do. Mother recalled that she used to feel frustration and pain because of the closed door to her son's room. The woman felt as if there was nothing at all in son's room right now. Mother, standing by the door, felt only a sense of utter emptiness. The woman recalled her son telling her not too long ago not to worry. The woman sat and looked intently at the food on the table. The woman sat and thought that it would be impossible for her to disappear from this house. If the mother had the opportunity, she would disappear from her apartment forever. The protagonist was sitting with his friends in the musician's cabin at the time. Rua was very frightened and agitated. He couldn't understand what Streamer wanted from him. The musician looked at his angry interlocutor. He thought that Jinkyong had guessed everything. Rua was startled to think that the protagonist had guessed the presence of poison in the drink glass. Suddenly, the protagonist, as if nothing had happened, drained the contents of his glass. Jinkyong felt more reassured and decided to address the musician once more. The protagonist angrily demanded of his frightened interlocutor that he think hard and tell him everything. Jinkyong started asking Rua about the meaning in his songs about the king. Jinkyong said he saw the royal fortress with his own eyes. The palace is like a dungeon in the sky. The protagonist sternly asked the musician if any of them had ever seen a king to write such songs. Rua explained that they are traveling musicians and make every effort to convey the truth through song. Rua explained that he only recently joined the traveling musicians. He added that his colleagues on stage sacrificed their lives doing their work. The musician said that among his friends there were people who had seen the king in person. The main character was surprised. He asked his interlocutor who among his acquaintances had seen the king. Rua was very frightened. He realized that he had just spoken seriously. The musician told his interlocutor not to ask anything. Jinkyong was not happy. The protagonist reminded the musician that he was talking about people he knew, not soldiers or servants. Jinkyong said that he had only seen nobles around the king. Streamer sternly asked the fellow, does he and his musicians receive money from the nobles and compose songs against the king? Rua jumped up and shouted that people were just worried about the future of the country. The musician was very much frightened and excited. He looked at his interlocutor with great surprise and excitement. Streamer said judiciously that everything about the noble's excitement sounded right. The musician was very frightened. He was very alarmed and disturbed by the streamer's words. Jinkyong said people who had never seen him called him garbage. The protagonist said that he personally doesn't know what kind of person the king is, so he wants to check it out personally. Jinkyong told the agitated interlocutor to check everything first before slandering a stranger. Rua shouted to his interlocutor that you can't test everything in the world. That's what verified people are for. People you can trust. The protagonist asked the musician what kind of people can be trusted. The guy replied excitedly to the protagonist that his henpecked colleagues could be trusted. Jinkyong asked the interlocutor in disbelief, do his henny bow their heads and receive orders from higher nobles? The musician was surprised. He angrily asked his interlocutor, what is he talking about? At which time suddenly Benny dropped dead to the floor from his place on the chair. The main character got very worried. He jumped up and asked his friend, did he fall asleep? The streamer looked anxiously at Benny. The guy was lying on the floor completely lifeless. Benny was lying on the floor without any signs of life. Saliva came out of his mouth. Jinkyong rushed to his comrade's aid. He asked excitedly, what happened? The protagonist asked his friend, does he have any pain? Benny was silent. Streamer turned around in surprise and noticed that his girlfriend Ai-chan had also dropped dead on the table. The main character was scared. He couldn't understand what had happened to his girlfriend. The girl was lying head down on the table. She didn't show any signs of life. The protagonist looked with great attention at the glass near the girl's hand. Jinkyong was startled and began to guess something. He thought that the girl and his friend had been poisoned. The protagonist turned around and looked at the musician with frightened excitement. Streamer realized with consternation that the musician had just wanted to poison them all. Rua's boyfriend was very much scared. He didn't understand why the main character was still standing. Jinkyong tried to get up. He decided to kill the musician as soon as possible. The protagonist realized he needed help with his weapon. He turned to the side. Jinkyong glanced to the side and noticed his battle belt lying on the table. The protagonist was on his feet and prepared to attack the frightened musician. Rua realized with fear that the streamer had not been affected by the poison from the drink. Rua had asked his friends earlier what he should do if suddenly the poison didn't work. Hen told his friends strictly that he would need to kill the summoner. The musician realized he had no choice but to kill his guests with his own hands. Rua reached out with his hand and grabbed a table knife that was on the table. The protagonist realized he wasn't going to make it in time to help his friends. He rushed forward, at which time the musician swung around to stab one of the lying men. Streamer tried to help one of his friends and stop the musician. The musician managed to plunge his knife from the front into the girl's body. The main character was very much frightened. He looked in front of him and saw her talisman fall from the girl. Streamer was very much afraid. He realized that the girl who had summoned him was about to die. The protagonist was startled to feel the process of his reverse teleportation begin. Rua was stabbing the girl and Streamer had already completely dissolved. The protagonist soared upward from the building in a stream of blue light. He went to his world. Teleportation took the streamer straight to his room in his apartment late at night. The windows in the main character's private room lit up with a very bright light. Jinkyong's body fell very abruptly to the floor. He couldn't recover immediately. The protagonist had pulled himself up. Returning home was a surprise to him. The boy saw a very bright light from the side. He turned his head fearfully. Jinkyong was standing by the window. He was looking at the street through the window. The protagonist frightenedly recalled all the past events. He realized that he didn't have time to help his girlfriend. The image of his familiar AI lying dead on the floor remained in Jinkyong's mind. The musician was left all alone with the murdered girl. He was terrified. Ruasu's hands were shaking in fear. He even let go of the knife he was holding. The musician was very scared and shocked. He started backing into the wall. Rua looked at the lifeless body of his new girlfriend with a frightened look. The musician was very shocked. He realized that he had just killed AI with his own hands. Rua sat against the wall and stared fearfully in front of him. The fireplace illuminated the girl's body on the floor. The musician was frightened and excited, thinking that he had just killed a man. Before that, the guy asked his friend, how will he be able to kill a man? Hen replied that Rua will commit murder not only for himself. The leader explained to the musician that the deed he had done would change the whole world. Hen told his friend strictly to go and kill without thinking about anything. Rua thought for a long time, but he couldn't figure out what he'd just done. The musician told himself that he was able to take the first step. Now he will wait and see how the world will change. Rua got to his feet and said proudly to himself that he had done all this for the Henin who were also sacrificing their lives. Then the musician left his hut and went outside to the big stone. Guy walked over to a rock and placed a bright burning lamp on it. Lamp shone in the darkness and illuminated the entire neighborhood very brightly. The light from the burning lamp on the stone was visible very far away at a great distance. The warriors saw a burning lamp. One of them said that the light was a sign. The lad on the horse said to himself that he would like to get a glimpse of the great servant once. The warrior told his friend that the mercenaries know nothing at all about alchemy. The warrior told his friend that times had changed, and the age of reborn mana had begun. The man was not satisfied with such words. He told his interlocutor that he was talking dog shit. The warrior began to tell me that the king and the aristocracy use swalken for a better life. Such things absorb mana. Fortresses, houses, and flying ships are all magical. Due to the lack of mana in the world, even sorcerers can't use magic. The warrior said thoughtfully. He could do some research on mana from another world. The man angrily told his friend that he had been making order with him for years. The two of them rode their horses toward the fire. Silence was in the highlands. White clouds floated near the slopes. There was a hissing sound on the slope of the high mountain. Water began to form there. Small droplets began to drip from the high mountain top straight down. Out of the small droplets arose a huge drop in which everything was reflected. A huge drop from a great height at full speed down the mountain. The drop hit the ground and there were huge airwaves around it. The sound of the droplet's impact traveled far into the suburbs. It came like a shockwave. The impact of the drop disturbed the entire neighborhood. It echoed far and wide. At that time, the old man and the boy were sitting next to the fire. The sound of a drop reached them. The old man got very worried. The interlocutor asked excitedly to the old man what had happened to him. After calming down a bit, the old man waved his hand to show he was okay. The guy said wistfully they were able to fix it, and the sea stayed that way. The elderly man sat listening to his interlocutor with great attention. The guy looked away and said that in 40 years, so much water had never been drawn at a time. A man said that in the old days they could not fish for months and thought they would starve to death. The old man listened to the words of his interlocutor. The boy remembered that some wandering musician had come and calmed the goddess. A girl with white hair asked the musician to sing her a song. Afterward, the fairy girl told the musician that the Anelli liked his song. Interlocutor distracted. He asked with interest to the old man if he was listening to him. At which time the warriors reached on horseback the house of the traveling musicians. The man looked at the corpses in the hut and said that the Rua had done a good job. The guest asked the musician what kind of body was lying on the floor. Rua explained that it was the servant of the summoner. The warrior told the musician that he did a neat job and he had talent. The warrior was carrying the girl's corpse on his shoulders. He shouted to his accomplice to give money to the musician and they left together. The man turned around and looked at his colleague as he left. He said to himself, "Is a servant really a human being?" Afterward, the man said quietly to his interlocutor that they had already exchanged greetings. The warrior asked the guy with interest, "How much does the guy want to take for himself as a reward?" Rua said in a frightened voice that he wanted 20 gold pieces for himself. The man was very surprised at such an amount. The warrior asked the boy if he had made a mistake with the sum of 20 gold pieces. The musician replied that he had calculated everything accurately. The musician looked carefully into his pouch. He counted the number of coins. Rua looked carefully at his interlocutor and told him that everything was accurate. After that, the warrior swung his sword and shouted to the guy that it was right. The man struck the musician with a sudden swing of his sharp blade. Rua is staggered by a heavy blow from the warrior. He flies sideways into the wall. The musician lay exhausted against the wall after being badly wounded. Rua was sitting up and struggling to breathe. He noticed blood appearing on his hands. The frightened musician let out a death scream. The warrior shouted angrily at the boy to shut up. The man explained to his interlocutor that he did not do so because of money. The warrior explained to the astonished musician that such matters must be kept secret. The man said that now Rua will definitely be silenced. He added that he and the guy are from the same neighborhood. The warrior told his companion that his friends were very cruel. They gave the performer only 20 gold pieces out of 200. Rua was very amazed at such words. The warrior told the guy that he was expecting a lot of money and was disappointed. The man menacingly told the musician that he would soon meet his henchmen. Man pulled out a knife and angrily shouted at the guy that he was going to send him to the other side of the world. At which time the warrior rode lonely on horseback and carried the girl's body out of town. The man stopped. He decided to take the dead body off the horse and put it on the ground. The warrior dumped the girl's body on the ground. She surprised him a lot for some reason. The man could not believe that such a young girl could be a great summoner. The warrior hesitated. The body of the young summoner seemed very strange to him. The man remembered Mr. Kalunikas from the community of summoners. He also thought of Mr. Rickon from the community of wandering musicians and Mr. Fellow from the community of alchemists. The three gentlemen were of one opinion, that the girl was the king's summoner of the... The warrior looked at the body and decided that the victim had been used once as a traveling musician. The man was overjoyed. He drew his sword and said to himself, "The most important thing is that the victim is not him." The warrior swung his sword and decided that he would throw the girl's body into the sea. And then the man swung his sword at the body in front of him. There was complete silence and darkness. Next to the warrior, his horse was grazing. The main character was sitting in his house. He still couldn't believe that his girlfriend had died. Jinkyong sat and repeated his girlfriend's name frantically to himself. The protagonist couldn't forgive himself for not saving the girl when he had the chance. After that, the guy jumped up and abruptly sprinted over to his desk. He started opening various drawers. Jinkyong opened the shoelock and started picking and going through things in it. The main character was frantically looking for a band-aid. He was still thinking of helping the girl. Suddenly, the woman heard some loud noise in her son's room. The mother got worried. You could hear the guy in the room turning something over. Suddenly, the door opened and the protagonist ran out of there at full speed. The mother looked anxiously at her son. He was gone for a long time, and then he suddenly appeared. The parents were sitting on the couch looking at their son in surprise. The boy started digging in the locker near the door. The father didn't understand what had happened to his son. Jinkyong was going through the things in his locker. He realized that all the band-aids had been used. The protagonist was desperate. He didn't know what to do and ran away. The boy started rummaging through another drawer. The father asked angrily to his son, "What happened to him?" The main character was sitting by an open box. He was throwing things around. Jinkyong felt very sad. He realized that there was no point in him looking for anything. The protagonist realized that all his efforts had become completely useless. Jinkyong thought sadly to himself that he wouldn't be able to help the girl anyway. The boy looked at his red talisman. He realized that nothing would change if even he found the right thing. The protagonist realized that he couldn't help his girlfriend unless she called on him. Jinkyong sat in front of the red talisman and looked at it with an unseeing gaze. The protagonist was very angry. He realized he couldn't help the girl. The protagonist grabbed his red amulet from the table and decided to run away with it. Jinkyong opened the door with a swing and decided to run out of his room. Suddenly, the father's hand rested on his son's shoulder. He stopped the boy in his tracks. The protagonist turned around and looked at his father with great surprise and fear. The man looked very sternly and asked his son, "What on earth is he doing?" Jinkyong stood and looked at his father with a completely maddened look. The protagonist got scared. He leaned backwards away from his father. Jinkyong was at a complete loss. He couldn't explain to his parents what was happening to him. The mother looked at her son very worriedly. He seemed even crazier to her than before. Streamer looked at his father. He was completely immersed in his own thoughts. He didn't understand why it had all happened like this. Jinkyong remembered his walks with the girl. "I told him when growing up begins." The girl told her friends that growing up starts when you start looking at things around you. Jinkyong said to himself fearfully he still hadn't started to look at the things around him. The main character stood in his room across from his parents. He felt like he was in a different place. Jinkyong wanted to say something to his father, but the words were stuck in his mouth. The man looked at his son angrily and suspiciously. The boy could not say a word. After a long pause, the protagonist apologized to his parents. The mother was very surprised. She looked at her son with a startled look. The man was very surprised. He couldn't believe his son had apologized to him. Jinkyong apologized to his parents in a ringing voice for making them worry. The son apologized to his surprised and flabbergasted mother for last time. The protagonist looked at his parents carefully and said they had to go. The father asked his son in surprise where he was going. The main character opened the front door with determination. He decided to run outside. The parents looked at their son in amazement. He used to be unable to leave the house by himself. The protagonist looked determinedly ahead of him and walked on down the entrance hallway. Father and mother looked at their son with excitement. They were very surprised. The protagonist was completely focused. He was determined to conquer his fears on his own. Jinkyong walked calmly and leisurely down the corridor. He needed to get over himself and go outside. There was still a strong fear in the streamer's body. He struggled to overcome it. The protagonist moved further down his floor corridor from the door. The parents looked after their son with great excitement. They realized that he had been able to leave the house. Then the man and the woman ran full speed toward the door to the balcony. The parents looked from the railing at the balcony down into the courtyard with wonder and excitement. While the protagonist was speeding through the yard, he was running to drown out his fear. Jinkyong ran and thought to himself that it absolutely didn't matter if there was any benefit to it. Streamer was coming down the street at full throttle. He decided not to stop. The main character told himself that he didn't have to worry about whether or not a seizure would happen. The guy noticed a drugstore on his way. He decided to run into it. The protagonist stormed into the drugstore and looked angrily at the clerk. Jinkyong handed the man his bank card on the counter. The protagonist demanded in a frightened voice that the salesman give him the medicine. The man behind the counter fearfully asked the customer what he wanted. The protagonist told the salesman he needed medicine. The man asked the guy what exactly did the guest need. Jinkyong explained that he needed medicine after his knife cuts. After shopping, the protagonist walked out of the pharmacy into the street with a bag. The protagonist was standing on the street looking around and thinking. Jinkyong stood in the street all alone. He didn't know what he should do. The protagonist was standing in the street. He was frantically wondering what he should do next. Jinkyong suddenly heard a noise behind him. He noticed a group of people nearby. Streamer noticed a group of young men standing in the street next to him. The protagonist stood listening to the merry conversations of the passers-by beside him. Suddenly, the boy felt that it was getting hard for him to stand, and everything swam in front of his eyes. Jinkyong could no longer hear the voices of the people around him. His eyesight was beginning to fail him. The protagonist stared unseeingly in front of him. He collapsed to his knees. Jinkyong was on his knees and felt like he was panting heavily. It was very hard on him. The guy's breathing was getting heavier. He felt something prickling in his chest. Jinkyong felt something sting in his chest. He pleaded to his girlfriend to summon him. Streamer told himself in a weakening voice that he didn't know what he should do next. Jinkyong, kneeling on his knees with his last strength, shouted for the girl to summon him. Passers-by turned around and noticed the guy in front of them. Someone thought the protagonist was drunk. Jinkyong was kneeling on the road. Someone offered to call an ambulance. A passerby approached the protagonist and asked if he was okay. Jinkyong shouted at people to stay away from him. The protagonist was on his knees and kept shouting something intermittently. People were looking at the main character. Someone said the guy was crazy. Jinkyong's body curled up even more. He was almost reaching his head to the ground. A passerby suggested calling the police. Streamer began to lose consciousness. His eyes could no longer see anything, at which time the police arrived. They asked passersby, "Where is the inadequate citizen?" The guy fearfully showed the cops that the suspicious young man was nearby. The policeman approached and was surprised to notice that he could see no one. Passersby looked up in surprise and saw that the protagonist was missing. People looked around carefully and noticed that the area in front of the pharmacy was empty. The guy was not there.